Chapter 6986-6986, Butchered Like Pigs. The gravitic catapult of the Vulcan's glory proved effective. Sure, it behaved a little clunky, but it was nonetheless effective at inserting individual mechs deep into the heart of the enemy. The native aliens never imagined that a lone ace mech would descend into the heart of their moonbase like an unstoppable spear. The massive energy, the thick roof of one of the main structures that was rated to resist limited warship bombardment functioned no different than a mild speed bump. It actually helped the First Sword Mark III arrest her speed and prevent her mech frame from completely crashing through the ground floor and deep into the underground tunnels. Now, the metal monster had entered the midst of one of the alien strongholds in the star system. The native aliens still did not understand what was going on at that point. Nobody expected for a mech to arrive in such a sudden fashion. Shouldn't the humans approach from afar with their mechs and warships and steadily advance forward while firing their guns? Melee mechs usually came into action much later. They could also be tracked from afar, making it so that the aliens wouldn't be caught by surprise once they finally came close enough to swing their blades or other weapons. Nothing of the sort happened this time. Even now, every single alien soldier that was stationed in and around Screed Tanner 6F still remained ignorant that one of the most dangerous mechs ever made in the Red Ocean had just arrived in their midst. Even the sensor systems of the heavily damaged structure failed to make heads or tails of the new arrival. They continually tried and failed to obtain any responses. Only a few more unusual sensors managed to obtain a few weak and abnormal returns, but none of them made any sense. The optical sensors could vaguely detect a solid metallic form surrounded by dozens of smaller metal blades. Those floating blades surrounded the larger mass like a protective swarm and also happened to break up its silhouette, which combined with all of the dust made it even harder to complete visual verification. Unlike the lifeless alien computer systems, the nearby surviving alien troopers had a better idea of what they faced. Many of their comrades had gotten crushed by the crashing ceiling or the shockwave produced by the sudden landing. However, the armored soldiers who stood further apart still managed to get saved by the buffer provided by their personal energy shields. Though many of them felt grateful that they managed to survive a strangely effective kinetic siege attack, their minds and souls soon became frozen as they sensed an entirely different threat, one that felt much more frightening than getting struck in a physical manner. This was because they had fallen into the Saint Kingdom of a human ace pilot. To humans and those that evoked no hostility from an ace pilot, entering a domain field was simply a mildly disturbing experience. It was as if a law enforcement officer had entered your mind and watched your every thought, word and move. No matter how much you tried to hide your intentions, an ace pilot could always find out the truth. This was what it meant to be in the domain of a saint. Even if ace pilots still had a long way to go before they attained genuine godhood, they already acquired a fraction of the power of one. The small preview may be trivial in comparison to a true human deity, but it was already enough to override the feeble mental defenses of most mortal beings. The near-absolute exposure associated with Saint Kingdoms was why most people preferred not to be around an ace mech that was actively being piloted. Almost no one could bear the scrutiny of a saint. Ordinary people were frail, mortal, and weighed down by sins. Even if they knew it, they liked to keep their weaknesses private. Having an ace pilot strip all of their veils of secrecy and judge them in totality was a traumatic event to typical folk. What these aliens were being subjected to was way worse than that. Each of them were aliens. As foot soldiers in the service of the Protector of Karnak, who in turn answered to the Red Cabal, their racial makeups and backgrounds were extremely diverse. Although the Protector of Karnak clearly favored the recruitment of Juregs, there were plenty of Orvans, Nunzers, and other assorted races under his command. The only notable absence were Puelmers, who universally rejected the divinity of phase leaders. The fact that those Ball aliens remained staunch about this belief and managed to survive in the Red Ocean all of this time was suspicious. There had to be more behind this mystery, but few if any humans knew anything more. In any case, these alien soldiers all felt as if they had entered an imaginary field of sorts. Even though such a thing clearly did not exist in reality, they felt as if making a single move would cause them to cut their bodies to pieces. Their combat armor gave them no reassurance that they could withstand these cuts. More than that, they felt as if they were being judged by an entity that they could only equate to a god. This was not the god they worshipped or served for so many years. The Protector of Karnak amazed them whenever he revealed his true body and became large enough to alter the orbit of the moon they were standing on at the moment. The sight of such a divine body was enough for these mortals to completely surrender to the obvious divinity of their Lord and God. Yet now that they became subjected to a saint kingdom, they felt that their previous surrender was absurd. Although they had yet to glimpse the human god, they all instinctively felt that they had entered the presence of true divinity for the first time. They were lucky that ace pilots could not literally read their minds. Yet what this human god could sense from their emotions and intentions was already enough to make him know her mad. Many of the soldiers under the command of the Protector of Karnak had human blood on their alien appendages. The native aliens had conquered many planets stolen by the humans who arrived from another galaxy. Only a few cycles passed since they carved a foothold in the Red Ocean, and already trillions of filthy pink-skinned bipedals had come to transform the worlds into imitations of their distant homeworld. The alien soldiers all became outraged at what had happened. They channeled that fury in their treatment of the humans that resided in the worlds that had been conquered by their gods and homeships. Although it was most convenient to cleanse a world from its human infection by bombarding it wholesale, that was an extraordinarily wasteful process. It was much cheaper and easier to convert the world if it was dealt with more finesse and precision. Hence the reason why their gods ordered soldiers like them to make landfall and wipe out the human filth through conventional warfare. The forces serving under the protector of Karnak had already done this on 3 human-occupied worlds. Each time, the humans put up a fierce resistance, but once their precious mechs got wiped out, the rest of them died easily enough. Some aliens wiped out any humans they encountered, soldier, civilian, or even infant children, quickly and without hesitation. The alien troopers regarded the invaders as filthy bugs or heathens that did not acknowledge the divinity of their own gods. Other aliens possessed a cruel streak. Faced with a human population that lost the ability to escape or pose a serious threat, there had been plenty of aliens that sought to channel their fury as well as their sadistic desires upon the defenseless human colonists. Regardless of how they behaved, the amount of bloodshed on their hands was enormous. Each of them had taken part in operations that cleansed millions of humans in different settlements. Screed Tanner 6F happened to be the latest that received this treatment. As the ace pilot that had just crashed into the base sensed from their hearts how many human lives they ended, she almost lost control over herself. It was only her extreme willpower and discipline that enabled her to maintain her rationality and stop herself from going berserk. Even so, her honor and dignity as a protector of humans did not find it acceptable to grant mercy to these cruel and murderous aliens. St. Dice cared nothing about whether the native aliens acted righteously when they avenged the alien residents who died as humans swooped down on their worlds to colonize it for their own purposes. Even if humans bore ultimate responsibility for invading the Red Ocean in the first place and seeking to wipe out all of the intelligent alien species that occupied the dwarf galaxy, Dice was never a stickler for law or justice like Venerable Janzi. Dice simply cared about her sore maidens and increasingly other red humans that sought and needed her protection. To know that millions of humans once made themselves home on Screed Tanner 6F only for all of their lives to get snuffed out enraged her beyond belief. All of you deserve to die. Her original plan was to stir up a bit of trouble by taking out a few generators before moving up in orbit, but she changed her mind and unleashed her Sword Fae. Led by the Prime Sword Fae, the autonomous floating blades spun around the first Sword Mark III and proceeded to cut through everything in a slowly expanding radius like an all-consuming tornado. The whirlwind of super-dimensional blades was so strong and unstoppable that everything got cut without exception. The pieces of rubble, the emergency energy shields that hastily came online, and the armored soldiers that still remained frozen by the ace pilot's Saint Kingdom all got cut or obliterated in just a short interval of time. The storm did not abate after that. Instead, its radius continued to grow, beginning to cut through walls, machines, storage containers, and more with greater speed and violence. There was no elegance in the motion of the blades. St. Dice did not direct any of their movements. The individual Sword Fae moved at her behest, but decided their trajectories by themselves. Of course, this haphazard arrangement also lacked the force of sword formations, but the Sword Fae did not require them at all as they continued to crumble through walls and objects alike. Even if they were made out of mid-grade super-dimensional alloy, the Sword Fae were still way more than any of the defenses of Karnak base could withstand. The focused rage of St. Dice only fueled the true resonance that amplified the already impressive properties of the Sword Fae even further. The shining metal gleam of the blades further indicated that they had been strengthened by metal energy. All of these effects combined meant that there was nothing the mortal defenders could do to stop their base from getting shredded from the inside. The native aliens stationed further away were horrified yet still sought to resist in any way they could. Stationary turrets opened fire at the storm of blades. Floating armed vehicles struck with transphasic energy beams, kinetic projectiles, and missiles. Phase fighters scrambled in the air and sought to destroy the storm before it could expand any further. None of these measures worked. The Sword Fae did not linger in the limited range of the first Mark III's Saint Kingdom. They instead shot out and impaled all of the heavier and more precious military hardware with unstoppable force and speed. The exceptional penetrative properties of these Sword Fae enabled them to pierce through any Azure energy shield and transphasic hyper-alloy armor with the same ease as cutting through sheets of paper. Explosions erupted all across Karnak base as the Sword Fae reaped a horrific toll against phase fighters and other vehicles that most human mechs would have struggled to put down. This was the power of a full super-dimensional ace mech. The base defenders had yet to confront the ace mech directly, and already they were proving to be as defenseless and vulnerable as the human civilians they had once butchered like pigs. Chapter 6987-6987, The Protector of Karnak. Karnak base was being devastated from the inside, and the native aliens did not know how to respond. Their initial response against the storm of blades had proven utterly ineffective. Any soldiers and vehicles that attempted to get close instantly got impaled or crushed to pieces by the floating swords. The defenses that were positioned far away enough to escape this fate proved nothing more than nuisances. The swords moved with enough speed and agility to evade many incoming attacks. It did not matter if the alien attacks managed to hit their intended targets. Whatever energy beam or projectile that managed to strike the Sword Fae did not even leave behind a single scorch mark or dent. Despite the utterly despairing sight, not many alien soldiers panicked after their initial shock subsided. Were they afraid? Definitely. Did they think their efforts to defend their base was futile? Yes. Yet that was not a good reason for them to give in to despair. They were the soldiers of the Red Cabal. They were the worshippers of the protector of Karnak. The humans had their gods. So did the native aliens. Given how much devastation the first Mark III had wrought in a short amount of time, the greater phase lord charged with defending this base did not remain still for long. St. Dice remained fully alert despite the demonstrated power of her superdimensional ace mech. Her ace mech remained fully poised and held her decapitator in a prepared stance. The power of true resonance and metal energy hummed through the superdimensional greatsword. The recently upgraded weapon may have become sharp enough to cut through nearly anything short of a god mech, but that was no reason for St. Dice to be arrogant. She was still a junior ace pilot when it came down to it. Her Saint Kingdom was not as strong as that of St. Tusa, and her mastery over her ace mech was far from satisfactory. Aside from that, her instincts warned her of multiple impending threats, of which one happened to be strong enough despite her powerful machine. Soon enough, an alien roar erupted throughout the entire base. The soldiers that previously struggled to maintain their confidence instantly became buoyed. Their hearts no longer wavered, and they fought to suppress the whirling blades with greater fanaticism. Several developments took place in quick succession. First, two organic masses emerged in orbit. Anyone on the ground that looked up in the air would be able to spot two large ballooning shapes. Each of them rapidly grew in size until they became large enough to affect the gravity on the surface of the moon. The fifth Lord of Bisquet had unfolded his true body. The endless stomach had ballooned in size as well. While the greater phase lords had grown far too large to be able to fight the first sword Mark III without generating enormous collateral damage, their exaggerated sizes alone already did wonders to alien morale. Not only had they recovered from their shock and confusion, they also felt invincible, as if death was no longer to be feared. The aliens all began to roar their own war cries. They roared as if it was more important to impress their gods than to avoid death. This was because they all believed that as long as they showed enough valor and devotion, they would get honored by their gods and enjoy a privileged position in the afterlife. The alien counterattacks grew fiercer. The Sword Fae all began to endure greater pressure as the base defenders no longer showed any fear or hesitation towards the unstoppable storm. Even if their attacks still yielded no results, they continued to attack because they knew their gods were on their side. St. Dice grew more alert than ever. She could sense that she had attracted the hostility of a powerful phase lord. As a hunter, she knew that she had put herself in an unfavorable position. She had turned into prey that was too conspicuous to hide. Her first sword Mark III was in the open while the nearest phase lord lurked out of sight. This meant that her ace mech could be attacked at any time, but it would be difficult to attack her main adversary without trying to dig through this entire base. That made the situation unfavorable to her. St. Dice did not like it, but the mission demanded that her ace mech attracted the attention of the enemy. Now, she became more certain that the enemy phase lords possessed the capital to defeat her and her machine, so she needed to be extra alert. Where are you? Although her first sword Mark III had gained such powerful defenses that she was almost impervious to the attacks of mundane enemies, she knew that phase lords, and especially the greater ones, were not to be underestimated. Just because Red humanity made a major advancement by adopting superdimensional technology did not mean the aliens remained stagnant. Her instincts affirmed this stance. The tension in the air grew stronger. Malice tried to penetrate her Saint Kingdom in an attempt to smother her with fear. An attack was coming. The timing was crucial. Even if St. Dice no longer had to evade attacks as if her life literally depended upon it, she refused to test the durability of her upgraded ace mech. It was better to evade an attack than to block it head-on. If her intuition remained sharp enough, she should be able to detect the attack quickly enough for her to respond. Seconds passed by as the storm of blades spinning outside no longer took up her focus. If she was more insecure, then perhaps she would have recalled the Sword Fae and employed them as her shield. She did not do so. Instead, she fell back into old habits and put her trust in her fundamental skills as a swordswoman. The greater phase lords in orbit did not appear to be in a hurry to descend. Their lack of response made St. Dice only more determined that the final native god was looking to launch a surprise attack on her ace mech. The fact that this unseen threat remained patient only made her take her adversary more seriously. This was not an inexperienced fighter by any means. Phase lords tended to be quite full of themselves, but the ones who reached the greater stage tended to be much more skilled and competent. The current threat knew how to rely on the threat he posed as a weapon. The first sword Mark III remained stationary as the native aliens continued to organize and prepare for combat. They were bringing in more hardware. If this continued, then the Sword Fae may ultimately start to deform and incur other signs of damage. St. Dice quickly checked the state of her passengers. Her Saint Kingdom had already noticed them sneaking out of the container that held their feline bodies. The two cats employed their own means to avoid enemy detection and sneak away unnoticed. Dice had nothing to fear at that point. Her first sword Mark III raised her sword arm and pointed the tip of the blade at the approximate direction of the main threat. Are you a coward? Either face me in open combat or admit that the phase whales are too weak to prepare you to fight against an opponent of my caliber. Though St. Dice broadcasted her words in the open without translation, she believed the native aliens should have their own translation programs. Sure enough, just a few seconds had passed before the hidden enemy finally decided to make a move. $and you were not allowed to harm the reputation of the descendants of the Elder Gods. A silvery metallic projectile that possessed a certain degree of familiarity crashed through multiple walls and threatened to slam directly into the Minerva Mark II. The speed, momentum, spatial distortions generated by this incoming projectile were immense enough to shatter many rooms. Before it could strike the first Sword Mark III directly, the Ace Mech reacted just before the threat emerged and unfolded her impressive electroreactant flight system. The oversized electronic wings looked dramatic, but their power was very real. The potent first-class power reactor of the first Sword Mark III pumped a lot of energy into the flight system, enabling it to produce such a strong and rapid impulse that the Ace Mech seemingly got swatted to the side. You missed. St. Dice tauntingly spoke as her super-dimensional machine remained untouched. The projectile meanwhile crashed through a number of walls and destroyed a lot of containers and machines along the way. Hundreds of hapless alien soldiers were also killed along the way. It was only when the silvery projectile managed to arrest its forward movement with the help of its formidable spatial manipulation that its identity became clear. The protector of Karnak had arrived. His base just suffered a great amount of damage due to his own actions. The scale could actually rival that of the damage inflicted by the intruder's storm of blades. Yet the protector of Karnak showed little concern about the collateral damage. This was because he could clearly sense the frightening strength of the superdimensional Ace Mech that had turned around to face him with a blade that tripped many warning signs. If he was an ordinary lesser or greater phase lord, then he would not be so eager to confront an enemy that could slice his body to pieces with disturbing ease. He was no ordinary phase lord, though. The crustacean-like phase lord stood his ground and raised his claws in a menacing fashion. St. Dice regarded her main adversary for this battle. Although she also needed to guard against the other two phase lords that were posturing in orbit, the ace pilot knew that the phase lords hailing from the Red Cabal received much better equipment and phase water organs. That was evident despite the relatively small stature of the protector of Karnak. St. Dice was slightly surprised that the Jureg phase lord opted to keep his body to such modest proportions. Was he afraid of producing more collateral damage? That did not sound too likely. No, the real reason why the greater phase lord continued to keep most of his body mass inaccessible and out of sight was because he was armored from top to bottom. This was no ordinary raiment. The greater phase lord wore a complete form-fitting raiment made out of the same material used to make the Saint Piercer arms. The amount of superdimensional matter used to armor the clawed greater phase lord was way more than the quantity used to build the first Sword Mark III. Although the quality and grade of the enemy superdimensional could not be determined, if it was anything like the material used to make Saint Piercer arms, then it should sit between mid-grade and high-grade. That might not sound impressive, but St. Dice was well aware that the new armor and weapons could not be underestimated due to their greater scale. Not only was the greater phase lord several times bigger than the first Sword Mark III, but the armor plating was thicker and the claws looked much sharper and deadlier. The greater quantity of superdimensional alloy alone was enough to fend off more strikes from her decapitator. There did not appear to be any weak points either. The raiment fully enclosed the protector of Karnak. In fact, its design not only looked disturbingly human but also appeared to imitate mechs to an extent. And a dot. False god. The great descendants of the Elder Gods has deemed your possession of the bones of their ancestors forbidden. I am charged with the responsibility to bring you back to account for your desecration of our honor dead. St. Dice grinned as her ace mech held her great sword in a different stance. That is funny coming from a greater phase lord who is trying to imitate us. With a full raiment of this size, it seems that you and the Red Cabal are beginning to abandon your old traditions and try to copy our methods. Dedicating so much superdimensional matter to construct a raiment that was only a fraction of the full size of a greater phase lord represented a massive paradigm shift. If the protector of Karnak was not the only one who received this kind of equipment, then that showed that the Red Cabal no longer put blind faith in the power of their immense true bodies. Chapter 6988 Alien Phase Lord Adaptations. Just as Red Humanity feared, the native aliens expanded their exploitation of superdimensional matter. The Red Cabal previously had been stingy with handing over Saint Piercer arms to various martial greater phase lords. While they certainly made a difference and proved much more effective at repelling or even killing the human false gods, the superdimensional spears alone was not enough to create enough parity. Human ace mechs all maintained the same approximate size range. While their ability to inflict damage on a large scale remained a bit limited, their potent combination of speed, agility, and power still allowed them to run rings around their much larger but clumsier adversaries. So long as the ace mechs managed to overcome the formidable spatial barriers that protected these phase lords and directly targeted the head or other weak points, these human false gods were able to slay mighty phase lords in a disturbingly effective manner. The Red Cabal understood this problem for a long time. The phase whales tried various different solutions. The protector of Karnak clearly obtained the privilege to test one of them. A full superdimensional raiment that exposed no obvious weak points left St. Dice with no easy openings to take down the enemy phase lord in a short amount of time. Though Saint Dice felt confident that her resonance-empowered blade could cut through the enemy's super-dimensional raiment by force, she knew that it would not be easy. This was precisely what the Greater Phase Lords needed to put up a more equal fight against human ace pilots and ace mechs. Too many of their fellow gods had already perished at the hands of the humans because they arrogantly fought with their true bodies exposed. Armor existed for good reasons. The native aliens previously did not experience a threat that was serious enough to warrant full coverage with superdimensional alloy. Yet when confronting a human ace mech, the Protector of Karnak had delayed his arrival long enough to don his customized superdimensional raiment. As far as craftsmanship went, the raiment was designed and built to excellent standards. Not only that, but Saint Dice spotted plenty of design elements that looked right at home in high-end mechs. She sneered. Those traitors are at it again. The Cosmopolitans cannot limit themselves to leaking our tech to your side. They also have to lend the expertise of their own mech designers to improve and optimize your raiment. Pathetic. You aliens have obviously decided that since you cannot beat us by relying on your massive true bodies, you aliens have instead decided to imitate our human mechs. Though the Protector of Karnak hated the human false god's slanderous words, even he could not deny the truth of her statement. Phase whales and phase lords previously pursued size at all costs. Skill and finesse became secondary to raw might and indomitable true bodies. The bigger phase leader almost always won a confrontation against their weaker peers. That was the way of life among the native aliens before the human invasion. This was why Saint Dice was surprised that the Red Cabal had already been willing to relent so much. She thought that the native aliens would have dug their heels. She had misjudged the shamelessness of the native aliens. However, the enemy had probably made the right choice. Saint Dice did not fear a battle against a greater phase lord that fought in a traditional manner. Her superdimensional ace mech gave her infinite confidence in her ability to deal with such clumsy brutes. Yet a greater phase lord that was willing to let down his pride and abandon his old way of fighting in order to imitate human mechs posed a much more serious threat. This feeling became more pronounced when the Protector of Karnak raised one of his sharp and metal-clad claws and began to perform a strange spatial technique, likely with the help of an unknown phase water organ. The claw began to buzz and shimmer. The infusion of spatial power somehow made the implement more threatening. Saint Dice could instinctively sense that it would be a very bad idea for her ace mech to get pincered by this empowered claw. The strong spatial energies surging at the sharp edges somehow activated a hidden aspect of the superdimensional alloy to the point where it almost gained the power to cut through space itself. Although Dice did not expect to encounter such a threatening foe, she slowly began to grin. She could not have dreamed of a better opponent. Instead of butchering the phase lords that were stationed in the star system as if they were fat and stupid pigs, she could actually enjoy a proper duel against an adequately equipped opponent. Her Saint Kingdom grew more energetic. The illusion of blades grew stronger as her excitement rose. The ace pilot took the Protector of Karnak so seriously that she recalled her sword Fae without hesitation. This time, she no longer let them wander around freely but instead guided them to line up behind her electric-winged ace mech like an army of rigid soldiers. Her lips curled into a grin. Before I can devote my full attention to you, let me clear out the trash. I don't want our duel to be disturbed by spoilsports. Before the disturbingly well-equipped phase lord could issue a response, the massive electric wings of the ace mech made a powerful flap, causing the machine to launch upwards with formidable speed. It took a small moment for the greater phase lord to realize that his opponent had fled from his claws. $and %. His angry alien roar thundered across the damage base. His armored form rose shortly afterwards and flew straight in pursuit of the ace mech. The fabric of space warped around the Protector of Karnak as he tried his best to intercept the ace mech. The alien god was old and wise enough to understand exactly what Saint Dice intended. While the Jureg Greater Phase Lord proved to be impressively fast among his kind, he was not quite able to match the speed of the cutting-edge superdimensional ace mech. What was worse was that the first sword had already built up a considerable lead. The Protector of Karnak could only helplessly transmit a warning to the two other greater phase lords and assorted lesser phase lords that were hovering protectively over their homeships. None of the lesser phase lords were foolish enough to ignore the magnitude of the incoming threat. They all understood the horror of particularly powerful ace mechs and had no interest in tangling against a human false god that felt confident enough to confront them alone. Of course, the lesser phase gods used to be a lot more courageous in the past. It was only after hundreds of them mercilessly got cut down by the human false gods that they curbed their arrogance and recognized reality. Nowadays, many alien phase lords have become a lot more familiar with human high-ranking mechs. Those among them whose eyesight had not improved after all of this time had already paid for their mistakes with their lives. This was the cruelty of the Red War. As the lesser phase lords completely disregarded their demeanor as gods and scattered from the flight trajectory of the superdimensional ace mech, the two greater phase lords did not move from their protective positions. Unlike their lesser counterparts, the greater phase lords could not let down their pride so easily. Despite the warning issued by the Protector of Karnak, the fifth Lord of Biscuit and the Endless Stomach possessed their own sources of confidence. The former was not only equipped with a thick raiment that did a good job of covering his head and most of his nunza body, but also wielded a Saint Piercer arm. The endless stomach looked forward to devouring the human ace mech and grinding the mech frame down with the help of its newly acquired superdimensional teeth. While both greater phase lords refused to back away from the incoming threat, they did not attempt to confront this enemy alone. They possessed enough sense to lean on each other for help. When it became clear that the First Sword Mark III had set her sights on the fifth Lord of Biscuit, the endless stomach distanced himself from his own fleet and moved to reinforce his fellow native god. Yet because the two fleets initially distrusted each other, they had positioned themselves too far away to reinforce each other quickly. The endless stomach was also not a particularly fast greater phase lord, so the First Sword Mark III's fearless charge put all of the alien gods at a disadvantage. The First Sword Mark III's electroreactant flight system proved their value many times over. They expended energy like nothing else, but the thrust power generated by the large electric wings was the real deal. Multiple alien warships tried to intercept the ace mech. Their secondary armaments opened fire along her rough trajectory with surprising coordination. Not only did they fire their guns all at once, they also covered many different angles and coordinates to the point they weaved a dense web of energy beams and projectiles. It was rare to see this level of coordination from the native aliens, but their better-trained soldiers needed to rely on advanced tactics in order to defeat the human mechs. While 90 to 95% of the attacks ended up missing their mark, they had already served their purpose because the remainder always managed to strike the mech frame with every salvo. The First Sword Mark III did not even bother to evade. She was not fast and agile enough to imitate the Dark Zephyr in trying to evade the dense net of firepower. DICE chose to put her faith in her Saint Kingdom and her superdimensional mech. They did not fail her. Energy beams, solid rounds, explosive shells, and even more destructive transphasic missiles all tried and failed to slow down the ace mech. No matter whether the attacks arrived at the front or rear, the superdimensional machine no longer possessed any glaring weak points. Saint DICE could readily ignore attacks below a certain degree of power and intensity. As the First Sword Mark III closed in on the Fifth Lord of Biscuit, the Greater Nunzer Phase Lord prepared to meet the approaching machine. The Fifth Lord did not excel in spatial manipulation, but he tried to set up the battlefield by warping the space around him, turning it into a quagmire that often interfered with the movements of nearby enemies. It was not enough to truly entrap ace mechs, but they had to expend a lot more willpower and strength in order to maintain their trajectories. As the First Sword Mark III continued to charge forth, the Nunzer Phase Lord chose to make a stand by pointing his Saint Piercer arm straight ahead. His intention could not be more obvious. Recognizing that evading the charge attack was useless, the Greater Phase Lord wanted to make the ace mech impale herself onto his own superdimensional weapon. Whether he was fast and accurate enough to nail the ace mech remained unclear, but the threat of it should be enough to make the human false god hesitant. The First Sword Mark III did not slow down. She continued to accelerate forward, seemingly disregarding the very real danger posed by the Saint Piercer arm. Her response was to command her sword Fae to move slightly ahead of her machine. They gradually moved forward until they formed a wedge formation. This enabled them to resonate with each other in a specific way. Although weak, there was power in the sword formation that enabled the sword Fae to concentrate their power in the blades at the front. The Fifth Lord of Biscuit felt an unreasonable amount of fear from the sword formation. His instincts may not be as sharp as that of an ace pilot, but they were not blind to the lethality radiating from the blades. Chapter 6989 Within a minute. Many people eagerly observed the first true debut performance of the First Sword Mark III. As the first high-grade superdimensional ace mech, the First Sword Mark III would set everyone's expectations of the power of armor-grade and weapon-grade superdimensional matter. The previous performance of the Fist of Defiance opened people's eyes to how superdimensional matter could make a difference at the top end of the power spectrum. The superdimensional Invictus seemingly gained new wings with the help of its material upgrades. Not only was it capable of resisting the attacks of several ancient phase whales at a time, its superdimensional fists enhanced the killing power of the god mech to a whole new level. What about its effects on lower-end mechs? Nobody aside from the crazy Larkinsons were crazy enough to waste this precious new material on expert mechs. Everyone else already intended to use it to upgrade their most precious and promising peak ace mechs. Famous champions who were just a single step away from ascending to godhood, such as the Renewer of Terra, the Mace of Retaliation, and the Gamer, all held a lot of promise. If they received a major upgrade to their hardware, they could not only kill enemy phase leaders more effectively but also gain a considerable boost to their upgrade chances. However, the latter still remained a low-probability event. Nobody was able to calculate the exact improvement bestowed by a full superdimensional upgrade. There were mech designers and theorists who believed that it could multiply the success rate by 300%. There were also others who believed the improvement only amounted to an improvement of 50%. All of these figures may sound impressive, but when the normal success rate of embarking on the road to no return was definitely a figure that was way below 1%. The most optimistic scenario only yielded a success rate of maybe 10 to 20%. These were still terrible odds. While it was true that the individual circumstances of peak ace pilots varied so wildly that they could not easily be compared to each other, the estimated and calculated probabilities still provided sufficient reference value. Loosely speaking, if 10 peak ace pilots broke through, only one of them would survive and become the latest god in human form. As for the other 9, everything that was part of their bodies and mechs became erased from reality. There was no way to preserve anything that belonged to them. This included many tons of precious armor-grade and weapon-grade superdimensional alloy. Given that Sword Master Kedis was only able to open up a portal to the blue dimension once every few months, the amount of high-grade superdimensional matter attained harvested by red humanity did not amount to much. At most, the big powers were able to upgrade 2 to 4 peak ace mechs to the highest specification per harvest, assuming that they did not expend the precious high-grade superdimensional matter on other priorities, of which there were many. Peak ace mechs were not the only machines that had a high demand for this wonder material. Many powerful and highly influential figures lobbied for bits and pieces of high-grade superdimensional matter to upgrade their starships, their personal protection, and other assorted gadgets. It was difficult to reject these requests entirely, especially when they gave abundant amounts of strategic goods such as starships in exchange. So the actual quantity of high-grade superdimensional matter being used to upgrade peak ace mechs was actually less than ideal. This was why the performance of the First Sword Mark III received so much scrutiny that the warships of the Blue Jay fleet focused as much of their sensor systems on the Ace Swordsman mech as possible. Since St. Dice was pretty much a fresh ace pilot, the performance of her First Sword Mark III should be an adequate representation of the baseline of a superdimensional ace mech. 3 master mech designers from the mech supremacist faction had contributed to the design of this exquisite machine. This meant that the Red Association almost completely comprehended the design of the loving machine that was demonstrating her power for the first time. The meshers looked forward to conducting a statistical analysis that enabled them to normalize the data and make predictions on how superdimensional matter could enhance the performance of other, more powerful ace mechs. They only needed to measure the empirical data of the First Sword Mark III in action in order to fill up the missing data. This would subsequently set everyone's expectations of superdimensional ace mechs throughout the Red Ocean in many years to come. Both Jovi Armelon and Vector Loban stood next to each other as they examined the live footage as well as the raw data readings from the control panel. They became more and more encouraged whenever they witnessed the numbers grow bigger and the graph lines rise higher. This alone did not necessarily tell them anything useful, so they also performed calculations in order to estimate the performance of a theoretical non-superdimensional First Sword Mark III. Although the accuracy and reliability of these estimated figures remained questionable, it was better than nothing. The resulting analysis and conclusion played such an important role that it could seriously tilt the allocation of superdimensional resources in favor of peak ace mechs. The Red Association naturally wished to see this happen. This was one of the strongest reasons why the Blue Jay fleet happily agreed to accompany the premier fleet in this campaign. Even though the original contract with VES Larkinson explicitly stated that the mechs and warships of the Red Association would not lend its aid in any offensive operations, that was just a pile of words. The meshers made the rules, but they did not always abide by them. That was their privilege as rulemakers. Besides, now that the Red War had reached this stage, it was better to put the Blue Jay fleet at the disposal of one of the few rare ace commanders that could amplify their performance. Already, the mechs, and to a lesser extent the warships of the Blue Jay fleet, already received the amplification of the Minerva Mark II's command field. By this time, the Premier Fleet and the Blue Jay Fleet had already slowed down and allowed their mechs to lead the advance. Their long-ranged armaments would soon be able to open fire on the alien forces, but it would still take a bit of time for the two fleets to be able to provide cover to the First Sword Mark III. Despite the fact that the superdimensional ace mech was all alone for the time being, no one showed too much concern. Superdimensional tech represented a technological paradigm shift to red humanity. Not only was it better than phase water tech in many ways, it also happened to be a much more effective counter against phase leaders. Right now, both Jovi and Vector harbored great expectations towards the Ace Swordsman mech. How long do you think it will take for Dice to eliminate the fifth Lord of Bisquet by herself? Jovi asked with a smile on his face. His transhumanist friend raised an eyebrow. You and your bets again? It depends. Are you talking about killing or forcing the greater phase Lord into a retreat? I think that the difference is irrelevant in this case. Jovi boldly answered. You should have read the personality profile of St. Dice. She is not one to let her prey escape alive, especially now that she is looking to prove herself with such a powerful machine. Vector hesitated. Although he agreed with Jovi's analysis, not every greater phase lord was as easy to kill as others. The fifth Lord of Bisquet had previously unfolded his true body to a size that was practically impossible to kill through mundane means. Only a large number of warships firing their primary batteries in repeated salvos could make a serious dent in such a large phase water-reinforced body. Of course, greater phase lords had long learned the lesson that relying on a big body alone was not enough to defeat senior ace mechs. This was why the fifth Lord of Biscuit had folded his true body to the point he became as large as a juggernaut before wielding a Saint Piercer arm that complemented his current size. That was a size that many greater phase lords had grown comfortable with. They no longer became giant, sluggish targets that could only get beat up by the small but incredibly powerful metal flies. However, they still maintained enough of a scale advantage that they could leverage their superior strength and reach to suppress the mechs in a physical sense. Superdimensional ace mech or not, there was no way the First Sword Mark III would be able to lock weapons with the Fifth Lord of Bisquet. The Nunzer race was famed for their superior physical strength, and the Fifth Lord of Bisquet was a pure martial phase lord. Many of his phase water organs complemented his current development trajectory. Even the ones that manipulated the power of space were mainly used to trap and debilitate opponents at close range. Vector had already read through the intelligence report of the Fifth Lord of Bisquet. He also analyzed his current state with the help of the collected data. He remained still as he utilized his cranial implant to perform a thorough analysis based on his own theoretical frameworks. I estimate that there is a 15% probability that the Fifth Lord of Bisquet will die to Saint Dice within a minute of making contact. However, if the First Sword Mark III fails to achieve immediate dominance in spite of her superdimensional properties, then the odds of being able to secure a kill is much lower. The Protector of Karnak and the Endless Stomach will catch up and reinforce their fellow Greater Phase Lord. They may be rivals to each other, but when they are directly being challenged by a full superdimensional ace mech, they are rational enough to completely unite against this common foe. Saint Dice still lacks the experience and specialized skills to leverage the full strength of her superdimensional ace mech and overcome the combined defenses of all three phase lords. Jovi looked impressed. Good analysis. My own judgment shares much in common with yours. You have yet to answer my question, though. Stating a probability is not the same as making a bet. What do you think? Will she be able to complete a kill with the power of her ace mech and nothing else? No. Vector eventually said. A 15% success rate in the first minute is too low. As much as I want the First Sword Mark III to succeed and baptize herself in the blood of a greater phase lord, Saint Dice is clearly harboring an overinflated sense of confidence. None of these native gods are simple. If she chose to challenge them a year or two later, then the outcome would not be in doubt. In the end, he thought that Saint Dice was being far too impatient this time. What was wrong with settling down and taking things step by step? Even senior ace pilots could not guarantee that they could kill a greater phase lord in a single confrontation. As the First Sword Mark III rapidly closed the distance, she looked readily to pierce the Fifth Lord of Bisquet in the most direct possible fashion. Her electroreactant wings produced so much thrust that her momentum had soared despite the fact that she had to escape the gravity well of Screed Tanner 6F. As her 33 Sword Fae assumed a wedge formation directly in front of the path, it looked as if the Ace Mech had turned into a giant arrowhead. Even the Ace Mech Saint Kingdom had condensed into a triangular shape in order to complement the sword formation. The vast majority of humans and aliens who faced such a charge head-on would probably panic and lose their courage. Yet the Fifth Lord of Bisquet maintained a stationary position and chose to meet this charge head-on. The Nunzer Greater Phase Lord had no doubt that he would suffer a serious injury if the superdimensional mech struck his true body, but fleeing was no solution. He knew that the First Sword Mark III was flexible and maneuverable enough to make course corrections. There was no running away. Since that is the case, then the Fifth Lord would try to impale the Ace Mech first. He was still confident enough in his highly developed arms. Multiple phase water organs reinforced his limbs in various ways, enabling him to perform well in duels against other martial phase lords. So long as the First Sword Mark III failed to evade the tip of his Saint Piercer arm, the charge would definitely fail. A cruel grin appeared underneath the armored faceplate of the Nunzer phase lord. As the seconds ticked down, the Fifth Lord felt as if his body and soul were about to get impaled by a giant metal sword. However, the Greater Phase Lord relied on his supreme confidence in his physical strength to resist this illusion and make sure to track the Ace Mech's passage. $and another false god of the humans shall die. An instant before the tip of his superdimensional weapon was about to impale the First Sword Mark III, the Ace Mech's electroreactant flight system made an extreme course change. The Ace Mech had made an abrupt turn. Contrary to the Greater Phase Lord's expectations, the superdimensional machine did not juke in any of the four directions that would enable her to attack the Fifth Lord from the side. Instead, the First Sword Mark III had chosen to turn back, putting her completely out of reach of the Fifth Lord. What? Many people reacted with surprise. Had Saint Dice decided to chicken out of this collision? No. The Ace Mech may have averted a collision, but the 33 Sword Fae continued to fly forward with indomitable momentum. The sword formation actually dispersed from the middle. This enabled each and every blade to completely avoid contact with the Saint Piercer arm and continue forward until they struck the spatial barrier and almost immediately slipped through. Once the resonance-empowered Sword Fae reached the other side, they quickly reformed their original triangular formation before plunging straight against the Nunzer Phase Lord's raiment. Chapter 6990-6990, Superdimensional Cutting Power. When the Sword Fae condensed into a sword formation and struck the chest plate of the Nunzer Phase Lord, many humans and aliens paid attention whether this attack could penetrate through the armor. The raiment worn by the Fifth Lord of Bisquet may not be as advanced and complete as the raiment worn by the Protector of Karnak, but it still offered a good deal of defense against superdimensional weapons. Most importantly, the Nunzer Greater Phase Lord's raiment boasted the greatest thickness at the front. The armor layers were thicker and more numerous as that was the side that the Fifth Lord most often expected to receive attacks. Right now, a silent collision occurred as the Sword Fae concentrated all of its power into the leading Prime Sword Fae. Although it was made out of mid-grade superdimensional alloy like the other sword Fey, it not only bore the willpower amplification and metal energy empowerment of St. Dice, but also served as the tip of the spear of the entire sword formation. Upon the moment of collision, sparks, spatial disruptions and other energy fluctuations erupted from the point of impact. It became extremely difficult for anyone to get a clear look at what had happened. Only an instant passed before the other remaining sword Fey continued to surge forward and collide against the Raymond. While the effect of the prime sword Fey remained unclear, it was still possible to quickly determine the effect of the ordinary sword Fey. Failed to penetrate. This was a disappointing but expected result. While they retained their willpower and metal energy empowerment, the sword formation had lost effect as soon as it had crumbled. In fact, this was also a sign that the sword formation clearly wasn't powerful enough to drill straight through the armor and body of the fifth Lord of Bisquet. Now, the real question became how deep the prime sword Fey managed to punch through the armor. As the disturbances slowly cleared up, many sensor systems were able to observe the actual results. The tip partially sunk into the armor. The leading sword spur has penetrated through at least 3 armor layers. The other sword Fey have only managed to produce shallow cuts in a single armor layer. This did not sound impressive, but those who understood the circumstances better all grew incredibly impressed. A junior ace mech with access to hull-grade superdimensional weapons is already able to damage the layers of the Fifth Lord's St. Blocker Raymond. According to the analysis of the Red 3, the superdimensional alloy used in the making of the so-called St. Blocker Raymonds roughly performed better than mid-grade superdimensional alloy but was a little short of matching high-grade superdimensional alloy. Plenty of human material scientists and metallurgists speculate that the native aliens actually had a way of producing or harvesting hull-grade superdimensional matter. They then relied on special methods and complementary resources to produce superior superdimensional alloys. In other words, the Red Cabal probably relied on superior metallurgical attainments or some sort of profound ancient heritage to surpass Red humanity in this field. This strengthened the theory that the phase whales likely produced their own superdimensional matter rather than mining it from the blue dimension. Regardless, the naked penetration power of the sword Fey shouldn't be strong enough to pierce through the first layer of the Saint Blocker under ordinary circumstances. It was only through the application of overwhelming brute force or more exotic forms of amplification that St. Dice was able to produce such a result. The latter was apparently strong enough to surpass the inherent material shortcomings of the sword Fey. Both Jovi and Vector exchanged glances as they witnessed all of this happening from a control room in the Tarrasque. "It appears that you have lost the bet," Jovi directly stated. "Right?" Vector directly conceded. At this time, the first Sword Mark III had just completed her first attack run and had already circled around by this time. Her sword Fey did not return to her side. It was a bit troublesome to recall the sword Fey now that they had penetrated the Fifth Lord's spatial barrier with so much effort. Besides, why call them back when they could continue to attack the Greater Phase Lord? Under the command of their ace pilot, the intelligent sword Fey dispersed and began to stab at the Greater Phase Lord's body from all sides. The sword Fey failed to inflict much damage this time. They dispersed too much and did not leverage the power of sword formations. They also could not build up any momentum to add more power to their attacks. Even so, the Fifth Lord of Bisquet could not afford to ignore the harassment. His raiment may have been designed and molded to fit his quadruped body at its current scale, but it did not cover every part of his body. To be more specific, parts of his underside and many of the joint areas were still exposed, making it easier for the sword Fey to pierce his flesh directly if they managed to land a strike. Even if the sword Fey were not able to strike with enough force to sink down to the hilt, the shallow stab and slash wounds already generated a considerable amount of distress. $% at. Begone. The Fifth Lord tried to swat the sword Fey away. While he managed to batter them to the side by whacking the closest ones with his Saint Piercer arm, the sword Fey quickly recovered and immediately resumed their autonomous attacks. Even if he was able to block and push the sword Fey within his reach aside, that left the other floating blades free to attack the Greater Phase Lord's body from other angles. Although the Fifth Lord had a growing urge to rotate his body and batter aside the other sword Fey, he did not dare to face away from the source of his misery. At this time, the first Sword Mark III was charging forward to launch another attack run. The Greater Phase Lord could only endure the multitude of weak attacks, trusting in his Saint Blocker Raymond to prevent the silly blades from targeting his vitals. He knew that as long as he destroyed or repelled the Ace Mech, the Sword Fey would automatically cease to pose a threat. The Nunzer Phase Lord quickly restored his previous stance and became determined to impale the incoming Ace Mech this time. He had a better measure of his adversary at this time. The first Sword Mark III had already exposed her speed and maneuverability. Now that he possessed this information, the experienced Martial Phase Lord became a little more confident in his ability to intercept his adversary at this time. However, the same also applied to St. Dice. She not only figured out much of the Fifth Lord's capabilities firsthand, but also had a much better measure of her strength and that of her superdimensional ace mech. If a bunch of mid-grade superdimensional sword Fey were able to penetrate 1 to 3 layers of the enemy Phase Lord's armor, then how much more damage could she produce by stabbing it with the decapitator? As the first sword Mark III charged forward yet again, the ace pilot condensed her Saint Kingdom and used it to complement her next sword technique. Compared to messing around with sword formations, Saint Dice possessed much greater familiarity in the sword style that she had honed for her entire career. She had multiple different choices at her disposal, but she could not ignore the threat of getting stabbed with a Saint Piercer arm by the full force of a physically superior Greater Phase Lord. Dice therefore decided to execute the technique that she and Kedis especially devised to counter Phase Lords like the Fifth Lord. Just as the first sword Mark III was about to collide with the Greater Phase Lord again, the Decapitator glowed with energies that produced an indescribable disruption effect. At the same time, Dice sent her companion spirit Respa into the space suppressor of her ace mech. Just before the first sword Mark III managed to get close enough, the ace mech already weakened the Fifth Lord's spatial manipulation. His limbs grew weaker. His spatial barrier lost a bit of power. His ability to lock down the surrounding space had no chance of touching the incoming ace mech. These setbacks threatened to disrupt the Fifth Lord's concentration, but the Nunzer Phase Lord had lived for a long time. He had faced numerous perils throughout his long life, so he knew the importance of maintaining focus during this critical time. Just before the first sword Mark III entered into his striking range, the Fifth Lord decisively stabbed his formidable Saint Piercer forward, confident that he had predicted the ace mech's movement. $% and your arrogance shall be your downfall. Just as he predicted, the tip of his Saint Piercer surged directly towards the charging ace mech with unerring accuracy. The weapon struck so quickly and with so much force that the Fifth Lord could not imagine a possibility where the ace mech could block, deflect, or evade his stab. Even if he could feel the Saint Kingdom trying to weaken and arrest the momentum of the Saint Piercer, it had little to no effect. After all, Saint Piercers were weapons that the Phase Whales specifically designed to counter ace pilots and ace mechs. They were absurdly effective at piercing through the nonsense of domain fields. They almost always came in the form of polearms, as that made it even more inconvenient for Saint Kingdoms to affect their entire lengths. Right now, the Fifth Lord could almost imagine the tip of his sharp and hungry spear punch through the chest plate of the ace mech. Superdimensional or not, willpower empowerment or not, the Fifth Lord's strength combined with the first sword Mark III's own momentum should produce a highly lethal result. Even if the tip of the Saint Piercer got ruined after this, the outcome would be completely worth it in his opinion. Yet before his proportionally larger weapon could even graze the chest plate of the pristine new ace mech, a masterwork greatsword swung at the slender spear tip from a tricky angle. Phase Cutter. At the same time, the ace mech's electroreactant flight system briefly overloaded, producing a massive thrust directed towards the side. He missed. The Fifth Lord of Biscuit actually failed to pierce through to the ace mech. No, it's worse. Look at his weapon. Everyone, including the Nunzer Greater Phase Lord himself, became shocked as they witnessed the current state of the Saint Piercer arm. This lengthy polearm, which must have made the lives of numerous ace pilots miserable in the past, had lost its head. The Decapitator had decapitated the Saint Piercer, causing its sharp but unmoored tip to tumble off into another direction of space. Meanwhile, the slightly shortened polearm had been left with a diagonal cut that revealed an entire cross-section. Although it looked as if the sharp edges of this cut might still be used to stab at enemies, the effect wouldn't be as good as before. Saint Dice had practically reduced the nightmare of all ace mechs into a much less threatening staff. That was not all. While the Fifth Lord struggled to accept how easily the ace mech had cut through a weapon that had resisted the attacks of multiple other ace mechs, the first sword Mark III did not swerve too far away. Instead, the electric-winged ace mech relied on her impressive mobility to redirect her momentum yet again. Her sharp turn allowed her to close the distance to the Phase Lord a lot faster than before. While the Fifth Lord had become unbalanced due to the sudden setback, he was still strong and experienced enough to realize the danger. He immediately began to wield his Saint Piercer like a staff and sought to physically batter away the ace mech with the side of its shaft. Although the strike arrived quickly, Saint Dice already predicted the Greater Phase Lord's move far in advance. Before the shaft could get close enough to inflict a powerful strike against the offensive ace mech, the latter's electric wings made another powerful flap. This happened to push the fast and agile ace mech far away enough for the shaft of the Saint Piercer to miss. He's open. The first sword Mark III continued to charge forward and directly used the tip of her decapitator to pierce and shatter the Greater Phase Lord's spatial barrier all at once. This was the power of a weapon-grade superdimensional greatsword. However, just before the ace mech was about to stab at the Fifth Lord's raiment, the Greater Phase Lord reacted faster than expected and tilted his armored body upwards so that he could launch a desperate kick at the first sword Mark III. Watch out, Dice. Chapter 69, 91, 69, 91, Too Strong. Just as expected, the first sword Mark III was able to collapse the spatial barrier of a Greater Phase Lord all at once. This was the Phase Lord's most formidable and troublesome layer of defense. Its strength was so great that it had stopped many ace mechs from inflicting any serious damage onto their opponents. It took an unreasonable amount of time and energy to deplete the spatial barrier of most Phase Lords. Although Red Humanity was constantly developing better and better countermeasures, none of these solutions could match the absurd ease in which a weapon-grade superdimensional ace sword was able to pop the Fifth Lord's spatial barrier as if it was a bubble. Even if the Decapitator enjoyed the amplification from St. Dice's true resonance, this was just icing on the cake in this specific circumstance. Many people gained a better appreciation of the offensive potential of weapon-grade superdimensional matter. They also knew that only high-ranking mech pilots could best realize the potential of this material. Many observers now looked forward to seeing whether the First Sword Mark III could inflict a major wound onto the Greater Phase Lord. Yet before the Ace Mech could plunge her superdimensional Decapitator through the Saint Blocker raiment, the Fifth Lord threatened to kick the machine from below. Superdimensional mech or not, any machine would get punted away like a ball when struck in such a manner. The kick came so quickly and suddenly that St. Dice did not have the time to accumulate her power and execute another extraordinary sword technique. In addition, the First Sword's electroreactant flight system had already overloaded a moment before. It was technically infeasible to generate another powerful impulse that could help the Ace Mech evade the surprise kick. The First Sword Mark III was completely inferior to the non-superdimensional Dark Zephyr Mark III in this aspect. After all, the latter was an Ace light skirmisher that excelled at speed and evasion. This left the First Sword Mark III in a vulnerable position. The Phase Lord moved so quickly that most people only managed to see a blur. By the time the Fifth Lord's body stopped its rotation, he had already completed his counterattack. This time, the observers became shocked for the umpteenth time. He missed. No, it is more than that. Look at his foreleg. Of his four-hooved legs, one of them had turned into a stump. The limb had practically halved in length. What was impressive was that the section that got cut clean in half happened to be covered by alien superdimensional alloy. Even if the coverage of the Saint Blocker raiment was thinner at the limbs, ordinary Ace Mech weapons shouldn't have been able to pierce through all of the solid matter so easily. Yet not only had the First Sword Mark III managed to cut through it once, her Decapitator managed to slice the limb off completely, which meant that she had cut the armor on the other side as well. The aliens reacted with horror at this result. If the superdimensional Ace Mech was able to chop off an armored limb with so much ease, then the protection offered by the Fifth Lord's Saint Blocker raiment was likely minimal. The blood that largely consisted of phase water flowed freely from the disturbingly smooth cut. It took several long seconds for the Phase Lord's flesh to close and plug the arteries. It was as if the Fifth Lord of Bisquet refused to admit that he had been wounded to such a terrible degree after getting struck just once. Yet as much as he tried to deny this reality, the human false god had proven without a shadow of a doubt that she could not only wound him but kill him with ease. The Greater Phase Lord immediately became beset by both fury and panic. Dollar at end. Thief. You human pests not only seek to steal our stars, but you have desecrated the bones of the elder gods. Surrender your stolen goods at once. The ace pilot did not even deign to answer this ridiculous request. Her confidence in her blade had grown. The superdimensional version of the Decapitator was on a completely different level compared to its previous iteration. Combined with her willpower and extraordinary sword style, she had become much more certain about achieving her objectives in this battle. After circling around one last time, St. Dice had gained the full measure of her current adversary. She briefly paid attention to the other two Greater Phase Lords. After witnessing how much the Fifth Lord of Bisquet had suffered, the Protector of Karnak and the Endless Stomach did not slow down. They continued to use their best speed to advance forward. It would only take a short amount of time before one of them came close enough to interfere with her fight. St. Dice could instinctively feel that she would have a much harder time defeating the other two champions. One of them possessed superior superdimensional equipment and techniques, while the other could withstand bladed weapons a lot better. She needed to finish off her current foe quickly. With that in mind, she no longer thought of holding back. Now that she had a much better read on the performance of her opponent's superdimensional equipment, she was ready to deliver the coup de grace. Her First Sword Mark III circled around yet again and relied on her electroreactant wings to propel her forward at full power. The flight system had played an excellent role so far. Although it was not enough to make the Ace Mech as mobile as an Ace light skirmisher, it still elevated the mobility of the Mark III far beyond the level of the Mark II. Right now, St. Dice relied upon its raw power to quickly build up as much momentum for her Ace Mech as possible. The Fifth Lord of Bisquet fully experienced her naked killing intent. The ace pilot did not hide her intentions at all. Deception was a weapon for the weak. The strong had no need to resort to such a measure to defeat her opponent. Perhaps she was underestimating the Greater Phase Lord a bit, but St. Dice was almost certain that she had exhausted the strongest means of the Fifth Lord. Against almost any other Ace Mech, the Greater Phase Lord wouldn't have been reduced to the point where a few exchanges of blows would already leave him in such a pathetic state. Yet this was precisely what happened. The unexpected repeated setbacks thoroughly unbalanced him and made it difficult for him to adapt to the current circumstances. Yet the Fifth Lord ultimately managed to recover his mood in a short amount of time. He just needed to survive. As long as he could withstand another attack run, then the other two Greater Phase Lords would finally catch up and put the human false god under much greater pressure. So long as the three of them combined their forces, it should be impossible for the Ace Mech made out of high-quality god bone to take away his life. Although he felt tempted to fully unfold his true body and confront his current foe at his greatest state, the Fifth Lord of Bisquet resisted this impulse. Past cases had repeatedly shown that this was a mistake. The Nunzer Phase Lord knew he would become so slow that it would be impossible to evade or hit a fast and tiny ace mech. With the penetration power of her greatsword, she could chop through his enormous body with impunity. So what if she needed to swing her body a lot more times in order to damage a significant part of his true body? She only needed to hit a vital organ in order to kill him entirely. The Fifth Lord therefore had to prevent this at all cost. He maintained his current size and flipped the orientation of his Saint Piercer arm so that its flat side faced his opponent. The Phase Lord made the risky decision to physically push the ace mech with the end of his weapon. Only by doing so would he be able to push away the threatening machine in spite of getting shortened by a second cut. Saint Dice easily read her opponent's intentions. She had no intentions of changing her plan or backing away. As the First Sword Mark III launched her latest and possibly her final attack run against the Fifth Lord of Bisquet, the ace pilot began to channel one of her oldest but also iconic sword techniques. Her Saint Kingdom changed until it produced a large silhouette of the founder of the Sword Maidens. These days, her existence was a legend to the contemporary Sword Maidens, many of which joined the Mech Legion long after joining the Larkinson clan. While Dice had grown far stronger and risen far higher than Commander Lydia could ever dream of, the ace pilot still respected her old leader from the bottom of her heart. She channeled her love, her heartfelt respect, and her regret for the deceased woman's inability to witness the Sword Maidens at their current height into the Decapitator. At the same time, Dice also sent Respa into her superdimensional greatsword. The companion spirit not only offered a direct enhancement but also enabled Dice to resonate with the Decapitator to a significantly greater extent. Soon enough, the energy manifestation of a larger blade extended from the actual weapon. As the First Sword Mark III almost reached her target, she did not do anything to avoid a collision with the reversed Saint Piercer this time. Saint Dice only a loud cry before the tip of her augmented greatsword struck the enemy's superdimensional weapon. Sword of Lydia. Her words rang throughout the battlefield, surpassing the limitations of distance and vacuum before ringing into everyone's ears. Their deeper meaning pressed down on any intelligent mind, no matter whether they were human or alien. The power of the Decapitator was unstoppable. Although the front end of the energy manifestation crumbled fairly quickly, the physical tip of the weapon-grade superdimensional blade pierced through without stopping. All along the length of the reversed polearm, the straight great sword continued to cut through the alien superdimensional alloy as if it was trying to split a lengthy sausage in half. The ace mech continued to push forward with astounding speed. She hardly lost any of her formidable momentum while continuing her cutting efforts. By the time the Decapitator had cut through a third of the polearm's length, the ace mech finally altered her course and flew upwards. There was no time or opportunity for the Fifth Lord to lash out with another kick. The superdimensional ace mech's latest absurd feat had completely broken his cognition. By the time he mustered the thought of resisting, the First Sword Mark III's glowing blade punched straight through the helmet of his Saint Blocker raiment and predictably offered no meaningful resistance. The Decapitator ultimately pierced directly into his skull and devastated a large portion of his brain matter. Almost everyone froze. Even the reinforcing Phase Lords stagnated in their attempts to help their fellow native god. The First Sword Mark III launched a few more attacks against her unresisting foe. Once she became sure that she completely ruined the greater Phase Lord's brain, her intuition told her that she had successfully ended the powerful foe's life. By the time her ace mech pulled out the Decapitator, none of the phase water-infused blood clung to her blade. The Fifth Lord of Bisquet has perished. Saint Dice and her first sword have managed to kill him in just under a minute. This was not the first time that a Larkinson ace pilot managed to slay a greater Phase Lord. Yet this time was different. Saint Dice had undoubtedly demonstrated her strength, but that alone shouldn't have been enough to completely abuse a greater Phase Lord of this caliber to the point of snuffing out his life in such a short amount of time. Everyone knew without question that the ace pilot owed much of her stellar performance to superdimensional technology. T2 Strong. Chapter 69, 92, 69, 92, Stolen Power. Saint Dice Larkinson claimed her first kill. VS uttered as he observed the battle in the comfort of his own design lab. He had declined to observe the battle at the bridge of the Tortuous Scream. He did not possess a lot of military acumen, and there was little chance he could offer any advice that Casella Ingvar had not already considered herself. Besides, he felt it would be better if the soldiers of the Premier Fleet got used to being led by the Saint Commander. His presence in the bridge might cause Larkinsons to doubt who they should look to for orders. Not exactly, VS. The physical projection of Kedis muttered. To most observers, it is the superdimensional ace swordsman mech that claimed her first kill. This is an important distinction. You and I both know that Saint Dice's skills bring out the most in her ace mech and her weapons, but I know what you mean. The role played by her weapon-grade superdimensional great sword is disproportionately decisive in this confrontation. Sure, the Fifth Lord of Bisquet did not know what to expect, but that final display of hers was an overwhelming demonstration of the power of high-grade superdimensional matter. At least this duel, however brief it may be, will prove that even weaker ace pilots can properly leverage the power of superdimensional matter. I have received more than my fair share of criticism that told me that expending so much weapon and armor-grade superdimensional matter on the machine of a junior ace pilot is wasted. Now that Saint Dice has mopped up the greater phase lord that is most susceptible to her blades, she is left with two much more difficult opponents. Are you worried? Not that much? Kedis continued to express her confidence in her work. No matter what tricks they may pull off, the difference in material quality is not a gap that they can close so easily. I am already happy with the results. It is a bonus if Saint Dice manages to drive away the other two greater phase lords, but strictly speaking, it is already enough if she is able to keep them occupied. It would be especially great if she can hunt down the lesser phase lords while she is at it. The Saint Commander and the rest of her forces are about to enter into engagement range with the remaining alien forces. I am confident that she can crush the spirits of the alien cannon fodder. Although the alien forces did not show it, they definitely received a heavy blow to their morale. These days, most aliens accepted the reality that the human, false gods possessed the ability to defeat and even kill their own native gods. The demise of so many lesser phase leaders, greater phase leaders, and most egregiously ancient phase whales could not be hidden from the masses. Perhaps the Red Cabal and other alien groups likened the human high-ranking pilots as devils who had come from another galaxy to corrupt and devour the righteous gods of the Red Ocean. Whatever the case, both VS and Kedis had high hopes that the First Sword Mark III would embrace this evil role and continue to add more phase lord kills to her name. How's your other mission coming along? Kedis casually asked. Karnak base has become much more devastated than I anticipated. Her former mentor replied. All of the damage and debris is making it easier for Lucky and my avatar to sneak around. The alien guards also have much greater concerns on their minds than a pair of sneaky buggers. The only downside is that navigation has also become a lot more difficult. Entire corridors and rooms have collapsed. We have yet to find the inner sanctum of the resident greater phase lord. You were looking for a pool of water, right? Shouldn't that be easy for you to detect? It would if I dare to turn on our active sensor systems. That would immediately give away the presence of infiltrators. I prefer to keep the alien soldiers ignorant and stupid. While the two mech designers continued to talk, the situation on the battlefield had taken a new turn. The protector of Karnak and the Endless Stomach had finally arrived, but not in time to save their fallen comrade. The two arrivals were not only phase lords in the field. 11 lesser phase lords had deployed near the flagships of their fleets, which matched the gathered intelligence. A team of 2 greater phase lords backed up by 11 lesser phase lords was a potent killing force in almost any other situation. No single ace mech could withstand the coordinated pressure of so many phase lords at once. Yet the superdimensional First Sword Mark III presented such a drastic technological leap from the previous human false gods that none of the alien native gods dared to take this new opponent lightly. According to the resonance meters that the native aliens had adopted in order to measure the strength of these confounding human false gods, the First Sword Mark III's true resonance only measured a peak of 133 lavares at most. The higher-ranking aliens knew that these ace mechs posed a real threat against 1 or 2 lesser phase lords, but could easily be repelled by a larger band of native gods. Of course, it took a lot more than that to actually kill these fast and annoying metal flies. Yet this superdimensional fly already demonstrated a crushing amount of strength at this measly level of resonance strength. The alien leaders did not know what to do. This was a completely new situation to them. The humans had once again rewritten the rules. After the phase lords conferred among themselves on a private communication channel, they finally formulated their emergency strategy. The lesser phase lords wisely stuck close to their fleets and showed no intention of getting close to the First Sword Mark III. Her mobility combined with her high-grade superdimensional armor system made her impervious against practically anything these weaker phase lords could throw at the ace mech. In the end, the protector of Karnak and the Endless Stomach assumed the dangerous but necessary duty of fighting the threatening machine. Before they made their moves, the Jureg Greater Phase Lord decided to address the dollar and at $%. Human false god. The Jureg Greater Phase Lord addressed the human ace pilot. Thief you may be, but you have earned our acknowledgement for defeating one of our gods. Announce your identity. We must know who has come to challenge us with a machine built on the bones of the elder gods. Silence ensued as the First Sword Mark III did not appear to be in a hurry to respond. In fact, Saint Dice recognized the benefit of stalling. Each passing second brought the forces of the Premier Fleet and the Blue Jay Fleet closer to Screed Tanner 6F. Stalling also bought her ace mech precious time to run her diagnostic systems and perform a myriad of fine adjustments. It might not look like it, but the First Sword Mark III overstressed a few of her systems. As a brand new ace mech that had yet to test her systems in a battle of this intensity, the First Sword Mark III had already overloaded her electroreactant flight system several times. Her arms and shoulders also endured a disproportionately large amount of physical pressure during the moment the ace mech split the Saint Piercer along a third of its length. While the First Sword Mark III appeared extraordinarily valiant while pulling off these heroic feats, the reality was that Dice had been a bit too eager to push her machine to her limits and perhaps beyond. While mechs and particularly high-end ones like the Mark III were designed for extreme performance, the problem was that the ace mech was still new and untested. Even with the willpower baptism of an ace pilot, the latest iteration of the First Sword still presented a lot of unknowns. Keddies and the Meshers were particularly concerned about unexpected side effects of placing advanced technological components in very close proximity to large amounts of high-grade superdimensional matter. It was not impossible for the former to glitch out during a crucial moment. Fortunately, such a disaster had yet to happen, but it was still risky for St. Dice to play with fire in her very first engagement with her new machine. This was why the Larkinsons and Meshers were glad that she was not eager to press the attack. Her highly engineered ace mech needed all of the time she could get to complete her self-diagnostics and detect potential catastrophes in advance and make sure to squash them while they were still in their infancy. After a lengthy pause, the first sword finally responded. The ace mech lifted her decapitator and held it in front of her with the blade pointed upwards. Her large and dazzling electric wings unfolded from behind while her sword Fey assumed a perfectly symmetrical wedge formation that extended the illusionary wings. I am St. Dice Larkinson, pilot and partner of the First Sword Mark III. Both of us hail from the Larkinson clan. Now you know who has taken the life of alien comrade in arms. By the time this battle comes to an end, he shall not be the only greater phase lord who falls at our hand. Her response sounded simple and went straight to the point. She even made the arrogant declaration that she would take the life of another greater phase lord. Although this was an incredibly arrogant and foolish claim to make when her resonance strength peaked only at 133 Lavares, the protector of Karnak and the Endless Stomach had no choice but to respect her words. Perhaps the ace pilot alone did not constitute a serious threat against them, but her ace mech completely changed the game. The human false gods relied too much on their metal technology to enhance their combat potential. The alien gods looked down on these weak and puny humans for basing their strength on how well they controlled their fancy equipment as opposed to becoming strong in the most direct possible manner. Yet the alien phase leaders also hated and feared the humans for being so damn good at becoming one with their combat gear. Despite the fact that even a normal foot soldier could kill an ace pilot when the latter was outside of a cockpit as long as the human false god was in place, then he became nearly unkillable. The humans hated the phase leaders for relying on their incredibly strong spatial barriers to resist so many attacks. At the same time, the aliens hated human ace mechs for relying on their small size, their good to excellent mobility and their absurd reality-defying Saint Kingdoms for being difficult to kill as well. Both sides relied on completely different heritages and technological paradigms to gain supremacy on and off the battlefield. Although they could look down on each other all they wanted, that did not stop them from being effective. Now, Red humanity had taken the lead in this high-level arms race. If high-grade superdimensional matter became more common, then the alien gods needed to be even more careful on the battlefield. $% and dot. You have become strong, but only by relying on the bones of ancient gods that have long disappeared. Be warned, Dice of the Larkinsons, for your strength is stolen from us, the descendants of the elder gods. We shall one day take back what is ours. The god bones that you rely so much upon shall be stripped away from your machine, leaving you with nothing but a metal shell. Our wrath is endless, and your tiny body can never withstand our retribution. Those words certainly sounded ominous, but phase lords had a tendency to be blowhards. St. Dice completely shrugged off the threat and warning and readied herself for the second round of battle. Her ace mech raised her decapitator. Bones or not, it doesn't matter. The law of the jungle applies. Kill me and take away our superdimensional matter if you object to my battle partner. Just do not complain if we do the same to your enormous body. Chapter 6993 Red Cabal Responses. The battle between the First Sword Mark III and the Greater Phase Lords resumed again. St. Dice clearly felt confident enough to confront her enemies despite being surrounded by enemies on all sides. With her new superdimensional ace mech, she no longer took the threat posed by the phase fighters and warships seriously anymore. Her sword Fey alone could chop them into pieces so long as they got close enough. After the two sides had completed their little exchange, the Protector of Karnak made the first move. The Protector of Karnak ultimately made the first move. Without warning, he disappeared from sight. If not for St. Dice's sharp intuition, she would have responded too late. By the time her ace mech detected a strong presence had appeared just a few hundred meters away. It turned out that the Jureg Greater Phase Lord utilized a phase water organ that granted him the capacity to perform short-range teleportation with no delay. Although the Protector of Karnak found himself unable to get closer than the edge of the First Sword's Saint Kingdom, this also brought him close enough to unleash his killer move. Instead of activating another phase water ability or charging forward so that he could attempt to snap the First Sword Mark III in half with his empowered claw, the Protector of Karnak instead made a surprising move. Several banks of back-mounted missile launchers began to launch a spread of short-ranged, high-yield transphasic missiles straight at the First Sword. These missiles were not as small and compact as the ones typically launched from mechs. The Protector of Karnak maintained a size that was several times larger than a typical mech. This granted him enough of a scale advantage to mount larger weapon systems on his fully enclosed raiment. Just like a juggernaut, more or less. Dice did not know how much phase water the native aliens had stuffed into the warheads of the incoming missiles, but she instinctively felt that they possessed the power to crack or heavily damage her First Sword Mark III upon direct impact. Her sharp intuition automatically prompted her to make a move before she consciously thought about her response. 8 of her sword Fae already jumped forward and split up in order to intercept all 8 threatening missiles. Meanwhile, the enemy warheads encountered a strange form of resistance as they plunged deeper into the Ace Mech's Saint Kingdom. While Dice's domain field was almost entirely offensive in orientation, it was still able to weaken and slow down the missiles just enough to give the sword Fae enough time for interception. Just as the Saint Kingdom weakened the enemy missiles, they also amplified the sword Fae, making them a lot faster and tougher. Everything happened in an instant. Unlike lower-end missiles, the premium munitions issued by the Red Cabal did not let themselves get cut into half with a whimper. Their potent warheads exploded as soon as they encountered significant resistance. Multiple detonations occurred at the same time as soon as the sword Fae were about to cut through the missiles. By the time the interference settled, St. Dice's eyes widened when she noticed that all of her sword Fae suffered heavy damage. Each of their tips were just gone. The back half of the spurs were still intact but also showed significant signs of damage. 3 of the crippled sword Fae had become entirely unresponsive. The remaining 5 moved so slowly and shakily that there was no point in controlling them anymore. In just a single exchange, the Protector of Karnak had removed 8 mid-grade super-dimensional sword Fae off the board. Although St. Dice was a little more confident that her Ace Mech's armor-grade super-dimensional alloy plating could resist these missiles, the first sword would never be able to get away unscathed. A single high-yield transphasic missile might not be able to punch through all of the armor layers, but what about 8? What about 16? What about 32? There was no way the enemy Phase Lord's missile launchers could only unleash a single salvo. Even now, she strongly suspected that the Greater Phase Lord was waiting for his launchers to load another set of transphasic missiles into the tubes. There was no guarantee that these missiles would possess the same yield as the ones that exploded just before. What if their yield had doubled or tripled? The first sword would definitely suffer a more serious blow up to and including an armor breach. The Protector of Karnak did not continue to linger beyond her Saint Kingdom. The Greater Phase Lord demonstrated considerable courage by diving straight inside. The results of the initial missile salvo encouraged the alien leader. It had thoroughly broken the myth that a super-dimensional ace mech was invincible. St. Dice scowled and chose to meet the enemy's challenge. So long as she was close enough, she believed the Protector of Karnak would not be so quick to launch his destructive missiles for fear of harming himself. As the first sword Mark III executed a moderately empowered sword slash at the larger and more formidably armored Phase Lord, the Protector of Karnak fearlessly extended one of his armored crustacean-like claws. The blade glowed and glinted with metal energy and true resonance. The claw glowed within a mysterious dark blue tint that strongly exuded the power of space. 2 different super-dimensional arms clashed against each other. The moment the two collided against each other, the fabric of space rippled like a stone dropped in a lake. Both sides bounced backwards as if they had just struck a solid wall. The results of this exchange became clear. St. Dice grew disappointed when she saw that her super-dimensional decapitator failed to slice through the claw as easily as she had chopped off the limb of her previous opponent. TCH. Just as I thought. The decapitator managed to stay completely undamaged, but the masterwork great sword failed to leave behind more than a shallow groove onto the armored claw. Although this had hardly been the first sword's strongest attack, the Protector of Karnak's ability to block a high-grade super-dimensional blade was far better than that of the 5th Lord of Bisquet. $$. Do not mistake me for that nunzer failure of a god. I have learned the greater mysteries of space by the true gods of this galaxy. My body carries the organs handcrafted by those very same gods. I shall borrow the power of the true gods to thoroughly expose your false claim to divinity. Well, all of that self-righteous boasting was useful for more than making Phase Lords drunk on their own ego. They inadvertently revealed valuable intelligence and confirmed many theories. Of course, that was assuming that they spoke the truth. Given the Protector of Karnak's position within the Red Cabal's hierarchy, it did not seem likely that he was speaking in error. This confirmed that the Red Cabal had responded incredibly quickly to the rise of superdimensional mechs. The native aliens recognized the threat of humans harnessing the power of superdimensional matter and came up with a quick but effective countermeasure. Dice believed that the Protector of Karnak may have been part of the first batch of Phase Lords that was assigned to test whether his new toys could withstand the power of human superdimensional weapons. The current result should definitely please the Red Cabal. No longer would Phase Lords and Phase Whales foolishly expose their enormous true bodies, trusting that their enormous transphasic flesh alone would be able to resist anything the human false gods could throw in their direction. Before the first sword Mark III could close in for another attack, the Protector of Karnak rushed forward first. Dice's Saint Kingdom immediately tried to press onto the formidable true body of the Jureg Phase Lord, but its sheer mass along with disturbingly effective protection offered by his alien superdimensional armor made it difficult to produce any significant results. The Protector of Karnak lashed out with 2 glowing claws that threatened to snap or at least cut into the waist of the first sword Mark III. The Ace Mech's electric wings swung and enabled her to dodge to the side. At the same time, the first sword struck with the decapitator, seeking to block the closest claw. Another eruption of spatial ripples spread from the point of the contact. The superdimensional armor that covered up the claw received another small cut mark, but this one was shallower than the one before. The first sword needed to put more momentum and energy behind her sword attacks, but it was hard for her to disengage when the Protector of Karnak continued to dog her heels. Dice soon found out that her ace mech was actually faster and much more responsive than her opponent. Yet whenever her ace mech successfully created a bit of distance, the Protector of Karnak activated the phase water organ that enabled him to blink through space. There was no warning. There was no obvious energy buildup. Dice could only rely on her intuition to quickly orient her defenses in the direction the greater phase lord appeared. What made her life even more difficult was in some instances, the Protector of Karnak launched a salvo of high-yield transphasic missiles immediately after completing his instant displacement. Dice had to rely purely on her intuition and her read on her opponent to predict this threatening move in advance. She had learned her lesson this time. Dice no longer sent out her sword Fae to intercept the missiles. Her ace mech instead accumulated a bit of sword energy in advance and hastily swung the decapitator in a fast sweep, sending out multiple rays of sword energy that accurately intercepted the missiles and forced them to explode in advance. Since her sword energy attacks remained in her Saint Kingdom, they fully benefited from her willpower. There was no instance where her response failed to stop the warheads. As the first sword Mark III continued to collide her decapitator against the empowered claws of the Protector of Karnak, St. Dice began to smirk. To be able to teleport so close to my battle partner while her high-end space suppressor is active must be exhausting to you. Tell me, how many more times can you repeat that blink attack? Also, how many more transphasic missiles do you carry? The Jureg Greater Phase Lord did not lose his rhythm even as the remaining 25 Sword Fae harassed him from the rear and sides. The Sword Fae formed simple formations that grouped 3 of them together before striking the Protector of Karnak's superdimensional armor from different angles. Most of the strikes managed to penetrate a single layer at a time, but there were occasions where they failed to leave a mark. This happened whenever the Protector of Karnak activated a phase water organ that empowered that particular armor section. The blue glow significantly strengthened the spatial attributes of the superdimensional material, enabling it to resist attacks from other superdimensional weapons a lot better. All of this delayed the time the first sword would be able to breach the Greater Phase Lord's armor. As long as the ace mech was able to create one big gap, Dice was confident she could finish off her opponent. Yet just before she was about to lock her great sword against those armored claws, Dice suddenly pulled her ace mech away. The electric wings propelled the first sword to the side and rear just in time to evade the giant pillar that plunged into her Saint Kingdom and almost threatened to collide against the machine. The Endless Stomach had made his move. The Greater Phase Lord had attempted to play subtle and lingered in the distance. Though he had waited long enough for Dice to become a little too fixated on the Protector of Karnak, she was not stupid enough to ignore this massive threat entirely. Her companion Spirit had been keeping a constant eye on the Endless Stomach. The moment he did anything notable, Respa had already warned Dice in advance. Chapter 69, 94, 69, 94, The Endless Stomach. When the Endless Stomach struck, St. Dice was already poised to react. She successfully evaded the Zamael Greater Phase Lord's initial strike, but this was just the beginning. The Phase Whales may regard themselves as high and mighty gods, but they were also shameless enough to gang up on a single opponent. The two had already determined their cooperative strategy. The Protector of Karnak became even more dogged in his pursuit of the superdimensional ace mech. Each time the first sword Mark III attempted to back away, the Greater Phase Lord came right behind. Even if the ace mech channeled additional energy into her electroreactant flight system to speed up her flight, the Protector of Karnak would just blink over, thereby negating the effort. What was really annoying was that the Greater Phase Lord kept Dice guessing when he would launch his next salvo of transphasic missiles. Although the Protector of Karnak clearly tried to ration them, his reserves of potent missiles was greater than Dice initially expected. Her expression sank when she guessed that the Protector of Karnak had many different ways of storing a large amount of goods in his own true body. If he wanted to retrieve another set of missiles, he just had to dig them out of his partially unfolded body somehow. Dice had no idea how multidimensional physics worked, so she could not explain how it was possible for the Jureg Greater Phase Lord to pull stuff out of his own true body. Yet the reality of the situation meant that the ace pilot had to remain on high alert and never let go of her vigilance. As long as her focus slacked off at the wrong time, she would definitely pay for her mistake. Still, as difficult as it may be to put more distance between herself and the Protector of Karnak, she considered him to be a lesser threat compared to the latest Greater Phase Lord to join the fray. From the way the Protector of Karnak maneuvered, he clearly wanted to drive the first sword Mark III closer to the Endless Stomach. Dice had a pretty good idea why. She had never fought against a Zamael Greater Phase Lord, but she roughly understood what they were generally capable of. She knew that she needed to employ an entirely different approach to deal with these slime-like monstrosities. When the Endless Stomach maneuvered his way so that he was able to sandwich the first sword Mark III with the help of the Protector of Karnak, the former made another attempt to pounce on his opponent. The first sword immediately turned around and struck at the other Greater Phase Lord, only to see the resonance-empowered blade passing straight through the slimy, amorphous body like it was cutting through jelly. St. Dice scowled, but she had already expected this result. Even as the endless stomach opened up a large maw that was ringed with specially made superdimensional teeth, the first sword Mark III's electric wings boosted her away in time, thereby preventing her from getting engulfed. You shall not devour me, you filthy monster. Of all of the phased lords that ace pilots and particularly those that specialized in melee combat had fought against, the Zamael variation was among the worst. The Zamaels were disgusting slime-like creatures that possessed no solid body mass aside from a core. Nobody had any idea how such a race could evolve to grow sentient and intelligent enough to become good at biotechnology and become one of the major races of the Red Ocean. What was even more outrageous was that the Zamaels also possessed the capability to become phased lords despite their strange physiology. Yet it was also due to their amorphous true bodies that their phased lords tended to be weirder than most. The most obvious one was that most melee and particularly cutting attacks were pretty much useless. Even as the first sword Mark III continued to dance between the two greater phase lords and retaliate whenever possible, her superdimensional decapitator passed through the endless stomach's unarmored form without inflicting any noticeable damage. The ace pilot felt as if her battle partner was just cutting through water. Seeing that the superdimensional properties of her powerful sword turned out to be completely ineffective in this situation, St. Dice narrowed her eyes and began to execute a different and more powerful sword technique. Bladestorm. As the ace mech swung her glowing decapitator, the great sword unleashed an expanding storm that consisted of thousands of small sword energy attacks. The storm struck the endless stomach and began to cut through many portions of his body. However, the small and weak sword energy blades lacked power and dissipated fairly quickly. While the endless stomach suffered damage across his entire side, his slimy body simply closed the gaps and returned to his peak condition. St. Dice knew that she had no chance of defeating and killing this greater phased lord by herself today. The best way to kill him was to destroy his core. Yet to reach it, her first sword Mark III would have to wade through all of his slimy body. This was clearly not feasible, so she could only reduce his slime body first. There were many ways to accomplish this. Explosive weapons and energy weapons worked best at blasting away or vaporizing a lot of slime matter. Melee weapons, on the other hand, fared less well unless they possessed energy weapon properties as well. This was not the case for the decapitator or the surviving sword Fae. All of them were solid superdimensional blades that happened to encounter one of the few situations where their special properties turned out to be ineffective. In the end, St. Dice found that she was slightly able to inflict more losses onto the endless stomach by using the flat side of her ace mech's mace to literally scoop away chunks of transphasic slime. Even then, the efficiency of this attack was so low that the first sword would have to scoop all of this slimy matter for several hours in order to exhaust the endless stomach. When the endless stomach next attempted to swallow the first sword, the ace mech was just in the process of repelling the protector of Karnak's latest strike. This was bad. The Zamael phase lord had picked a good time to strike. Not only was the first sword not able to turn around and respond immediately, but the slimy monstrosity also contorted its body so that it was able to launch an extremity forward with much greater speed than expected. St. Dice reacted in a split second. Her ace mech overloaded the safeties of the electroreactant flight system and forced it to give her a powerful boost, even if it came at the cost of strong wear and tear. While certain parts of the abused flight system were already starting to drop into yellow condition, the ace pilot already sent out her nearest sword Fae in an attempt to intercept the transphasic slime arm. Fortunately, the ace pilot had kept them close to her machine in order to respond to emergencies like these. The sword Fae plunged tip first into the slimy arm. While they only parted through the transphasic matter without inflicting any permanent damage, they still managed to play a useful role. The slimy tendril lost cohesion, especially since it was relatively thin due to being extended from the main body. Although the limb already showed signs of recovery, it took time for it to regain cohesion. The successive sword Fae strikes further weakened the limb and ultimately caused it to slow down just enough for the first sword Mark III to slip away from its reach. Yet when St. Dice attempted to recall her weapons, she found to her dismay that the sword Fae couldn't escape their prison once they had entered its viscous embrace. Like glue, the endless stomach's transphasic flesh instantly transported the captured blades to the center of his body. There, the superdimensional teeth immediately began to grind on the sword Fae, attempting to break them down until Dice lost all control over her weapons. The female ace pilot gritted her teeth. Through her true resonance empowerment, she could feel how the blades already started to succumb from the repeated grinding and biting attacks. If the endless stomach did not recently acquire his superdimensional teeth, then it would have taken much longer for him to damage the sword Fae. However, now that he had received this massive upgrade, it only took a few bites for the sword Fae to crack, deform and malfunction. Dice regrettably gave up on the weapons. She did not even think of going back to retrieve the sword Fae. The mid-grade superdimensional alloy used to make them was fairly precious, but the Larkinson clan had plenty more of it. There was no need to treat them as carefully as her decapitator, as they had already been designed with sacrifice in mind. In any case, the subordinate spirits returned smoothly to the first sword Mark III. So long as they remained alive, the replacement sword Fae would quickly regain the same life and personality. At this time, the battle between the first sword Mark III and the two greater phase lords had entered into a stalemate. Both sides had figured out most of the core capabilities of their adversaries. St. Dice no longer fought as aggressively as before. Since her ace mech was constantly outnumbered, she had little choice but to err on the side of caution. The Protector of Karnak and the Endless Stomach both cooperated smoothly with each other. They understood each other's strengths and possessed enough age and experience to understand how to best leverage their advantages. Even if St. Dice was also able to respond better due to her growing familiarity with her opponents, their teamwork continued to improve, thereby making it difficult for either side to gain the upper hand. Another factor that played in the back of their minds was their consumption. Each of them expended large amounts of energy, willpower, phase water, and other resources. They also wore out their weapons, armor, and other tech when applicable. The First Sword Mark III had not been fighting for too long, but St. Dice knew that she was pushing her ace mech too hard in order to compensate for her own shortcomings. The reliability and health of the electroreactant flight system had dropped considerably. Dice did not dare to make too many high-risk maneuvers for fear of causing it to reach its breaking point too soon. The energy reserves of her ace mech was also draining at a rapid rate. In addition, her ace mech was only down to 19 sword fei, and she expected to lose more of them if she continued to fight against these two powerful opponents. The only consolation was that her opponents were also bleeding from this engagement. The Protector of Karnak had repeatedly used his blink phase water organ in short intervals of time. That sort of abuse should definitely take a toll on the greater phase lord. He was also expending a lot of concentration and possibly phase water to amplify the spatial properties of his superdimensional claws and armor. While the effects were undeniably strong, St. Dice possessed enough common sense to understand that this had to cost a lot to sustain. While phase lords tended to show greater advantages in terms of endurance due to their massive physical forms, Dice refused to believe that the Protector of Karnak could teleport under adverse conditions so often. She was waiting for the moment the greater phase lord had completely lost his interception ability. Already the Jureg phase lord had been waiting longer and longer before he caught up through teleportation. Understanding his limit was of paramount importance. As for the Endless Stomach, the Zamiel phase lord did more than trying to devour the First Sword Mark III. The Endless Stomach released a cloud of transphasic toxins. The terrible monster attempted to weaken the First Sword Mark III by engulfing the entire machine in his own phase water-infused poison. Chapter 69, 95, 69, 95, Ultimate Deterrence. The First Sword Mark III struggled against the two greater phase lords. The fifth lord of Bisquet had no idea who he had been messing with and suffered for his habit of looking down on the human false gods. While his loss represented a heavy blow to the Nunzers in the star system, there were many other alien species that still possessed the determination to resist the evil human devil that had slain one of their deities. To them, this battle was no different from a struggle between good and evil. Only by uniting their strength and listening to the guidance of their surviving gods would they be able to vanquish the fearsome extragalactic invaders. Not that it mattered to St. Dice. Despite fighting well within range of countless enemy guns, her ace mech continued to fly and parade in front of the native aliens with impunity. So long as her Saint Kingdom and her armor-grade superdimensional armor system remained fully functional and intact, she had little fear that the overwhelming amount of enemy guns could pose a realistic threat against her battle partner. For one, any warship that dared to open fire against the First Sword Mark III was liable to hit one of the nearby greater phase lords as well. There was no way that the rank-and-file aliens possessed the guts to harm their native gods, even if they only did so on an accidental basis. Much of their firepower would probably go to waste as well. The First Sword Mark III constantly remained on the move. Although she was pushing her electroreactant flight system way past her tolerances, Dice still remained confident that it would keep her machine moving for the time being. With the help of her intuition, she had already managed to evade most of the massed attack salvos from the nearest enemy warships and orbital defense platforms. As a melee mech specialist who had spent many years piloting a mech that was many times more fragile, St. Dice had honed her intuition to detect any imminent attacks. Even if she was not as good as St. Tusa in this aspect, Dice prided herself on being the second best in terms of evasion. She seriously doubted whether the other ace pilots of the Larkinson clan could get close to matching the pair. St. Devia Stark, St. Isabel Coden, and St. Commander Casella Ingvar usually fought outside of harm's way most of the time. St. General Ark Larkinson may be proficient in melee combat, but he either went on an all-out offensive or bided his time. If he ever chose to challenge formidable opponents, he preferred to enter into quick and brutal brawls where he was more than willing to let his lion heart take beatings if that helped to eliminate his foes as quickly as possible. Naturally, that sort of fighting style was not too conducive to training and honing his evasion skills. The First Sword Mark III currently proved that she was able to dance and glide across the battlefield without relying on overloading her flight system all of the time. St. Dice constantly improved and optimized her handling of her ace mech. The pressure of the battlefield served as an excellent engine to squeeze out more performance from her machine. Even as she continued to fend off the Protector of Karnak and the Endless Stomach, it became clear to her that she could not gain an advantage over her opponents. If she was facing just one of them at a time, then she was confident that she could outplay her opponent somehow. Yet because the two had teamed up against her, she had no opportunity to launch a serious counterattack. The two greater phase lords knew what they were doing. They not only sought to constrain her movement but also positioned themselves so that they could punish her any time she chose to commit an attack. It did not help that St. Dice clearly preferred to go on the offensive against the Protector of Karnak. The Jureg Phase Lord was just a lot easier to deal with as his body and superdimensional armor at least presented her with a solid target. The same could not be said for the Endless Stomach, whose giant slime-like body was not only difficult to damage with a blade but also started to engage in disgusting means of attack. Not only had he begun to launch slime balls that threatened to stick to the First Sword Mark III and gum up her joints, he also began to spread a toxic cloud of gas around his body. Although the Saint Kingdom was able to repel and weaken the effect of this toxic cloud, she could still feel it trying to corrode the exterior of her mech. Her superdimensional armor was able to resist it with ease, but not every surface component was made of solid metal. The more delicate and exposed parts of her sensor systems and more importantly her flight system began to suffer more serious damage after prolonged exposure. Dice had become especially sensitive towards the latter as she could not afford to let the electroreactant flight system incur further abuse. As her First Sword Mark III whipped out a quick spray of sword energy attacks in order to intercept the latest salvo of transphasic missiles, Dice quickly checked the state of the battlefield. The forces of the Premier Fleet and the Blue Jay Fleet had just begun to open fire at the enemy. While their initial attacks did not inflict much damage due to hitting fully powered Azure energy shields, Dice knew that this was just the beginning. Once the mechs came close enough, the Saint Commander would fully make use of her command field to empower the attacks of all of the mechs under her sway with a touch of true resonance. The attacks of all of those first-class multipurpose mechs would definitely inflict much greater damage at that point. During the strategy sessions, Dice already knew that the Saint Commander grew concerned whether this highly effective display of firepower would incur the wrath of multiple lesser Phase Lords and maybe even greater Phase Lords. Dice could already see the lesser Phase Lords poised to launch an offensive against the two human fleets. After all, they were too weak and vulnerable to assist the greater Phase Lords in suppressing the First Sword Mark III. It made much more sense for them to leverage their superior strength against the mortal humans. This was especially the case when the two fleets was only protected by a single ace pilot at most, and she happened to be an ace commander who lacked the characteristic Saint Kingdom. Not on my watch. After clashing against the Protector of Karnak for the umpteenth time, St. Dice no longer tried to go for the big prize anymore. Her ace mech abruptly turned around and flew straight towards the nearest raiding fleet. Although the two greater Phase Lords reacted with surprise at this abrupt switch in strategy, they quickly pursued their adversary. It did not take much thinking to figure out her intentions. $at. Coward. Your opponents are US. You shall earn our eternal retribution if you seek to slaughter our younger gods. Your honor is worth nothing if you attack the weak. St. Dice sneered when she interpreted the angry alien Phase Lord's speech. Do not lecture me on honor. This is war, not a duel. Besides, I do not see you and your Zamael buddy have been ganging up against me. Forgive me for not entertaining the two you at once. The Endless Stomach was not fast enough to keep up with the First Sword Mark III. The same applied to the Protector of Karnak, but he repeatedly blinked forward in space, enabling him to catch up to the superdimensional ace mech while also launching a surprise attack at the same time. St. Dice and her battle partner still could not measure any emissions that could tell them when the Jureg Phase Lord was about to perform his blink ability. Yet that did not stop the ace pilot from anticipating this move in advance. In fact, witnessing the Protector of Karnak pull off the same old technique on a repeated basis had improved the ace pilot's ability to predict this very move. She could not entirely explain it other than the fact that she had grown more familiar with the Protector of Karnak's attitude, ideas and methods. In the next few blink interception attempts, the Greater Phase Lord found himself too far away from her target to launch an attack with his armored claws. This was because the First Sword Mark III had already begun to evade to the side before the sudden teleportation event happened. The Jureg Greater Phase Lord felt chilled when he realized how much easier his opponent had read his move and intentions. These repeated failures eventually prevented the Protector of Karnak from fulfilling his most immediate priority, which was to shield the Lesser Phase Lord from the lethality of a superdimensional ace mech. The Lesser Phase Lords had clearly gotten the message and had already begun to split up and distance themselves from their previous positions. Still, as fast as they managed to flee, their warp travel capabilities were considerably weaker due to their lower phase water concentration. The First Sword Mark III easily caught up with the first fleeing Phase Lord, who also happened to hail from the Nunza race, and sent out her Sword Fae first. Only 15 Sword Fae remained intact and fully functional at this time, but this was enough. The resonance-empowered superdimensional blades pierced through the Lesser Phase Lord's spatial barrier with much greater ease and plunged straight through his raiment and into his flesh. Lesser Phase Lords did not possess the power and influence to obtain proper superdimensional armor. Their raiments, if they even had any, were merely made out of a combination of transphasic materials and hypermaterials. It was clear that they were stuck with more affordable tech and materials that would have been perfectly fine in an earlier time. However, this was a time where superdimensional technology was on the ascendancy. Against a weaker opponent that only enjoyed the protection of last-gen equipment, the mid-grade superdimensional Sword Fae easily cut through the armor, flesh and bones like tofu. By the time the first Sword Mark III approached the neck of the pained and crippled Phase Lord, her glowing decapitator severed the large head from the rest of the quadruped body without encountering any significant resistance. A lesser Phase Lord died by Dice's hand. For a moment she felt rather befuddled by how easy it was. She would have struggled a lot more not too long ago. Her recent fighting against the two hardy greater Phase Lords had put her expectations out of whack and caused her to forget how much of a game-changer her ace mech had become. A sense of greed and desire overtook her mind. A grin appeared on her face. Since it was that easy to eliminate lesser Phase Lords, then she became determined to mop the rest of them up. The greater Phase Lords could wait until later. The first Sword Mark III collected her Sword Fae and changed course in order to pursue another fleeing target. Even though the ace mech had yet to claim her second lesser Phase Lord head, her deterrence alone had been enough to break the spirits of most of the enemy champions. No matter how much the two greater Phase Lords cajoled and admonished their lesser brethren, the lesser Phase Lords simply refused to stay too close to the demon of an ace mech. If one of their own could be felled with so much ease, then they could potentially become vulnerable as well. The lesser Phase Lords would rather abandon their fleets and let this battle end in a devastating loss than risk their own lives. In any case, their lifespans had expanded so much that they had so many more experiences on his agenda. They did not want to cut their lives short before they could properly enjoy centuries if not millennia of being treated and worshipped like gods. Chapter 6996 Casella takes charge. The lesser Phase Lords failed to heed the call of the protector of Karnak. Not only did they refuse to stand their ground and form a united front against the superdimensional ace mech, they all but abandoned their fleets and fled in different directions. This was an incredibly clear display of cowardice and miscoordination that disappointed a lot of their mortal soldiers. Their morale plunged and their faith in their accompanying gods deteriorated at a rapid speed. While most of the alien soldiers proved themselves to be professional enough to perform their duties despite the setback, they had become significantly less enthusiastic and coordinated than before. The alien spacers and officers had definitely become a lot more distracted than before. St. Dice fulfilled one of her objectives. She grinned wider even as the annoying lesser Phase Lords continued to split further apart from each other. Regardless of whether she could only claim the heads of 2 or 3 lesser Phase Lords at the end, the fact that she was able to kill any of these younger native gods in an instant turned her battle partner into an ace mech that had to be avoided at all cost. With so many lesser Phase Lords cutting and running, the two approaching human fleets recognized their opportunity to make a mark and accelerated forward at an even faster pace than before. Given how much weaker the remaining organized alien forces had become, the Saint Commander decided to take advantage of the current situation. Instead of staying in the bridge of the tortuous scream, the Ace Command mech made her way out and quickly launched into space. This exposed the Minerva Mark II to the enemy forces, but the Saint Commander considered this to be inconsequential. The appearance of the Ace Command mech above the flagship of the Premier Fleet immediately boosted every friendly human's morale. Unlike the Phase Lords of the enemy, their own champions had demonstrated bravery. St. Dice continued her fight while being outnumbered on all sides. The Minerva Mark II, on the other hand, became a symbol of the indomitable spirit of the Larkinson clan. She also painted a giant target on her front. Ace Command mechs always remained high-priority targets on the battlefield, yet the Saint Commander believed she needed to set an example for both the humans and the aliens. It worked. The disparity between morale on both sides widened even further. The human soldiers received overwhelming proof that their champions were much braver and more fearless. On the other hand, the native alien soldiers felt even more demoralized due to the contrast between their champions and that of the enemy. Even though they belonged to very different species, many native alien races developed similar ideas and perspectives on bravery and honor. Right now, their own gods demonstrated behavior that would have gotten mortals executed if they tried to flee without authorization on the battlefield. Meanwhile, the human forces had brought just 2 of their false gods but already set positive examples that transcended borders and race. The consequences were subtle but not negligible. What was important was that there were many different consequences. Enemy soldiers reacted slower. Their leaders became less inspired. They all began to make more mistakes. All of these problems might not sound too serious, but when they began to add up, their efficiency and combat readiness had dropped by a significant margin. As for the Larkinsons and their allies, they performed better than usual. Not only were they overflowing with confidence, they were also eager to capitalize on the openings created by St. Dice. As the fleet slowly entered into more proper engagement range, the Saint Commander finally decided to properly deploy her command field. Everything changed as far as the human soldiers were concerned. Each of them felt the presence of Casella as if she was whispering in their ears, but deeper. Her presence was not overpowering or overbearing. Instead, she occupied an empty slot in the awareness of those she could reach with her command field. She had made sure to keep her command field gentle. If there were mech pilots and other soldiers who felt uncomfortable with another person watching over their shoulders all of the time, then they could easily opt to reject her domain field. Very few did so. Only civilians and the people who felt the need to hide the truth so badly ultimately chose to have nothing to do with Casella. Very few Larkinsons of the Premier Fleet made this choice. There were not too many civilians among them, and their trust in their own ace commander was nearly absolute. The people serving in the Blue Jay fleet were very different. It was natural for high-ranked officers such as Rear Admiral Gory Tenson or civilian mech designers like Jovi Armelon to politely decline to invite Casella into their heads. However, the Saint Commander's reputation was so high among the meshers, fleeters, and collies that plenty of them opened themselves up to her, though not without holding many parts about themselves back. Casella did not attempt to pry. These people placed their trust in her, expecting her to utilize their strength without violating any of their strict rules. In fact, each of the Red Three probably had a rule that should have prevented themselves from opening themselves up to an ace commander that did not belong on their side, but nobody had any desire to enforce this regulation. As Casella's command field began to elevate the strength of every machine, but particularly the mechs, many of the soldiers of the Blue Jay fleet got reminded why they chose to participate in this offensive operation against the native aliens. They were doing what was necessary. This was more than a mission to them. It was a calling. Defending red humanity against the alien menace was one of the noblest actions they could take. As the Saint Commander's presence grew more intimate, many of these soldiers suddenly learned that Casella Ingvar shared the same ideal. Larkinsons or otherwise, it matters not. Today we are red humans and comrades in arms. We fight for many different purposes, but one stands above all, and that is to fight for the continuation of our civilization in this dwarf galaxy. We fight so that our children and grandchildren will still have a friendly human territory to go home to and feel at peace. This is a future that each of you wish to come into fruition, so take heart and pay no attention to our differences. So long as you fall under my command, I promise that I shall leverage your strength to the best of my ability. While the ace commander did not add much substance to her words, she was able to convey her sincerity and belief in their common cause to everyone. The Larkinsons, but especially the soldiers of the Red Three, loved her even more for it. No matter how wary they may feel about opening themselves up to her command field, much of their hesitation melted away as they truly felt that they should not nitpick over their many differences. Arise, my knights, and take up my banner. Your faith in me shall be rewarded. I freely grant my strength to you. Use it to exact devastation on our foes. The mechs of the Blue Jay fleet opened fire first. Their resonance-empowered energy weapons packed a punch, and many of them were also unerringly accurate at longer ranges. The long-ranged energy beams did not rake across the orbital space station or the distant enemy battleships. Their firepower at this range was not good enough to seriously deplete any of the energy shields. No. Saint Commander Casella Larkinson instead imbued her knights with more than a fraction of her true resonance. She pushed on their mech pilots to accept her skill and judgment, but the combination between the two enabled the mechs armed with long-ranged armaments to accurately strike and take down enemy phase fighters. So many. Phase fighters have become a lot more ubiquitous compared to the previous ages. The gathered intelligence estimated that there were at least 13,000 of them in the star system. The estimates turned out to be accurate. So many phase fighters had begun to advance. Their alien pilots were not content with waiting until the human mechs got closer. The alien pilots did not expect their advance to go unanswered. The humans often tried to whittle down their numbers, but there was only so much their weapons could do from a distance. Normally, energy beams had a hard time trying to hit any of the strike craft, particularly when they adopted loose formations and allowed the pilot to fly forward in an unpredictable manner. Yet this time, the commandeered mech struck with the power of quasi-expert mechs and the accuracy of an actual expert mech. This potent combination resulted in a hit rate of over 30%, which was quite respectable under the circumstances. Phase fighter after phase fighter collapsed after getting struck several times in a row by unerringly accurate energy beams. This shouldn't be happening either. Each of the craft had been designed to fight against first-class humans, so their designs reflected this ambition. The Azure energy shields that these modern phase fighters relied upon were tuned to withstand dozens if not over 100 attacks launched by first-class multipurpose mechs. Yet what actually happened was the long-ranged attacks launched by a couple of hundred mechs only needed to land 3 to 6 hits to strip the energy shields from the phase fighters. As soon as they lost their protection, it only took a single accurate strike to cripple or destroy them outright. The native aliens, already unbalanced by the cowardice demonstrated by their native gods, scrambled to adapt. They put more effort into performing individual evasive maneuvers. While this caused the alien pilots who were bad at it to become particularly attractive firepower magnets, it at least enabled the more skilled phase fighter pilots to survive longer. Yet when the distance between the two sides started to close, the phase fighters became even more miserable. The commandeered mechs began to unleash even more weapons in their direction. On the side of the Premier Fleet, the Dracoloids and the Omega Threshers began to showcase their strength in different ways. The Dracoloids advanced forward with open aggression. The commandeered Dragon mechs might excel in short-ranged combat, but they were far from helpless while they were still attempting to close the distance to their enemies. As soon as the leading elements of the enemy phase fighters entered into medium range, the Dracoloids struck with a modest ranged weapon complement of 4 integrated Gauss cannons and 2 integrated plasma guns. Although the Dracoloid did not have that many weapon systems, each one definitely inflicted serious damage upon impact. Of course, since they all fired slower-than-light projectiles, their accuracy was normally difficult to maintain even at medium ranges. Yet when Casella put her superhuman marksmanship skills at the disposal of the Dracoloids and their Larkanen mech pilots, the Dragon Mechs found ways to raise their hit rates. The resonance-empowered Gauss rounds and plasma bolts took an even greater toll on the energy shields than the native aliens calculated. Then there were the Omega Threshers. The other combat-oriented first-class multi-purpose mech chosen by the Larkinson clan was this model. It had many different ranged weapon systems. The Omega Thresher boasted 6 integrated Omega laser cannons, and Casella instructed the machines to make sole use of this weapon system. The performance of the Omega Threshers at long range was already impressive due to their potent combination of signature weapon systems. The Omega lasers hit harder than conventional laser weapon systems. They also expended energy like nothing else, which meant that the Omega Thresher often found itself forced to leave its other weapon systems dormant just so the pilot could focus fully on hitting the formidable aliens with his most accurate weapon systems. Under the control of the Saint Commander, the Omega Threshers easily managed to down one phase fighter after another after landing only 4 attacks from the Omega laser cannons. The phase fighters continued to lose numbers like crazy. Only a short time had passed and already they had lost over 1,000 strike craft. Chapter 69, 97, 69, 97, Opening the Pressure Relief Valve. During the initial confrontation between mechs and phase fighters, the former definitely held an advantage. The commandeered mechs vastly overperformed compared to ordinary first-class multipurpose mechs. The true resonance amplification gave them enough reality-distorting power to remove the hardy and troublesome Azure energy barriers with disturbing ease. The skills and guidance provided by the multitasking Ace Commander massively increased the hit rates of all of the ranged armaments. The affected mech pilots could choose to accept or reject these offers, but the vast majority chose to bond themselves to the Saint Commander. They trusted in her. Again and again, the Omega Threshers continued to demonstrate their prowess in mid-range combat. The Omega laser cannons did the most work, but the Omega Thresher model also featured other ranged armaments. As the distances continued to grow smaller between the two sides, the Omega Threshers also opened fire with their phase disintegrator guns. Unusual energy projectiles struck one phase fighter after another. While the energy bolts did little else but disturb the performance of any phase fighter that received a direct hit, the damage was considerably greater when hitting a transphasic energy shield. The phase disintegrator guns had been designed specifically to wear out enemy energy shields faster than usual. The new and exotic weapons system definitely fulfilled this goal. In fact, they proved even more effective when the Omega Threshers got commandeered by the Saint Commander. When empowered by resonance, the performance of the phase disintegrator guns was absurdly high. If not for the fact that their muzzle velocities were a bit on the low side, they should have been more common. Even so, the Saint Commander was more than skilled enough to work around this limitation. The native aliens have lost over 2,000 phase fighters at this time. Their leaders are changing courses and strategies, but none of these measures are preventing our commandeered mechs from continuing to bombard them with accurate attacks. The enemy vanguard elements are deploying smoke screens in an attempt to deny us from targeting their strike craft. Their attempts are largely ineffective as the Saint Commander is able to find enough targets for her commandeered mechs to lay waste. Besides, the Dracoloids and other melee mechs have already begun to get close enough to engage the enemy strike craft in close range. The enemy warships are beginning to open fire on our warships. They are also launching missiles. Intercept the guided munitions. The warships on both sides have begun to bombard each other with long-ranged gun battery fire. The Premier Fleet and the Blue Jay Fleet immediately fell at a disadvantage in this regard. The native aliens had over 130 warships at their disposal, of which 16 consisted of capital ships. In the meantime, the only true battleship that the attackers could rely upon was the Tortuous Scream. The disparity in quantity and caliber of firepower immediately became apparent. The human warships performed better under the guidance of the Saint Commander, but she was no starship operator. It was also a lot more difficult for her to significantly transform the combat power of an entire vessel, so her positive influence on the Tortuous Scream and the warships of the Blue Jay Fleet remained limited. However, if there was one area in which the human vessels excelled at, it was tech and defense. The alien warships were all fairly modern but also came from mixed sources. The vessels built by the major alien races were lopsided in their improvements and technological advancements. The warships of the Red Cabal were not only made out of better materials, but they were also equipped with more advanced high technologies. Their biggest advantage was that they all benefited from shield link technology. With the help of their shield link transceivers, they could shuffle shield energy directly between each other. The human mechs also happened to possess their own shield link transceivers. This helped to reassure the mech pilots and warship crews as they confronted a vastly numerically superior foe. Despite being outnumbered several times to 1, the mechs and warships continued to rely on the power of their Ace Commander and the protection of shield link technology to remain strong. We have yet to suffer significant casualties, but the native aliens are continuing to lose phase fighters at a prodigious rate. It will not take long for the Dracoloids to get close enough. The only downside is that there are too many alien phase fighters on guard to intercept any melee mechs that seek to get close to the most dangerous planets. While the situation of the attacking forces remained optimistic for the time being, the native aliens could still regain the advantage as long as they persisted in the battle. The native aliens were not unfamiliar with the strengths and weaknesses of shield link technology. The forces of the Red Association and the Red Fleet utilized support link technology often enough for the aliens to devise their own countermeasures. The answer was quite simple. So long as they inflicted enough damage, they could drain the entire pool of energy used to sustain all of the energy shields at once. Once the protected mechs and warships received this treatment, every connected asset lost their energy shield protection at the same time. The native aliens cleverly targeted the largest, slowest, and most vulnerable human targets. That just so happened to be the Tortuous Scream, the Vulcan's Glory, and other large starships in the two fleets. Each of them received a torrent of abuse from the large number of enemy assets in the field. Even without the protection of their phased lords, the alien fleet still possessed the ability to overwhelm many human foes, particularly when they were on the defensive this time. The other advantage the native aliens possessed was their much greater willingness to resort to transphasic missiles. Since the native aliens had access to far greater reserves of phase water, it was not difficult for them to set a bit of it aside to create highly potent explosive warheads. Now, the enemy warships held nothing back as they launched their precious transphasic missiles and torpedoes at the human vessels. If they struck the Tortuous Scream all at once, the converted alien battleship's energy shields would probably receive so much pressure that they would collapse before the shield link transceiver could obtain additional support. We cannot let more than 70% of those missiles strike our ships. If they do, then the total energy shield pool might get drained ahead of time, causing us all to become exposed. We cannot let that happen. The Saint Commander found herself forced to divert precious firepower to shoot down the missiles in advance. Omega lasers at lower power settings fired at a higher pace than before. Each time, the resonance-empowered laser beams struck the warheads with just enough power to successfully neutralize a missile. Hundreds of these energy beams struck the fast and maneuverable missiles. Their hit rates reached a respectable level of 60%. The main reason why it did not get any higher was because Casella had to provide guidance to hundreds if not thousands of mechs at a time. It should normally be impossible for any single individual to micromanage so many commandeered mechs at once, but Casella was able to do it in defiance of reality. This was what she was good at. Casella did not intend to waste any of the mechs under her command. The first salvo of missiles detonated long before they rechecked Kozanug HTO threatened the hulls of the Premier Fleet and Blue Jay Fleet. However, that did not mean the native aliens gave up. They continued to fire repeated salvos of missiles. The enemy understood clearly that interpreting all of these warheads took a toll on the human forces. Enemy phase fighters began to gain more breathing room due to the decrease in enemy firepower. Yet that changed as soon as the Dracoloids finally managed to close the distance. The Larkinson mech pilots assigned to these aggressive machines had been biding their time. Now that they had come close enough, the Dracoloids immediately began to rely on their superior mobility to intercept the enemy phase fighters and savage them up close. Their space suppressors became fully active while their shield link arrays kept their Azure energy shields active even when they came under heavy fire. The well-trained alien phase fighter pilots relied on various different means to avoid getting caught by the human melee mechs. Their plan was not that complicated. They attempted to rely on their superior numbers to isolate and defeat the Dracoloid mechs in detail. Yet the Saint Commander was able to read their intentions and devised countermeasures. Her strategic acumen led her to employing the right solutions at the right times. Even as the enemy phase fighters attempted to scatter and move further apart from each other, the Dracoloids simply ignored the faster and more maneuverable enemy craft and moved straight to the enemy warships. These hulls were larger and far less maneuverable than alien phase fighters. There was no way they could outrun the Dracoloids. The enemy phase fighter pilots realized their mistakes and tried to regroup before trying to intercept the Larkinson melee mech units. Yet their pursuit made them easier and more predictable targets to the humans. The Dracoloids had the ability to flip around and fire a rapid salvo of plasma guns and Gauss cannons. Each of these weapons were powerful and happened to be easier to hit their targets at lower distances. Right now, these Dracoloids were shredding through many unprepared phase fighters. It was only after this stage that the Dracoloids could finally unleash their full power. They closed the distance and breathed fire into the Azure energy shield that protected the alien enemy from the ultimate freeze. The enemy's energy shields never lasted long. Not only had the space suppressors of the Dracoloid turned their effective strength into a fraction of their former glory, but the flamethrowers built into their dragon's mouth proved absurdly effective at overloading Azure energy shields as well. Phase fighter after phase fighter collapsed and burned before other enemy units decided to butt in and interrupt a solid Akasoin. The native aliens have lost over 3,500 phase fighters and counting. The surviving phase fighter pilots have become even more discouraged. They had yet to down a large number of mechs at this point. Even if the battle had taken a large toll on many of them, they could still fight and persist. This is so much fun. The glowing Dracoloids were able to fully unleash their true nature. The Larkinson mech pilots felt as if they had opened up a pressure relief valve. The steam had been building up inside their bodies ever since the first piloted the dragon mechs. It was only now that they spread glory with the help of dragon wings that they finally became in tune with their power and other aspects. Dragon mech after dragon mech continued to intercept phase fighters before breathing fire into their shielded and well-protected forms. While the Omega Threshers were able to play it safe by fighting at mid to longer ranges, the Dracoloids fully satisfied those who liked to get up close and personal. Usually speaking, the Dracoloids tended to run out of fuel rather quickly if they kept launching their fire breath attacks. However, the resonance amplification loaned by St. Casella gave the destructive flames an added kick, enabling the Dracoloids to crack open the defenses of their targets with brief sprays of fire. As the enemy phase fighter units continued to get disrupted by the invading humans, the battle between the warships was not so hopeless to the alien defenders. The human warships fought aggressively, but commandeering did not have much of an effect on them, so they were unable to withstand the superior numbers of the enemy warships. It was only because of the lack of trust and coordination between the alien fleets that they had not been able to make better use of their numbers advantage. Even so, if this continued, the human warships might be forced to retreat, which would put their mechs in a dangerous position. Chapter 69, 98, 69, 98, The Day of Insurrection. On the day the Battle of Screed Tanner 6F commenced, the Red Ocean continued to remain a hive of activity. Many other battles raged in and around the frequently changing frontlines of the Red War. Nobody kept track of the sheer amount of battles that the humans had fought against the native alien species. Most red humans made the assumption that the Red War had erupted on the day the Great Severing occurred. As for the fighting that occurred before this period, the humans at the time did not really consider their steady advance into alien-occupied territory to be a proper war. How could they? The humans were part of the most powerful civilization of the much greater Milky Way. If humankind truly wanted to, they could have dispatched thousands of first-class mech corps, dozens of god pilots, and tens of thousands of CFA battleships to sweep across the tiny dwarf galaxy within a decade. The fact that humans did not overwhelm the Red Ocean with overwhelming force was not a sign of weakness but strength. Humans had the luxury of wiping out the native aliens at any time, but they considered this option to be too costly and wasteful. Rather than engage in a loss-making business, the Big Two chose to let the space peasants do their work on their behalf. They may be weaker and much more constrained by the rules, but plenty of them would be happy to invest their wealth and lives to become pioneers. If everything went according to plan, the pioneers should have swallowed up the territories of the Red Ocean within 5 decades or less. Unfortunately, nothing went according to plan. The Great Severing had split the most dominant civilizations in 2 galaxies. Original humanity retained their dominance in the Milky Way galaxy, though it was currently undergoing massive internal upheaval. Red humanity had become the orphan sons of their original race and civilization. It had lost the protection of overwhelming military force, just as the Red Cabal intended when they transported their dwarf galaxy to a distant cosmic location. The fighting between the two sides was no longer as one-sided as before. The pioneers of red humanity only managed to make consistent gains due to receiving a constant influx of reinforcements through the greater Beyonder gates. Now that this flow had become completely cut off, red humanity not only lacked the reinforcements to sustain its offensive push, but even started to lose manpower and combat assets at a prodigious rate. To many people, this had become the real Red War. It was a conflict where red humanity had been put on the defensive from day one and never had a chance to go on the offensive. For many days, red humans fought and died in droves as they found themselves the weaker side of a war this time. It was a situation that many human supremacists never thought they would encounter in their lifetimes. Many of them indeed failed to adapt to the new reality. They either became ruined or lost their lives in the fighting. Not a day went by without the Galactic Net broadcasting news about star systems succumbing to the advancing aliens. The Red Tide offensive unleashed by the Red Cabal was highly successful. Ever since the red humans had lost their precious defensive bands, their territories no longer enjoyed uniform protection. The inherent division between red humans caused many problems. The major powers tried their best to address this issue by investing more authority into human high command, but this was a flawed solution. HHC could never address all of the grievances and disagreements of every human group. The existence of a central authority that tried to tell different forces where they should fight did not sit well with many people. Combined with many people's resentment towards the Red Association and the Red Fleet, people's regard for their hegemons had dropped below a dangerous point. The popularity of the Meshers and the Fleeters was dropping. Not only were they failing to win or at the very least limit the losses of the Red War, they continued to lord over everyone else as if they were still unquestionably in charge of all humans. This grated on many people, but particularly the Terrans and the Rabarthans. From their perspective, HHC was not so much a platform to coordinate their defenses, but a tool used to control the space peasants and exploit them in order to make the RA and RF richer to the detriment of the masses. More and more people became convinced that the old rules no longer worked anymore. The start of the Age of Dawn changed everything. Now that many people increasingly smelled weakness from the Meshers and the Fleeters, the space peasants gradually realized that their overlords were growing weaker. This caused the downtrodden and the suppressed to have ideas. After many months and years of secretive preparations, the conspirators finally received a signal. The time had finally come. While no forces began to mobilize on a wider scale, several major human powers abruptly initiated official live broadcasts at the same time. Each of them directly addressed their own populations but also intended to pass on their message to others, most notably the Meshers and the Fleeters. On the side of the Terran Alliance, an honored star designer appeared in view. The Armsforger himself had chosen to address the Terrans and other humans. As a star designer that was famous for combining both high technology with traditional smithing techniques, the Armsforger had long been known for crafting the most exquisite melee weapons. Many god mechs, particularly those that excelled in melee combat, benefited from his unbreakable Armsforger weapons. Now, this muscular and fit star designer had chosen to disclose a daring and risky plan that directly affected the lives of every Terran in the Red Ocean. During this historic broadcast, the Armsforger chose to wear a multi-layered green garment that blended formality, refinement, and transcendence in a single elegant presentation. My fellow Terrans and Red Humans, today I have an announcement to make. The leaders of the Terran Alliance along with other like-minded partners have been preparing to save our people by any means necessary. We have determined that the best way to do so is to expose the falsehood of unity and recognize it for the tyranny that has always constrained our potential. Yes, I dare to state the truth. Since the start of the Age of Mechs, our Terran people have been stripped of our rights and suffered one humiliation after another. In their greed to conquer our civilization, the Big Two has stolen our warships and prohibited us from fielding them ever again. They have also imposed a set of rules and instituted a technological blockade. Under the reign of the Meshers and the Fleeters, we can never be allowed to field weapons that can ever threaten their rule. Do you recognize how absurd it is for us to behave as a subjugated group in a time where the native aliens are the greater threat to our common civilization? Many of us have filed constant petitions and requests to repeal the rules that tie our hands behind our backs. Yet the Red Association and the Red Fleet refuse to take them seriously despite the fact that we are losing more men and mechs than the Meshers and the Fleeters. Many viewers grew angry and upset at the Meshers and the Fleeters. It was pretty easy to turn the Terrans against their current overlords. The prohibition on the use of shield link technology is the most egregious restriction that they have imposed on us. While their own mechs and warships are able to collectivize their Azure energy shields, thereby enabling all of their units to last far longer in battle, we are still not permitted to use the same technology. The Armsforger assumed a more grave demeanor. What does this tell you? To us, it signifies the fact that the Red Association and the Red Fleet values their own greed and lust for power over the defense of our united civilization. They have helped to establish human high command only to deny its suggestions to liberate us from their confining and outdated restrictions. They still guard against a return to the age of conquest, thereby completely forgetting how much we thrived during this golden age of humanity. The Armsforger actually looked angry this time. Their continued refusal to return our right to field our own warships and use every advanced tech that is already known to our civilization does not benefit our race. It merely benefits the tyrants that fear losing power over the supposed space peasants. My fellow Terrans, do not mistake this fact. We all enjoy the status as galactic citizens, but as far as the Meshers and Fleeters, we are still the same barbaric primitives that they imagined us to be since the start of the Age of Mechs. We are not children that need coddling. Neither do we accept the argument that it is better to keep dangerous tech and weapons out of our hands for fear of harming ourselves. Continuing to maintain this stance serves no other benefit than to maintain the same excuse that has led us to accept the false authority of the Meshers and Fleeters for several centuries. No more. We can no longer tolerate the lies of the RA and the RF, especially when doing so will continue to deprive us from the powerful tech that we need to protect our borders and keep our fellow Terrans safe. A symbol began to appear on the Armsforger's back. It was a flag that depicted a globe that displayed the continents of old Earth. Due to these reasons and more, every Terran leader have agreed that we must make a bold statement. It is my pleasure to announce that from this day onwards, the Terran Alliance will unilaterally secede from the tyrannical hegemony that is led by the Red Association and the Red Fleet. We are not requesting them to hand over the rights and sovereignty that rightfully belongs to the Terran people. We will take it back ourselves. The background changed. It depicted projections of brand new warships flying under the Terran flag. Such a sight would have attracted the heaviest degree of punishment from the Red Two in the past. It also showed mechs that managed to withstand concentrated firepower due to carrying a working shield link transceiver. This was a naked breach of the Red Two's duopoly on shield link technology. The Armsforger was very much correct that the only reason this restriction existed was to ensure the Meshers and the Fleeters maintained technological superiority over the space peasants. Soon enough, a map of human-occupied space appeared. By taking back our sovereignty, many contracts, treaties, and laws are no longer appropriate anymore. The territories of the Terran Alliance will no longer answer to any laws imposed by the Red Two that we have not explicitly chosen to retain by our own free will. Our legal departments have already revised many of them to fit the new era where the Terrans are able to stand proud for regaining our freedom. Let there be no confusion over our stance. We do not look kindly to the RA and the RF for subjugating us for so many years, but this is not the time to settle our grudges. For as long as the native aliens remain strong, we shall work and fight together as Red Humans. However, if we must fight and cooperate with the Red Three, we will do so as their equals, not their vassals. Under no circumstance shall we obey their orders or supply them with our goods and materials without engaging in honest trade. If the Meshers and Fleeters truly prioritize the continued survival of red humanity, then they should make the sensible decision and allow us to retain our sovereignty. If they are not willing to do so, then they must know that we do not stand alone. The Rebarthan Pact and numerous other first-rate states are following suit. The map changed to reflect a greater split unfolding. Not only had the Terran Alliance and the Rebarthan Pact become sovereign star empires again, there were even a handful of first-rate states in the Red Ocean Union that followed suit. The Armsforger formed a vicious grin. In the eventuality that the Meshers and the Fleeters refuse to accept the inevitable, we are not above turning our arms against our fellow red humans. We shall never be slaves again. No matter what sort of advanced tech the Meshers and the Fleeters intend to use, we have more powerful tech at our disposal. With the assistance of hidden but also rising human power, we shall persuade the RA and the RF to accept our terms, not by force, but by giving them a farewell present. Otherwise, they shall not have any opportunity to receive the technological secrets they desire the most. That was a bold statement to make. It sounded rather implausible for the Terrans and other conspirators to buy the Red 2 off with technology transfers, not when they had already accumulated so much cutting-edge tech. Chapter 69, 99, 69, 99, The Day of Return. Have the Terrans and the Rebarthans gone mad? Their insurrection threatens to break apart our unified human civilization. How will we be able to maintain a united front against the native aliens? Their stupid desire to regain their sovereignty will divide us during a time where we can least afford division. Damn, those first-raters are engaging in stupidity again. Instead of fighting the aliens who are trying to kill all of us without causing any drama, the Terrans and the Rebarthans have decided to pick a fight with the RA and the RF at the worst possible moment. Our third-rate state will get overrun by the native aliens by the time these selfish and entitled people have finally finished their big spat. Why can't they resolve their grudges after they have taken care of our alien enemies? My business is ruined. The Red War has been bad for my company in general, but I was still relying on trade between the colonial alliances to maintain a barely positive balance sheet. If commerce between the different human states is disrupted by the introduction of trade barriers, this will make everything more expensive. The news spread across human space within minutes. Many people celebrated the secession of the Terran Alliance, the Rebarthan Pact, the Eternal Vulcan Empire, as well as a handful of other ambitious first-rate states. People were already calling it the Red Split. Nobody knew what was in store in the future. What exactly did the Terrans and the Rebarthans mean by regaining their sovereignty? Did this mean that they were thinking about engaging in diplomacy with the aliens? Which contracts and agreements would remain valid and which ones got dissolved due to the occurrence of an unforeseen event? Everyone became confused. It would take many days in order for the people across human-occupied space to adapt to the new changes. The Red Split generated a lot of uncertainty in a time where red humanity was under heavy assault. Many people had already begun to castigate the Terrans and the Rebarthans for putting their selfish desires for independence over the more fundamental need to save their race. However, out of all of the groups of people who felt most uncertain about the attempted secessions, the Meshers and the Fleeters were greatly appalled by what had happened. They had long feared that the Terrans and the Rebarthans would attempt to take advantage of the current crisis and slip out of their grasp. The fact that they managed to prepare such a grand conspiracy and not leave behind any solid enough clues in advance was a massive intelligence failure on the part of the RA and the RF. At this point, the Red Association and the Red Fleet had yet to make their stance clear. So did the Red Collective for this matter? The Meshers and the Fleeters had genuinely been caught flat-footed. Most of their attention had been squarely focused on the native aliens, which could explain why they had failed to sniff out this plot in advance. It is impossible for us to bring the insurrectionists into compliance through the application of violence. Commodore Corey McArmon of the 124th Monitoring Squadron spoke in a measured and composed voice. The first-rate colonial superstates are correct in their claims. Attempting to divert our fleets from the front lines in order to wage war against the insurrectionist states will lead to unacceptable losses. The Terrans and the Rebarthans are too proud to surrender without resisting. Their foolish pride and nationalism will see them fight to the death for every star system we take. When humans started to fight against each other, the native aliens benefited immensely. It would not be a surprise if the native aliens bided their time and continued to build up their invasion forces while different human factions squabbled against each other. Not only would attacking fellow humans during this critical time cause the morale of the Meshers and the Fleeters to plunge, but it would also tank their legitimacy across human-occupied space. The Big Two had always been keen on maintaining a strong amount of legitimacy over the centuries. It was the single most important quality that cemented their right to rule over every human. For a long time, the masses genuinely believed that it was best for the Meshers and Fleeters to remain in charge of everyone. This belief had become so strongly rooted in the Milky Way that there had never been any real chance to question its validity. Until now. For the Terran Alliance and the Rebarthan Pact to repudiate the Red Two and their hegemony so vehemently indicated that there was a larger plot afoot. When the projected RF officer issued a counterargument, Commodore McArmon grimaced. I refuse to believe we are out of options. We can still rely on our soft power and other gentle means of bringing the insurrectionists into compliance. We can impose trade embargoes. There are many goods that they rely upon to keep their planets and settlements prosperous and functional. By interrupting this form of commerce, we can make Terran and Rebarthan citizens dissatisfied without generating too much hostility. If economic pressure is not enough, then we can apply military pressure as well. Both colonial alliances rely extensively on our military support. Compared to the Rebarthan Pact, the Terran Alliance is especially vulnerable due to being protected by only a single god pilot. Let us see how long the Terrans will maintain their stubborn stance when they are truly left to fend for themselves. The good Commodore was not the only person to make this proposal. Many meshers and fleeters elsewhere thought about relying on pressure tactics to make the insurrectionists reconsider. However, there was little chance that this would happen. The Terrans would most definitely pay for their stubbornness, but so would everyone else. If the Terran Alliance ever collapsed, the rest of Red humanity would probably follow suit. The Red Ocean Union was not large enough to maintain enough population and industrial capacity to maintain the war effort. In short, the meshers and the fleeters could not afford to endure the consequences of seeing the insurrectionists fall. Since this was the case, the Red Two had to be extremely careful about which tactics they chose in order to encourage the insurrectionists to reverse their foolish decisions. Perhaps it was no longer possible to demand a complete return to the old status quo, but they may be able to negotiate a more acceptable alternative in this day and age. While the Terrans and the Rebarthans were willing to fight hard to regain their sovereignty, they probably made a miscalculation. The Red Association would never give up its jurisdiction on mechs. The same went for the Red Fleet in relation to warships. There were many meshers and fleeters willing to resort to the worst options and go to war in order to preserve their dominion over these aspects. Perhaps the threat of that may be enough to get the Terrans and the Rebarthans to agree to reason. Whatever the case, Commodore Corey McArmon doubted that his voice would make a difference in this great debate. He was just a relatively unimportant RF squadron commander. Instead of being stationed on a fleet that was directly involved in the Red War, he had the unenviable privilege of being stationed as far from the front lines as possible. The second Sphinx, the light cruiser that he was stationed on, and a handful of other warships and science vessels had been assigned to reside close to the location of Bridgehead 1. To be more precise, they continued to linger at the edge of the greater space-time bubble that enveloped the central star node for a long period of time. The good news was that if the data was accurate, Commodore McArmon might not need to stay much longer. Is the greater space-time bubble ending today? The speed in which it is unraveling has fluctuated multiple times. A senior CFA astrophysicist responded to the Commodore. We are 85% confident that this is not a natural unwinding process. The humans inside the bubble have been actively manipulating their own space-time cage, though we do not have enough indications to learn what they have done or whether they are successful. Commodore McArmon looked wary. What is your personal opinion? The scientist paused for a few seconds. I fear that the humans that are about to be reunited to the rest of the cosmos may not be the ones you expect to welcome back. Those words stuck to the Commodore's mind when the greater space-time bubble finally collapsed. As soon as the photons that had previously been trapped in the spatial anomaly finally receive a chance to escape into the rest of the Red Ocean, the sensor systems of the second Sphinx and other starships immediately became overwhelmed by foreign sights. Did we park next to the right star system? This is not Bridgehead 1. There is much more orbital infrastructure present around the planets. The surfaces of those globes have also become much different. How many warships and carriers are there in the star system? There are tens of thousands more hulls than we expected to see. Wait, these ship classes are completely unfamiliar. They possess recognizable human design styles, but their tech and materials are completely new and unfamiliar. The Dyson spheres surrounding the 12 stars of Bridgehead 1 have become much more developed. We have detected the presence of mass siphoning devices that extract particles from the stars and convert them into solid matter. Those planets. Of the over 100 planets that originally orbited this megastar system, over half of them have transformed into war fortresses that are armed to the teeth. Wait, why are they embedded with gigantic thrusters? Can they move under their own power? The sensor officers and analysts practically went crazy as they witnessed the arrival of a completely different version of Bridgehead 1 than they expected. Shouldn't the greater space-time bubble cause the passage of time inside of it to slow down by a factor of 100? Even as the bewildered meshers, fleeters, and collies tried to make sense of what they observed, a familiar yet unfamiliar warship instantly seemed to teleport a few dozen kilometers away from the 124th Monitoring Squadron. Alarms rang throughout the second Sphinx as the ships all detected that they were at the mercy of the dreadnought that had appeared into the naval equivalent of knife fighting range. Is that the Dominion of Man? Yes, but she has received enormous upgrades from top to bottom. Commodore, we are receiving a direct hail from the capital ship that claims to be the Dominion of Man. Commodore Corey McArmon had a strong suspicion that this upcoming conversation would no doubt become part of a historic record. Accept the hail. Let us talk with whoever has chosen to greet us. Be mindful to stay on your best behavior. We cannot afford to make decisions based on false assumptions. Remain on your best behavior. When he finally accepted the hail, a projected screen depicted what appeared to be a metallic throne room. The entire chamber was empty save for a massive throne and reliefs that told a grand story in the form of carved images. When the view zoomed in, a certain woman sat on the throne. Claire Hamza, otherwise known as the Polymath, sat on the throne like a sovereign overlooking her domain. She had once again dressed herself in regal and opulent garments. She had completely eschewed the plainer and more minimalistic lab coat and suit that she typically wore in her guise as a star designer. Commodore Corey McArmon. The star designer spoke. I am pleased to observe that my star system has merged back into the red ocean not too late. We have remained physically disconnected for too long. The RF Commodore was not surprised that she knew his name. Bridgehead once stored extensive records on everything. His suspicion on what may have happened grew stronger. He was certain that he was addressing the mastermind behind all of the unexpected changes. Your Excellency, if I may ask, how long has Bridgehead 1 remained in isolation from the perspective of the humans inside the former greater space-time bubble? The Polymath formed a very deliberate smirk. Through my successful experimentation and manipulation of what you call the greater space-time bubble, my subjects and I have experienced a total of 53 years. As your sensors can no doubt observe, we have experienced many changes during this lengthy period. If I may ask, Your Excellency. Your Imperial Majesty. She pointedly corrected him. This is how you should address me. During the time of isolation, I have gained supreme power over Bridgehead 1. It is now the heart and body of the cybernetic empire. I have crowned myself as its empress, and I expect the Red 3 to recognize my claim. Commodore McArmon became speechless, and so did the other members of the Red 3. What the star designer said was so outrageous that he did not dare to offer a concrete response. This was way out of his pay grade. The Polymath knew that she shouldn't expect any real answer to come out of the squadron commander. Please convey my words to your superiors. They should be in contact with us soon. Do remind them not to keep up waiting for long. Tell them that my cybernetic empire is already recognized by the Terran Alliance and the Rebarthan Pact and vice versa. Just because my star system has remained physically isolated does not mean it is impossible for us to communicate across barriers. This was a critical piece of information. Somehow, the cybernetic empire had already contacted the Terrans and the Rebarthans before the greater space-time bubble had completely unraveled. This is likely explained by the Terran Alliance and the Rebarthan Pact chose to declare their secession from United Human Civilization on this particular day. Chapter 7000 The Day of Pestilence. Check contest in comments. If the secession of multiple first-rate colonial states and superstates had already caused a lot of controversy, the return of a very different version of Bridgehead 1 generated even more shock. No one expected for the Polymath to exploit the properties of the greater space-time bubble and turn it into a massive advantage for herself and the red humans trapped inside. For a little over 53 subjective years, the Bridgehead 1 residents experienced 2 generations of peace, stability, growth, and development. They all gained one of the most valuable resources that the rest of red humanity lacked, and that was time. The Red 3 engaged in intensive forms of data analysis in order to verify whether the claims made by the Polymath or the cybernetic empress were accurate. The Polymath never spoke any falsehoods. It was impossible for so much buildup and changes to take place in a matter of days, months, or a handful of years. It would have been helpful to regain contact with the people who were originally stuck in Bridgehead 1 from the very beginning, but the cybernetic empire maintained a travel blockade as well as a communications blockade. In fact, many analysts doubted whether the galactic net still existed in Bridgehead 1. The communications infrastructure would have been completely redundant during the 5-decade period of isolation. Perhaps the sight of a much more developed version of Bridgehead 1 may have been a very elaborate illusion. It was well within the power of the Polymath to weave a star system-wide deception. However, there were too many indications that the sight was completely accurate. After the Polymath had made her initial greeting, the Meshers and the Fleeters scrambled to form a unified response. Bridgehead 1 was the original beachhead established by the Mech Trade Association and the Common Fleet Alliance. The two superorganizations had invested enormous amounts of resources into turning it into an enormous stronghold. They even went as far as using some of their most powerful means to transport additional stars and planets in an ever-expanding star system. This not only opened up a lot more room for laboratories, factories, and assembly facilities, but also attracted an enormous amount of highly skilled and knowledgeable scientists and engineers. The Jernstahl Central Star Node was much less impressive in comparison. It was like comparing a tiger to a house cat. The sapphire of the Red Ocean most definitely happened to be the smaller cat. In order to verify whether the residents of Bridgehead 1 had truly experienced so many years in total isolation from the rest of Red humanity, the Red 3 ultimately insisted on contacting their old officers and acquaintances directly. Short of crossing into Bridgehead 1 and observe all of the changes up close, this was the next best solution to quickly verify the Polymath's shocking claims. Many relatives, colleagues, and business partners thus received permission to communicate with people that had all grown a half-century older. To many of these people, the differences had become incredibly stark. My son, you have grown older than me now. I never expected to see you again in this state. You know all of the secrets that I have shared with my best friend. You are either him or a highly accurate clone or bot that has stolen his guise and memories. Lieutenant Stanton, I would like to remind you that you have not only made an oath to serve the Red Fleet. We have yet to discharge you from our service nor given you permission to resign. We seriously urge you to reconsider your status and citizenship. People also began to ask the cybers about how Bridgehead 1 managed to become so densely populated. How come Bridgehead 1 has grown so large? How many children did you cybers produce? Did the polymath force every family to raise a dozen children per generation? Most of us are not natural-born humans. They are actually batch humans. The polymath has worked on the tech and has set up factories that are able to output a large amount of batch humans every quarter. We could have hosted more of them, but we do not have enough farms and other facilities to enable them to live with dignity. Now that we have finally reconnected to the main universe, we can finally rely on trade to expand our population. Through contacting the people that had completely forgotten their original allegiances and integrated into the cybernetic empire, the rest of Red humanity learned that all of the claims turned out to be true. The polymath, who previously had been exiled to Bridgehead 1 due to the transgressions she had made during the first conference of the survivalist faction, ultimately managed to secure a throne for herself. Nobody could have taken over Bridgehead 1 and ruled the expanded star system with so little dissent. The original loyalties of the stranded Red humans did not matter. The polymath had taken the soft approach as she knew that people's resistance would definitely fade after a generation of continued isolation. By that time, even the most stubborn of people ran out of patience. No matter whether they were originally Meshers, Fleeters, Terrans, Rebarthans, or citizens of other colonial states, they all became subjects of the cybernetic empire in the end. The cybers, as they had taken to calling themselves, all showed the reason where their empire derived its name. Those cybernetic implants. It is challenging to succeed in the cybernetic empire. A former Mesher now turned cyber told his friend in the Red Association. Our entire population has embraced cybernetics as a valid means to improve our work performance. Many of the current lines were originally designed by the polymath. They have undergone many iterations of improvements since then that have strengthened their ability to dispatch one type of foe much more effectively than the others. Why? We do not have access to the benefits of systematic cultivation. The cyber shrugged his shoulders. You see, when Bridgehead 1 entered the time of isolation, the barrier that kept us trapped and enabled us to gain additional years could not alter the amount of exotic radiation that passed through our star system. I think I understand. Time may have sped up inside the space-time bubble, but the amount of energy radiation passing through your star system remains constant. What actually happens is that your local exposure to exotic radiation has shrunk until it is barely noticeable. The only way you cybers could keep up is by resorting to implants. This had a very large impact on the development of Bridgehead 1. It explained why a lot of long-ranged sensor readings detected buildup of advanced but recognizable human tech. Much of it carried the style and personal touches of the polymath. If she did not include any significant amounts of hyper-technology to their designs, then that was because she was not effectively able to make it useful and not because she did not like its working principles. The rest of Red humanity quickly figured out why the polymath had been unable to invent revolutionary applications of hypermaterials. They lost almost all of their energy needs while residing in Bridgehead 1. How effective was all of this new and advanced tech? Nobody could say for certain. They could perform a lot of analyses from afar, but without seeing the new high-tech mechs and starships in action, everything remained theoretical. At least the cybers remained deficient in terms of hyper-technology, e-technology, and most importantly superdimensional technology. The interviews also revealed that the cybers did not produce any new high-ranking mech pilots. During the entire time of isolation, not a single cyber mech pilot had advanced to the rank of expert pilot, ace pilot, or god pilot. This gave the Red Association and the Red Fleet just enough assurances in their ability to defend against any megalomaniacal takeover attempts by the so-called cybernetic empire. However, it was clear that the cybernetic empress did not intend to surrender Bridgehead 1 to its rightful owners nor remain neutral in the disputes between different human powers. The polymath and her incredibly militarized one-system empire had become incredibly powerful wild cards. The Red Association and the survivalist faction urgently sought to bring the rogue star designer back into the fold, but none of their communication requests got through. By remaining silent and unresponsive, the cybernetic empress sent a very clear message. Everyone understood that the polymath sought to establish herself as an independent power. With a massive army, the dominion of man, and possibly a god pilot at her disposal, she definitely possessed the strength to defend her small but incredibly developed domain. In fact, the polymath could even take advantage of everyone else's preoccupation with the Red War to annex the neighboring territories. Not that many ordinary people cared about the threat posed by the returnees. No matter how much the polymath and the tens of billions of cybers under her command tried to establish their independence, they still clung to their human identities. So long as that was the case, they could never be at peace with the native aliens. People began to look at the bright side of this development. Would the cybernetic empress dispatch millions of mechs and thousands of warships to the faltering frontlines? Would she send one of her impressive war planets that evidently possessed the ability to engage in interstellar travel with the help of enormous warp drives? Or would she be willing to share a modest but incredibly valuable knowledge repository that contained 53 years' worth of constant technological progress and evolution? Any of these actions could not only introduce a lot of hope to Red humanity but also earn the star designer turned empress a lot of goodwill among the common folk. The fact that the Polymath already recognized the sovereignty of the Terran Alliance and the Rebarthan Pact served as a telling portent of what was to come. Just as Red humanity continued to become more and more engrossed by the secession and the appearance of the cybernetic empire, a third explosive piece of news spread across the galactic net on the very same day. Unlike the previous two occurrences, this one was unambiguously negative. A total of 14 star systems located in the territories of the Rebarthan Pact have fallen in record time. 21 more star systems have detected the arrival of enormous swarms of hostile organic life forms, each of which are hostile towards the local red humans. The alien pests are not so much attacking our worlds as they are devouring it like interstellar locusts. Are those Vorobugs? There are so many of them. Their variations have also grown more numerous. There are far more than the basic 3 forms of juvenile, adult, and elder Vorobugs visible in the footage. There is a high likelihood that the Vorobug race has become subjected to external stimulation that has caused these previously wild and feral aliens to undergo rapid development. Our intelligence-gathering operations in alien space indicate that we are far from the only victims of the Vorobugs. These aliens are hardly paying any attention to us. They have commenced an assault on over 1,000 star systems occupied by the native aliens. Each of them are woefully unprepared to repel a surprise attack of the scale and intensity. Without the protection of enough phase fighters and warships, the evolved Vorobugs are expected to conquer entire alien territories and provinces by the end of this week. This is a disaster. No. This is an opportunity. Even if these Vorobugs are not intelligent enough to understand the concept of diplomacy, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. We must do everything in our power to direct the attention of these insects away from human-occupied space. The more we are able to divert them to alien space, the more the Red Cabal is forced to pull back fleets from the Red War and dispatch them to the front lines of the new war against the Vorobugs. Everything is about to change. I cannot keep track of the variables anymore. Too many events are happening on the same day. This is driving me crazy. In the end, with the confluence of 3 massive events, the 102th day of the 4th year of the Age of Mechs came to be known by 3 different names. The Day of Insurrection. The Day of Return. The Day of Pestilence. Chapter 7001 Gradual Takeover. Too much had happened in one day. At first, multiple powerful first-rate states declared their intention to secede from the unified human civilization framework that had originally been set up by the Mech Trade Association and the Common Fleet Alliance. During the time of the Great Severing, most people never questioned the assumption that the Meshers and Fleeters would remain in charge of the humans that could no longer return to their home galaxy. Their circumstances drastically changed, but inertia and familiarity caused many humans to accept the reign of their familiar overlords. Even when the Red Association and the Red Fleet started to take on their own identity and begin to make adaptations that their parent organizations would never consider, they still represented the old status quo. No more. The decision of so many major players seceding from unified humanity had irrevocably damaged the authority and reputation of the Red too. It became clear quite soon that unless the Red Association or the Red Fleet was willing to employ overwhelming force to violently bring the Terrans and the Rebarthans back into the fold, it was impossible to turn back the clock. The possibility still existed so long as the Meshers and Fleeters were willing to redirect a handful of their formidable god pilots and dreadnoughts. However, the very notion of pulling them away from the front lines just to unleash their awesome killing power against fellow Red humans was unconscionable. Not only would the Red 2's remaining support from the population evaporate at record speed, but the god pilots and dreadnought crew involved may even go as far as to mutiny against their own superorganizations. Even so, there were still plenty of hardliners within the RA and the RF that still insisted on bringing the first-rate colonial states back under their jurisdiction through any means necessary. If violent means could not be employed, then what about non-violent ones? As long as they remained discreet enough, they could employ many dirty tricks that would be difficult to trace back to their agents. Yet the other events that happened on the same day quickly dispelled the hopes of the Meshers and the Fleeters. The news and subsequent reports about the return of Bridgehead 1 generated a huge amount of controversy and alarm. The good news was that the largest, most developed and most powerful central star node had become accessible again. The greater space-time bubble erected through the efforts of 6 ancient phase whales had disappeared for good. Multiple science vessels examined the periphery of the enormous star system and discovered that the local space had completely turned to normal again. None of the spatial barriers had lingered, and the passage of time inside the Bridgehead 1 had become fully synced to how time passed by in the rest of the universe. People could never be too careful about this. Yet after what the Meshers and the Fleeters learned about how the Polymath selfishly and ruthlessly took advantage of the botched attempt of the Red Cabal to eliminate the de facto capital star system of Red humanity. If she wanted to, the Polymath could have used her formidable intellect and amazing wonder machines to unravel the greater space-time bubble with minimal risk and complications. Yet she did not do so. She violated the secret terms of her exile and broke her promise to never seek a position of power in a governing organization or similar. The brilliant part about her takeover plan was that she had done so gradually. Having learned from her first botched attempt, the Polymath did not attempt to take over Bridgehead 1 in a single attempt. That would have generated a lot of chaos and opposition. There were very real chances that the dissidents would take up arms and unleash weapons in the most densely populated planets of the central star node. The damage and loss of life would have been catastrophic. Instead, the polymath purposefully kept the status quo in place just so that she could undermine it piece by piece on a gradual basis. At the same time, she used the additional time afforded to her to burnish her reputation, make her case to the masses, and win over one troublesome faction of loyalists after another. It was impossible for the polymath to knock over these barriers in a single day or month, but what about a year? What about a decade? Time could wear away almost any form of resistance. Only high-ranking mech pilots remained stubborn to the end, but they were the exception rather than the rule. The polymath did not encounter many issues with transferring them to their own preserve where they could train, meditate, and generally stay out of the way. It helped a lot that she personally offered to design brand new mechs tailored to each individual champion. After she essentially bribed the most stubborn mech pilots to not interfere with her business, the polymath was free to convert the remaining population at her leisure. It was not as easy as it sounded. Bridgehead 1 was absolutely massive. The Big Two deliberately built it up as the foremost anchor point of humanity's presence in the dwarf galaxy. The meshers and fleeters almost spared no expense by pulling over so many stars and planets. It was absolutely mind-boggling that they managed to put so many stars together, tweak their orbits so that they would not crash into each other, and build multiple Dyson spheres around them to capture their energies and prevent their combined electromagnetic radiation output from transforming all 100 planets into radioactive hells. Despite the fact that Bridgehead 1 completed such a massive transformation, its population had also ballooned. Many meshers and fleeters who emigrated to the Red Ocean preferred to work in this star system. Bridgehead 1 was one of the locations that benefited the most directly from the prosperity generated by the trade facilitated by the Greater Beyonder Gates. Combined with the abundance of top-tier laboratories, workshops, factories, and other facilities, there were only a handful of star systems in the Milky Way that could exceed Bridgehead 1's splendor. This was also one of the reasons why its temporary loss represented a substantial drop to the rest of Red humanity's war-making potential. Even if other star systems such as the Jernstall Central Star Node could take over some of Bridgehead 1's functions, it just was not the same. What Red humanity expected to receive was the original version of Bridgehead 1. What they got instead was a completely new one-system star nation-state. Over a span of 15 years, the polymath essentially took over all of the institutions that governed the many different aspects of Bridgehead 1. At the start, she successfully persuaded the majority of the population to agree to her proposal to extend the time they remained stuck in the greater space-time bubble. This was the most vulnerable part of her plan. If the masses strongly disagreed with remaining in isolation, then she could not execute the rest of her plan. Fortunately, enough people became convinced by the necessity of spending several decades in a time-accelerated pocket of space in order to reverse the losing trend of the Red War. It helped that many of the residents of Bridgehead 1 were already familiar with EdNet training. It was easy for them to make the comparison and expect similar outcomes, only this time their efforts would be much more tangible. Once the polymath bought herself a lot of time, there was little chance for the population to resist her case. She was a star designer, the single most intelligent human in 2 galaxies. Trying to usurp leadership from billions of mortals was like stealing candies from a huge amount of babies. Perhaps the amount of babies was a bit excessive this time. That did not change the fact that none of them possessed the strength to resist a star designer's machinations. Even the members of the Red Fleet had fallen under her sway. The fact that the Dominion of Man had become the flagship of her enormous armada represented a gigantic loss to the Red Fleet. Fleet Admiral Stanley Argyle and Fleet Admiral Amelie Jameson must have gone completely crazy once they learned that the polymath stole their precious trump card and godship. There was just one other mystery that weighed heavily on many people's minds. The Dominion of Man is not the only top-level asset stationed in Bridgehead 1 at the time. A mech designer of the RA said, "What happened to the first flame? According to the glut of information that is being disgorged into the galactic net, His Holiness has not made an appearance in decades." An administrator who also worked for the Red Association began to grimace. According to the cybernetic empress herself, the first flame played a deciding role in the defense of Bridgehead 1 during the initial deep strike operation launched by the ancient phase whales. After the polymath had made her intentions to turn Bridgehead 1 into an enormous time capsule for ostensibly noble reasons, the first flame agreed with her and chose to make his own preparations to save Red humanity. He is not a star designer, so he cannot introduce new tech or govern the population as effectively as the polymath. He can only allocate his time into enhancing his personal strength. The RA mech designer looked skeptical. That must be challenging. He is a god pilot who is confined to a single peaceful star system. There is not enough external pressure that can make him excited and give him an actual purpose. What has His Holiness been doing in the decades that he remained stuck in Bridgehead 1? The polymath claims that the first flame has chosen to undergo a long period of closed cultivation. He did so by transforming his god mech into phoenix form before diving through one of the gaps of a Dyson sphere in order to hibernate inside one of Bridgehead 1's 12 stars. What an outrageous claim. Any other mech pilot would have committed suicide if they attempted to dive past the corona and into the convection zone and beyond. Perhaps god mechs were much more resistant towards the massive amounts of heat being thrown about in a star, but even they should not be able to last on an indefinite basis. It was different for the Phoenix. The first flame was a god pilot who wielded the power of flame at a godlike level. The Phoenix was probably the most heat-resistant mech that humans had ever made. As long as the two combined their advantages, it became a lot more plausible for them to be able to survive for many years while hibernating inside a star. Whether the first flame was currently swimming in the upper layers or slept inside the massive core of the star, the amount of energy he had been absorbing in the last 50 or so years must be astronomical. This was probably the best possible use of his time. The Meshers could not conceive of a better alternative. Sure, the first flame could have remained active and either supported the polymath's political machinations or stood against them, but what was the point? Even if the first flame was not a member of the survivalist faction, even he agreed with the notion that the continued survival of red humanity mattered above all else. Let the polymath play her games. So long as she contributed to their common goal, the first flame had no reason to quibble. The first flame had grown too old to care about petty politics and infighting. His cantankerous behavior had already put him out of touch with the newer generations that were in charge these days. So how much has the first flame changed? Unknown so far. Due to the drastic reduction in E-energy radiation, we know that the first flame has not been able to absorb significant amounts of E-energy during the time of isolation. We believe that he has grown stronger, but that his progress is selective rather than holistic. Unless he emerges from a star, we can never know for certain. Will he reappear now that Bridgehead 1 has reconnected to the main universe? That is under debate. Chapter 7002 Unwilling to Cooperate. While many people celebrated the return of Bridgehead 1, the RA and RF largely reacted in dismay after hearing about the defection of almost all of the personnel stationed in the star system. The only ones who held true to their oaths after half a century of isolation were the expert pilots and ace pilots loyal to the Red Association and a handful of other states. Their continued refusal to the polymath's tempting offers once again exemplified the virtues of high-ranking mech pilots. Of course, the self-crowned cybernetic may have been able to convert a handful of them to her cause if she tried hard enough. The fact that she did not do so was probably out of respect for these human heroes. She may have become a star designer whose work encompassed many different industries, but she could never forget her roots as a mech designer. The polymath also let these high-ranking mech pilots depart from Bridgehead 1 without incident. She even gave them permission to bring away their personal machines, much of which was stuffed with new and innovative technologies. Naturally, it did not take much thinking for the RA and the RF to deduce that letting them return to their respective groups was a plot. The pilots possessed a vast amount of information about what they experienced in the last 53 years. Even if they had not had much contact with the citizens of the cybernetic empire, they could witness the gradual transformation of the central star node as well as its society. Their mechs also contained massive amounts of value. The star designer likely did not implement more than a fraction of 53 years' worth of constant technological progression. However, what little she did chose to add to the machines most definitely put them at least 2 whole generations ahead of the current generation. This was just a conservative estimate. The tech the polymath and the army of scientists and engineers of her empire managed to invent and iterate upon was enormous. They had proven their capacity to produce superior products out of the same pool of base materials. The differences in performance of many parts and systems ranged from 10% to 50%. In fact, the cybernetic empire also invented tech that could outperform existing solutions by 300%, 1000%, or even higher. Nobody had a clear idea just how extensively the polymath had single-handedly pushed the frontier of human science and technology forward. It was impossible to predict how much progress a star designer could make in a few months, let alone 53 years. People could only make a very loose estimation based on spurious assumptions. Even then, they probably underestimated the polymath's productivity over such a long period. The most powerful and advanced star system of red humanity had fallen under her sway. There were 12 Dyson spheres that were not only capable of providing astronomical amounts of energy that could be used to power enormous banks of supercomputers. No other star designer had so much processing power at their disposal. While the limited environment and inability to import massive amounts of materials from the rest of the new frontier most definitely limited her R&D potential, she could still divert lots of research into improving existing tech and systems. She most definitely placed a high priority on raising the efficiency of existing tech and materials. Finding out solutions to obtain more for less was vital in making progress in a star system that could no longer bring in more materials. The cybernetic empire also extensively reformed and rebuilt all of the existing holdings in Bridgehead 1. Many planets had become unrecognizable. High-density housing had become a lot more prevalent. Large space arcologies provided additional homes and workplaces for billions of natural as well as batch humans. All of that extra room became necessary when the cybernetic empire had transformed at least 50 of these planets into battle stations of enormous proportions. Although these war planets could also house billions of people, they would not be able to enjoy much comfort. However, the planets were so heavily armed that they could easily resist the attacks of alien assault fleets, including those led by lesser phase lords. If they faced enemies that they could not defeat, then the war planets also had the option to move away. Their enormous thrusters enabled these titanic armored globes to slowly move away from the orbits of the nearest stars. Although their acceleration rates were atrocious, at least they could still move, which was better than any other planet. This gave many people ideas. What if the cybernetic empire deployed these war planets to the front lines of the Red War? The polymath must have made them mobile for this express purpose. There was no other reason to go through the trouble of embedding them with enormous thrusters and developing a planetary-grade warp drive. However, since their normal acceleration rates were so low, their warp travel speeds were also fairly poor. A typical starship equipped with a superdrive could complete an interstellar journey in a single day. A war planet may take months or years to complete the same journey. This was an enormous setback to those who wanted to deploy the war planets to the front lines. So these war planets can move to different star systems, but their interstellar traversal speeds are lower than that of outdated alien warp-capable starships, is that correct? Yes, sir. There is a probability that the polymath is deceiving us about the true mobility of her war planets, but we deem this to be unlikely. She can raise her bargaining power by claiming that they can reach a destination in a shorter time frame. The fact that she is frank about this limitation serves to reassure us and limit our expectations. The war planets can still be useful in defending our territories, but only up to the zones around Bridgehead 1. Leaving aside everything else, the war planets could still be used to help Red humanity keep hold of more territory if the Red War had become a lost cause. Yet that did not offer the RA and RF much consolation. The more territory Red humanity lost, the more the balance of power shifted towards the owner of the richest, most populated and most developed central star node that still remained in human hands. Fortunately, the cybernetic empire had not neglected the need to build up more mobile and conventional combat assets. The CE already disclosed that it had fully mobilized a whopping sum of 180 war fleets. Each of them could be told to deploy to the front lines of the Red War at any time due to abundant preparations. Each war fleet comprised at least 50 warships, 50 carriers, and 20 support vessels. Only a minority of them consisted of capital ships, but there were still many fleets that had way more hulls at their disposal. This also meant that every war fleet could also deploy at least one mech regiment's worth of mechs in combat. The cybernetic empire did not just focus all of her industries on the military sector. It turned out that the one-system nation-state also produced a massive amount of civilian starships. After all, the factories needed to keep running while the workers also needed to be put to good use. The polymath most definitely understood that one of the growing shortcomings of Red humanity was the growing shortage of starships. To be more specific, interstellar shipping came under increasing stress. Transport vessels got lost due to commerce raiding or had to be converted into carriers in order to carry mechs into battle. This came at a detriment to shipping. The orbital shipyards available to Red humanity tried and failed to replenish the lost transport ships. It did not help that these resource-hungry production facilities needed to be supplied by a huge number of industrial goods. Therefore, the deterioration of shipping lanes directly impacted the production of starships, which subsequently strained logistics even more, which caused orbital shipyards to become even less efficient. Many strategists and planners worried about this negative feedback loop, but they could do nothing to solve the problem. They simply did not have time to address the shortage of transport vessels. It just so happened that the cybernetic empire had bought 53 years' worth of uninterrupted production time. During the time of isolation, the CE's factories and orbital shipyards produced over 200,000 transport vessels. Say what? 200,000 hulls? Truly? Yes, but do not expect quality from them. They are designed with efficiency, affordability, and ease of use in mind. They are slow, fragile, and low-tech. While they happen to be modular and easily upgradable, this will take up additional production capacity as well as orbital shipyard capacity. How many orbital shipyards does Bridgehead 1 contain? We have counted a total of 512 orbital shipyards, but there are many other orbital facilities that may or may not possess limited shipbuilding facilities. The function of these stations are not always clear. 512. If these orbital shipyards can produce a single first-class or second-class combat carrier a month, the cybernetic empire can enrich itself in record time by selling its monthly output. Wait, the cybers have likely exhausted their reserves of easily accessible metals and materials. They will need to import an astronomical amount of materials from other locations in order to feed their orbital shipyards as well as many other factories. Correct. We do not believe that the polymath is happy to sell all 200,000 transport vessels to the rest of Red humanity. At the very least, she will not let go of them easily without securing supply contracts to fuel her hungry industries. After the initial rounds of contact, it soon became clear that the polymath and her loyal cybers were not that eager to share their technological, industrial, and military accumulation with others. The fears of the Meshers and the Fleetas came true. The polymath refused to give away the vast majority of her scientific advancements for free. Just as the Big Two maintained their superiority over the rest of humanity for a long time by building up a significant technological lead, now it was the turn of the Red Association and the Red Fleet to suffer the same treatment at the hands of the cybernetic empire. The war planets did not show any signs of moving anytime soon. Their enormous thrusters remained completely cold and their planetary-grade warp drives continued to stay dormant as they had for many years. The 180 or so war fleets that were raring to go to the front lines and beat back the native aliens did not have permission to set off. Whether they would do so ultimately depended upon negotiations between the Cybernetic Empire and the various powers of red humanity. Initial indications showed that the Cybernetic Empire very cleverly sought to establish mutually beneficial relationships with the newly independent Terran Alliance and the Rabarthan Pact. The latter had become especially desperate to forge an alliance and receive military aid after a tide of evolved Vorabugs had begun to assault its border regions. What a disaster! Our hegemony has come to an end. Internal dissent and division has grown far past the point of containment. The Red Association and the Red Fleet will not collapse, but it is impossible for us to maintain the same amount of control over the states as before. We may even be forced to relinquish our right to enforce our laws upon the population and return to our original duties, which is to regulate mechs and warships. This represented an enormous fall from grace. The Meshers and the Fleeters were previously the undisputed rulers of the united human race. Was there a way for the RA and RF to force the Polymath into surrender, regain possession of Bridgehead 1 and claim her enormous accumulation of civilian and military assets? Maybe. Sending a pair of god pilots may be enough to humble the Polymath. Yet no one dared to make the suggestion. The Star Designer had 53 years to prepare for Bridgehead 1's return. She most definitely spent a lot of time on researching and developing countermeasures against every known god pilot. Even if the First Flame had not pledged his service to the Polymath, nobody wanted to test the theory that she had developed superweapons that were strong enough to counter god pilots. Chapter 7003 The Red 2's Decline. What does she want? No one founds an empire without holding territorial ambitions. It is ridiculous to expend so much resources into building so many war planets, war fleets, and transportation vessels. Does she seek to conquer our territories? That is a feasible option to Her Excellency, or should we say Her Imperial Majesty? Adopting the latter term means that we accept her illegal claim to Bridgehead 1. Legality is dead in this day, age, and galaxy. Force is the only law that matters, and right now, the Polymath enjoys a 53-year head start compared to the rest of the competition. As painful as it is to lose ownership of all of our assets and personnel in Bridgehead 1, we need to admit to the reality that exists, not the reality that only exists in our fantasies. I recommend that we give up any attempt at contesting Her Imperial Majesty's claim on Bridgehead 1. Because might makes right. Exactly. You sound as if this is a distasteful practice. You are not wrong, yet what of it? Your feelings will not sway anyone, certainly not a Star Designer that commands a force that can single-handedly save red humanity or collapse the framework of our society. Your stance calls for appeasement. That may be a mistake in itself. We both know what the Polymath attempted to do during the Survivalist Conference. She is convinced that red humanity can only thrive under her absolute rule. She has spent 53 years proving her theory in a single central star node alone. From what we have been able to observe, she has truly made the most out of the resources and manpower available to her. This means that she has most certainly strengthened her resolve to expand her governance model to other human territories. Mark my words. The neighboring star systems and subsequently the zones around Bridgehead 1 will fall under her sway sooner rather than later. That is impossible. We will never allow it. They are too populated and industrialized. They were set up to support Bridgehead 1 and take advantage of its many benefits. Now that the central star node is lost to us, the remaining star systems have become even more important. Losing them translates into losing a large amount of people, industries, resources, and more. You are naive if you think the Cybernetic Empire will remain confined to a single star system. Look at how prosperous it has become. Its population has ballooned, but under the fair and optimized administration that Her Imperial Majesty has personally devised and implemented, many inefficiencies have been worked out of people's lives. No one has gone hungry or destitute. Anyone can find work. Those who cannot do so anymore can live out their retirement in relative comfort. Family planning is precisely managed through a combination of incentives and cost increases. Every citizen has great confidence in their empire's ability to resist the alien invasion. All of this was undoubtedly true. If the people of Bridgehead 1 thought this way, then it was possible for others who lived in the surrounding star systems to hold the same ideas. If the populations of the star systems that traditionally maintained strong relations with the central star node requested to join the Cybernetic Empire en masse, it would be difficult to reject their demands. For one, the Red 2 could not offer superior protection to them unless they recalled a god pilot or a dreadnought and sent them to patrol the wavering star systems. This was an unthinkable decision. The star systems at risk of defection happened to be the rearmost territories of human-occupied space. There was little chance the native aliens would attack these territories in the near future. Recalling a god pilot or dreadnought also consigned many people at the front lines to their deaths. Not only would public support for the Red 2 plunge even further, but red humanity would lose even more territory in the process. This directly increased the Cybernetic Empire's importance. In fact, the Cybernetic Empress had a perverse incentive for red humanity to lose the Red War. Not completely, though. It would not do for the native aliens to overwhelm the formidable defenses of Bridgehead 1 and completely destroy human civilization in the Red Ocean. However, if Red humanity managed to cling to a single zone or just a small core territory that included Bridgehead 1, then that would turn the cybernetic empire into the strongest if not the sole governing entity in the remnant of human space. Although many people did not think that the polymath would be cruel and heartless enough to consign trillions of innocent humans to their deaths just to consolidate her grip over Red humanity, the possibility still existed. All of these factors more or less granted her a huge amount of bargaining power. The cybernetic empress could dictate terms to the rest of Red humanity, and everyone would have little choice to swallow most of her demands. She won. What the polymath failed to do the first time, she succeeded in the second, all because she found an opportunity to cheat. Who could possibly defeat the machinations of a star designer who possessed a 53-year head start? The polymath was exactly the kind of star designer who thrived on gathering abundant information and taking the time to analyze all of the variables before formulating a long-term plan to stack the deck in her favor. That was already scary enough. Giving her all of the time she needed to see her development plan come into fruition? That was impossible to defeat. The only reliable ways to defeat such a monstrous opponent was to defeat her with overwhelming force or rely on a variable that she had not been able to foresee or plan around. The Red 2 did have that in some measure. Superdimensional technology had exploded onto the scene like a supernova during Bridgehead 1's absence. The Red Association had transformed the Invictus into the first superdimensional god mech. The machine had not only become the most effective ancient phase whale killer in the dwarf galaxy but could also defeat damn near anything else. This meant that the Fist of Defiance served as a good deterrence against the cybernetic empire's overreach. If the situation became dire enough that it was more important to recall the god pilot from the front lines, then the meshers may actually go through with it if only to stabilize their rear. Yet this was an extreme option. The Red Association could not afford to realize this threat too easily, so that gave the polymath a lot of wiggle room. So long as her acts to subvert the old order remained subtle enough, there was a high likelihood that her victims would grit their teeth and endure the bleeding. This was what was frustrating about the new status quo. The meshers and the fleeters did not doubt that the cybernetic empress would resort to such measures. After all, if the meshers and the fleeters could think about this development strategy, then the polymath definitely considered it many years ago. The apparent reality that the Terran Alliance and the Rebarthan Pact declared their sovereignty on the same day of Bridgehead 1's reappearance was not a coincidence either. The Red 2 had completely overlooked this possibility, but the more intelligence they gathered, the more they obtained clues that indicated that the cybernetic empire had been in contact with the two first-rate colonial superstates for at least 3 months, but likely more. This was an increasingly plausible theory. After all, if the polymath managed to reverse the properties of the greater space-time bubble to her advantage, then she should also be able to poke a hole in it and establish a restricted form of communication with the outside universe. That meant that they were all in cahoots with each other. Perhaps the Terrans and the Rebarthans may still be wary towards the polymath and her ambition to expand her rule to all red humans. It was not a good idea to completely surrender all of the initiative to the polymath. Although it was definitely short in many aspects, the cybernetic empire could already be classified as a first-rate colonial superstate in its own right. So long as more and more people adopted this interpretation, they would grant a lot of soft power to the newly emerged empire. Perhaps that was the point of naming it in such a grandiose way. Calling the polity a dukedom or a principality simply did not produce the same level of impact. What this meant was that the polymath's personal fief may not fit the traditional definition of an empire at this time, but it could actually become so long as everyone agreed to her version of the truth. It would not be difficult for her to make this happen. What are her goals? Does she seek to conquer our entire civilization, or is she merely aspiring to establish the cybernetic empire as a major power? Will she tolerate the continued existence of the Red 2? What is her stance towards the Red Collective, and how eager will her enormous population adopt systematic cultivation? We need more information to obtain the answers to those questions. The upcoming negotiations centered around territorial recognition, military assistance, and technology sharing will be critical. The ease in which the polymath dispatched her armed forces to the front lines and barter a fraction of her amazing new technologies to us will serve as important indicators. The more concessions she demands for her services, the less optimistic our situation becomes. If the polymath sees no reason to allow the Red Association and the Red Fleet to exist in their current forms, then we may have no future left. We have already started to fall from grace. When we combine that with the serious setbacks that we have suffered in a single day, I cannot see how we can maintain the glory that the Big Two have maintained for over 4 centuries. This turn of events cannot be stopped anymore. We can either adapt or we allow the rising power to push us into obsolescence. My suggestion is to give up on imposing our rules to the states that are unwilling to accept us and work with what we have left. The majority of the states and organizations based in the Red Ocean Union are still under our sway. We should stem the bleeding and engage in damage control by reinforcing our support base in the only colonial alliance that still looks up to us for protection and guidance rather than the Terrans or the Rebarthans. Perhaps we can also exploit the emerging Vorabug crisis to our advantage. I do not know where they came from and how they have mutated into such an aggressive and rapidly expanding species, but this threat is most likely a variable that the polymath has not been able to predict or plan around in advance. You are correct, but do not mistake our Vorabugs as allies. Unlike the polymath and her cybers, there is no possibility of negotiating with these insectals. We can use their indiscriminate invasions as pressure points, but that should be the limit. We should not allow hundreds of populated star systems to become devoured by the Vorabugs solely because we want to preserve as much of our old glory as possible. You are making a humanist argument. What is that supposed to mean? It is becoming more and more difficult to stay human in this increasingly dangerous galaxy. We are beset by too many threats. The native aliens have been pressing down on us for years. The Terrans and the Rabarthans have slipped our leash at the worst possible time. The cybernetic empire has just arrived, but not only hoards a large amount of future generation technologies, but also possesses the largest reserve of uncommitted war fleets out of all of us. Then our race is also being targeted by increasingly more numerous swarms of mutated Vorabugs. Can any human solve all of these threats at the same time? Chapter 7004 Viscounts into play. Many galaxy-shaking events unfolded on this day, but not everyone had the time or attention to consider all of the changes and implications. Back in the Screed Tanner system, the battle between the humans and the native aliens had little clue of what was going on in the rest of the dwarf galaxy. Even if they received a notification about the secession of the first-rate colonial superstates and the return of Bridgehead 1, the soldiers first needed to finish their respective fights before they could think about matters beyond their mission and mortality. Not even VS dared to direct too much attention away from the ongoing struggle. His mood became a little more unbalanced, but he tried his best to set aside any distractions that should be dealt with at a later date. The tortuous scream has been hit. No physical damage, minor drain to one of the forward Azure energy shields. The 7th Company on the anti-spinward flank needs reinforcements. The defenders of Screed Tanner 6F have concentrated their most elite and veteran phase fighters on the side. Our Dracoloids are being outmaneuvered and our Omega Threshers are being assailed at close range. The Saint Commander is already responding to the offensive thrust of the native aliens. More Omega Threshers are redirecting their firepower towards the anti-spinward flank. The elite Fae fighters are disintegrating. They are faltering under a concentrated barrage of resonance-empowered Omega lasers. Monitor the energy reserves of the assisting Omega Threshers and make sure to dispatch enough E-mules to prevent them from going into the red. What is the state of the center and spinward flank of our mech units? Redirecting so much firepower to the anti-spinward flank has caused the enemies in the other quadrants to catch their breath and reorganize. It will take much greater effort to break their spirits the next time. Then let our soldiers grind them down again. Under the Saint Commander's light, we have nothing to fear from this alien rabble. Our priority is to preserve the lives of our troops. We cannot afford to present any openings that the native aliens can exploit. Make sure to ramp up the rotation of E-mules. None of our combat mechs have completely expended their energy, fuel, and ammunition reserves, but it will not take long before the most hard-fought machines will run low enough to constrain their fighting tactics. Savi is reporting odd movements from several alien fleets. They are showing signs of making a sacrificial play in an attempt to take out our flagship at all cost. The smart AI estimates that there is a 56% probability that the native aliens will attempt to make this desperation play. The probability is rising by the minute. High Captain Gilbert de Ranvankas frowned in thought. The Larkinsons had been afraid of this play. Even if the native aliens were currently losing war machines left and right, the humans would be suffering casualties sooner or later. It was impossible to save everyone in a battle of the scale and intensity. What are your suggestions, tactical officer? Sir, I suggest we back away and cede space to the native aliens for the time being. If the native aliens have gone mad and thrown all caution to the wind, they may be willing to sacrifice 20 of their ships just so that they can eliminate our flagship. According to the semi-reliable information provided by the Moloch Squadron, many aliens on the other side regard our flagship as the source of all of their ills. There are cases where the native aliens have turned suicidal when the pressure becomes too much for them to endure. Keep a close eye on their mechs and starships. If they begin to exhibit anomalous behavior caused by distractions or nihilism, inform me regardless of what else I am preoccupied with. Oh, please notify the Morpheus to scan the surroundings. If the native aliens have prepared a surprise, our alien stealth ship has a better chance of uncovering it than others. The command center of the tortuous scream continued to remain busy as all of the Larkinsons worked on their assigned stations without any problem. Yet all of the crew members did was to perform rote and standard functions. They fulfilled their duties as if they were truly making most of the important decisions. Yet for all of their busy work, there was a sense of emptiness in their hearts. There was not much room for them to show initiative because the Saint Commander had taken over. As long as Casella Ingvar had taken over command over the armed forces, she was capable of absorbing lots of data and deciphering the implications behind them. Although she clearly did not always get it right, putting her in charge of the fleet made it even more unbearable to lose. Many human command officers and staff found themselves on the sidelines as most of their input did not help the Saint Commander all that much. Casella was so good at taking command and tracking every piece on the checkerboard that she did not necessarily need the additional help. However, the Larkinsons of the Premier Fleet did not give up so easily. They directed their attention towards logistics and tried to be on the lookout for strange enemy movements. It was clear that the synergy between the command staff and the Saint Commander still needed a bit more work. Captain, the Saint Commander has just given our ship orders to advance and get ready to unleash her full firepower. The High Captain rose higher in his seat. Are we finally unleashing the full power of our bunker mechs? Yes, sir. Saint Commander Ingvar believes that the native aliens are struggling to endure the successive setbacks. The flight of their greater phase lords has not pushed them to their breaking point solely because they still enjoy a large numbers advantage. The native aliens are hoping that their successive attacks on our resonance-empowered and shield-linked mechs and warships have pushed us closer to exhausting our energy shield pools. The native aliens were not entirely unaccustomed to fighting enemies protected by shield-linked technology. Aside from eliminating a single shielded enemy by relying on overwhelming force, the only other fundamental way to defeat shield-linked opponents was to drain them of all of their energy shields, whether they originated from themselves or were loaned by other friendly units. Once this devastating event happened, the unshielded targets quickly turned into sitting ducks, though not always. Unshielded mechs and warships still posed a considerable threat against the numerically superior alien war weapons, but their ability to resist attacks to their physical states was limited. Alert! Savi wants to warn us of the possibility that the core alien fleet led by the Protector of Karnak is angling to launch a missile swarm, a heavy torpedo salvo, or both. The native aliens may have caught wind of what we are attempting to do. They have raised the priority of eliminating our flagship. How likely is our smart AI correct? Signal traffic is increasing. We have already spotted signs that the native alien warships are about to remove the covers from their missile launcher systems. Damn! Inform the Saint Commander, but begin making preparations ourselves. Check the state of our tertiary gun batteries and fix the unfunctional ones by any means necessary. We are not alone in this, sir. There are a multitude of faster and nimbler subcapital warships in the Blue Jay fleet that can help us intercept the incoming ordnance. That will not be necessary. The Saint Commander spoke directly to the command staff through an internal communication channel. Watch! Her command field shifted as she activated another aspect of her power. So far, she had only chosen to commandeer the mechs and starships of the Premier Fleet and the Blue Jay Fleet. The mechs turned knights fought valiantly and produced greater impact. However, just because they gained the equivalent power of a quasi-expert mech did not mean they could ignore the physical reality entirely. The necessity of fighting at least 5 times more enemy strike craft than their own number took a toll on their psyches and machines. As advanced as their first-class multipurpose mechs may be, many of the enemy phase fighters were barely able to keep up in a few areas, but that was already enough to turn them into serious threats. The disparity in numbers as well as firepower was even greater when it came to the warships. The native aliens simply had a lot more hulls and big guns at their disposal. Since the Saint Commander could only barely empower the massive warships with her true resonance, the Tortuous Scream and the warships of the Blue Jay Fleet were losing the trades with their much more numerous enemy counterparts. If it was not for the power of shield-link technology and clever maneuvering, the first human warships would have succumbed to enemy attacks by this time. All this time the warships were getting pummeled. The Saint Commander held back what may arguably be her greatest weapon. No more. She decided the timing was right. Within the 155 artillery bunkers of the Tortuous Scream, modified Omega Threshers had settled into the protective enclosures. Although not originally designed to function as bunker mechs, the Larkinson-developed FFE 1100L variant not only attached them to an extra pair of bunker-mounted large luminar crystal cannons, but also hooked them up to massive cables that fed them with energy while also siphoning away excess heat. These Omega Threshers had already made good use of their bunker advantages while being elevated to knights. Now that Casella chose to bring out the big guns, she instantly infected 57 modified Omega Threshers, replacing their inferior empowerment with a much more superior version. The differences immediately became apparent. The lucky first-class multipurpose mechs glowed brighter and exuded much greater power. Not only that, they also gained the protection of a cruder version of a resonance shield, which meant they had gained the strength of a mid-tier expert mech according to the resonance meters. It was already notable enough for a single mid-tier expert mech to participate in a battle on this scale. However, nobody had a clear idea of what it meant to deploy 57 of them at a time. Even if the newly elevated Viscounts still possessed many deficiencies compared to authentic mid-tier expert mechs, their offensive performance should at least be close enough to make the distinction irrelevant. So far, the Saint Commander had been relatively light in directing the mech pilots of her knights. Due to the trust they put in her leadership, she was able to take direct control over their controls, enabling her to pilot their machines with far greater skill than any mortal could hope to match. However, Casella only did that on occasion. Not only would she strain her concentration if she tried to micromanage over 1,400 first-class mechs, but she would also deprive the pilots of a valuable learning experience. Yet, when it came to harnessing the firepower of 57 potent Viscounts, The Saint Commander did not want to leave anything to chance. Casella rapidly picked her targets. She rapidly shifted her gaze from one enemy warship after another. After half a minute of waiting, she mentally commanded her Viscounts to launch a highly coordinated precision strike. The modified bunker mechs acted in unison. They first opened fire with their phased disintegrator guns. 228 brightly glowing resonance-empowered energy bolts soared across space and strangely attracted the attention of many humans and aliens before accurately striking the segmented multi-layer energy shields that covered over a dozen targeted warships. Just a single bolt possessed the power to exhaust a segmented Azure energy shield. What amazed everyone was that none of the shots went to waste. Every phased disintegrator bolt accurately struck and segmented Azure energy shield and removed it before the next energy bolt flew through and exhausted the next energy barrier that had gotten in the way. In just over a second, every affected alien warship temporarily gained gaps in their energy coverage. While the aliens were quickly trying to plug the gap by hastily reshuffling the orientation of their segmented Azure energy shields, the Saint Commander acted faster. The instant the momentary gaps in the defenses appeared, the Viscounts already opened fire with all of their deadly precise and accurate energy beam weapons. Their high-tech Omega laser cannons, as well as the bunker-mounted large luminar crystal cannons, all fired resonance-empowered transphasic hyper-laser beams through those gaps. None of the energy beams missed. Since each of them had been fired with the power of an average mid-tier expert mech, the energy beam inflicted way more damage than anyone aside from Casella could have imagined. They drilled through whatever hull patang was in the way and created holes straight through compartments, ship systems, and more. It just so happened that Casella's targeting had been very deliberate. All of her Viscounts happened to target any missile launcher or torpedo launcher system, even those that could not have been directly targeted at the current angle. The penetrating firepower of her Viscounts had drilled through all of the hull plating and emergency energy shields and finally struck the weapon systems in the locations that they could least afford to get hit. A multitude of explosions engulfed the sides of the targeted vessels, as their own explosive munitions detonated before they had a chance to launch. Chapter 7005. The Power of Viscounts. The Omega Thresher was an interesting mech model. Just as its name suggested, the first-class multipurpose mech model was primarily designed around the use of its Omega laser cannons. The combination of high power per shot and excellent precision made the Omega Thresher good for mid to long-ranged combat. While it was not as accurate as a dedicated marksman mech, it came with an advanced targeting system that helped to improve its hit rate at longer ranges. After all, the consequences of missing a shot with an Omega laser cannon was much more severe. The necessity of accumulating a huge amount of power before discharging it in a single powerful strike always took up a lot of time. The problem with the Omega Thresher's configuration was that its weapon systems did not synergize particularly well. Its phased destructor guns could have served as an excellent complement to the Omega laser cannons. The former could tear down transphasic energy shields with ease, the latter could cut right through solid metal. It seemed obvious that the Omega Thresher was a mech designed to utilize both capabilities at once. Yet in practice, the two were only effective together employed at short range. The muzzle velocities of Omega laser cannon was equivalent to the speed of light. The muzzle velocities of the phased disintegrator guns were much slower and also a bit less precise at longer ranges to boot. The phased disintegrator guns had never been designed to kill or snipe. The Red Association asked for a support weapon, and that suited the Saint Commander fine. The problem that many mech pilots faced when they tried to master the art of piloting this machine, it became too difficult to effectively use the phased disintegrator guns together with the formidable Omega laser cannons. The former launched energy bolts that could not fly exactly straight at all times. They always followed a randomly skewed trajectory that was subtle up close, but became increasingly more obvious at longer distances. The relative slow muzzle velocities of the energy bolts also only really made them useful at closer ranges. That severely limited the value proposition of the Omega Thresher model. It obviously possessed a configuration that excelled at ranged combat. Why must it deliberately discard this advantage and fight opponents at a range that did not leverage the full potential of its devastating Omega laser cannons? The best possible use of the Omega Threshers was to strike a distant target with its phased disintegrator guns to sap away its energy shields before using the Omega laser cannons to inflict a large amount of material damage to the exposed enemy. Yet as the mech pilots hired by the Premier Branch began to master the use of this RA mech model, they found that it was practically impossible to accomplish this feat on any target aside from one that was completely stationary. As long as the range was far enough and as long as the target was moving and attempting to evade incoming fire, the difficulty of landing consistent hits with the phased disintegrator guns drastically rose. In fact, after the Larkinson mech pilots asked their colleagues over at the Blue Jay fleet for advice, they learned that even the RA's own highly trained and heavily augmented first-class mech pilots struggled to perfectly land the attacks in sequence. Unless they became expert candidates or expert pilots, they had no hope of hitting distant enemy targets with the phased disintegrator guns before immediately striking them with the Omega laser cannons. The two weapon systems were drastically different from each other. Each of them demanded their own set of skills because the parameters related to firing them were not comparable to each other. A mech pilot might be able to dedicate decades of training into mastering long-distance shooting with laser weapons. However, the skills and instincts associated with them did not translate so easily to energy weapons with drastically different properties such as the phase disintegrator guns. This was a shame, as the combination made the Omega Thresher incredibly powerful in theory. Its value drastically rose if it was able to pop transphasic energy shields with greater ease without relying on melee mechs with space suppressors to weaken distant enemies in advance. Unless a first-class mech pilot dedicated his entire life to mastering the Omega Thresher's eccentric combination of armaments, it was unlikely for any of them to be able to use the mech model to its full potential. This was why the performance of the bunker mechs was so much more astonishing to those who understood the nuances of the Omega Thresher design. In the hands of regular mech pilots, the Omega Thresher was a deep machine that they could never fully tap due to their mortal limitations. However, if an ace commander took direct control over their machines, her unnaturally high skill and intuition easily enabled her to accomplish this superhuman feat. The Saint Commander's multitasking capabilities were so impressive that she did it 57 times in a single attack salvo. What impressed everyone the most was not that she succeeded, but that she attained a 100% success rate. This was a powerful indicator of her fine control and her ability to precisely guide the actions of multiple mechs to a very precise degree. A brief lull ensued on the battlefield as both the humans and the aliens needed a bit of time to come to terms with the initial result. Of the alien warships that suffered surface hits as well as more severe damage due to the premature detonation of live warheads, not all of them got crippled right away. Only 9 hulls appeared to be in such bad shape that their burning and partially collapsed hulls already started to drift out of formation. The other affected alien warships were a bit larger, tougher, or did not load their tubes with powerful enough missiles. These vessels had been spared the misery of their more injured cousins, but that did not mean they had been able to make it out unscathed. Some had lost their Azure energy shields. Others could no longer make use of some of their gun batteries anymore. Again, while everyone else was still busy with evaluating the damage of the previous devastating massed attack, the Viscounts were already firing their second salvo. Phase disruptor bolts surged from the bunkers of the tortuous Scream and struck the damaged but still relatively intact warships. Due to the disruptions caused by the secondary explosions on their hulls, the targeted warships were unable to respond in an adequate manner. They turned into sitting ducks as they witnessed their segmented Azure energy shields disappearing in a rapid sequence just before a handful of resonance-empowered Omega laser cannons and Luminar crystal cannons fired their destructive beams straight through the gaps and bored deep into the hulls. The damage was less severe than last time as the bunker mechs of the tortuous Scream could no longer target any convenient missile launcher systems filled with explosive munitions. Third salvo. The modified Omega Threshers continued to fire their weapons at a rate of fire that was significantly faster than the base model. The Omega laser cannon was a demanding energy weapon system. It had many problems related to energy supply and heat management. It just so happened that hooking up an Omega Thresher to the systems of a capital ship easily mitigated all of these problems. While it was still possible to overheat and damage the weapons by channeling too much into them, their upper limits had been raised to a whole new level. This meant that the modified Omega Threshers could get away with doubling and maybe even tripling their firing rates. This was especially the case when Casella's true resonance toughened up the mechs even further, especially when she tapped the power of the brand new Dragon Scale's resonating material. In other words, the Omega Threshers increased their firing rates to a level that would have caused their weapons to overheat and explode if they kept this up a few more times. Only the fact that they had temporarily gained the power that was equivalent to that of a mid-tier expert mechs kept their overstressed armaments and other systems in working condition. Again and again, the Viscounts kept repeating the same routine on the same targets until a dozen or so warships eventually succumbed entirely. Even if none of the resonance-empowered attacks was able to destroy a warship in a single hit, it was already enough to disable the alien vessels to the point where they could no longer contribute to the ongoing battle. These hulls had lost too many essential systems and could no longer move under their own power. As the Viscounts maintained their horrible firing rate, everyone eventually accepted the reality that Casella and the bunker mechs did not consume much energy and other resources by maintaining this performance. This was one of the scariest aspects of a true ace commander. Due to her presence and command field, the tortuous Scream had undoubtedly established herself as the most powerful warship on the battlefield. She may as well be a dreadnought by how much she outclassed other warships in terms of firepower. Although the raw damage output of the Omega Threshers could not match that of the primary gun battery of an alien battleship, mid-tier expert mech-level true resonance could turn any trash into treasure. The aliens could do little to defend against this barrage. Many of their warships had moved forward in an attempt to pummel the outnumbered human warships and prevent them from escaping. Now, this aggressiveness came back to haunt them as many of their vessels had lingered well within the effective range of the tortuous Scream's bunker mechs. The Saint Commander kept focusing on directing the highly effective and surgical firepower of her Viscounts. She had to release a bit of her attention on all of the knights in the fields, But that was no issue, especially when her actions delivered repeated blows to their confidence and morale. The alien phase fighters and warships outnumbered the human mechs and warships by a very considerable extent. Yet, because of the intervention of a single human false god, the disparity in numbers gave them no comfort or solution against this onslaught. So long as the Saint Commander continued to infect her bunker mechs, the tortuous Scream effectively wielded the raw firepower of 57 mid-tier expert mechs at the same time. Although it sounded impressive, it had remained an abstract statement so long as no one actually fielded 57 identical expert mechs on the same battlefield. It was only now that the Saint Commander actually realized this condition in reality that both humans and aliens finally understood how powerful her viscounts could be when operating under favorable conditions. The aliens are faltering. They are growing more and more time and are confused by the second. They are not breaking, though. The aliens are still putting up a fight, though their heart is not in it anymore. If we keep up the pressure, the aliens will crack sooner or later. Maybe they will even choose to evacuate from the Scree Tanner system entirely. All of the spoils in this star system will belong to our clan. Don't count your chickens before they hatch. Keep an eye out for those lesser phase lords. Many of them have run away, but a handful may still choose to return. Heh, that will translate into their demise. Saint Dice has kept chasing them in order to push them further and further away from the battlefield. Just 2 ace pilots had managed to cow and demoralize the numerically superior aliens. Although the human attackers did not enjoy a large safety margin, it was still incredibly impressive that they managed to whip the aliens into such a sorry state. If the enemy worked harder to maintain morale among the troops, then there was still a chance that they could overpower the tortuous Scream by recklessly throwing phase fighters and warships at the flagship. Yet, because the native aliens kept doubting and second-guessing their ideas, they failed Odo make the correct response. Chapter 7006 Dracoloids Take Flight. Although the repeated salvos launched by the 57 modified Omega Threshers was taking a greater toll on her willpower, the Saint Commander did not allow the bunker mechs to take it easy. The more phase disruptor bolts and energy beams they channeled into the opposing hulls, the more damage the alien vessels sustained. The cohesion among the enemy warships deteriorated as more and more hulls fell out of position and drifted off after losing most of their power and propulsion. Alien spacers desperately tried to engage in damage control. They put out fires, performed emergency repairs, and tried their best not to scream in panic. Their efforts produced very limited results. There was no way to fix a melted Azure Shield generator or patch up a broken power generator. What was worse was that secondary explosions, accidental electrical discharges, and explosive decompressions regularly inflicted casualties among their number. Their gods had forsaken them. Just 2 human false gods had managed to completely dictate the battlefield. At this point, it was rather admirable that half of the alien soldiers still retained their fighting spirit. The phase fighters and warships under the command of the Protector of Karnak proved to be a cut above the rest. Even as the less disciplined and well-trained forces of the various raiding fleets began to falter, the soldiers responsible for defending the Scree Tanner system tried their best to rally the remaining aliens and prevent them from routing. The native aliens still had a chance of winning this battle. The tortuous Scream, though powerful, was only a single warship. She was clearly Orvan-made and had only been half-heartedly converted for human use. The native aliens therefore had a good idea on her layout, performance, and weak points. So long as they pushed through the human lines and struck the battleship directly, they should most definitely be able to shatter apart the most threatening human vessel. They only had to brave the formidable attacks launched by the tortuous Scream while also shoving their way past the human mechs. Whether this plan was realistic remained to be seen, but it served its use in rallying the confused aliens and giving them a common goal to dedicate towards. The native aliens are exposing themselves to greater danger. Their phase fighters are trying to bull their way past our mechs, and they are succeeding due to their numbers advantage. Their surviving warships are forming into flanking squadrons before attempting to circle around the main battlefield. They are likely attempting to pincer our flagship from multiple directions at the same time. Of the 133 alien warships, more than a quarter of them had been knocked offline. Much of the remainder had incurred varying degrees of damage. The tortuous Scream, along with the warships of the Blue Jay fleet, had managed to breach the energy defenses of multiple enemy warships and inflict serious damage onto their outer shells, but other alien warships would swoop in and use their own intact Azure energy shields to provide valuable cover. This enabled the damaged but unbroken vessels to patch up their holes and contain the worst of damage so that they could fight against. More and more ships like that appeared among the native aliens. The Premier Fleet and the Blue Jay Fleet had been spared from following suit as they relied on their shield link technology to keep their own vessels protected over a much longer period than normal. This meant that the shield link arrays and shield generators of every linked vessel needed much more time and attention to return to their peak conditions, but the Larkinsons could worry about this later. For now, they needed to ensure that the last enemy offensive could not get through and pummel the tortuous Scream from multiple directions at the same time. Various different intelligence sources painted a worrisome picture for the command staff. The native aliens are becoming desperate enough to disregard their losses in order to inflict a serious blow against our flagship. The precision attacks launched by the Viscounts have lost much of their deterrent effect. The native aliens know what is coming and they are psychologically prepared to see it through the end. These fanatics are still praying to their native gods despite seeing their own deities forsake them not too long ago. This does not make sense. The native alien belief in their native gods is too deeply rooted in their society. Their behavior cannot be measured by logic, so do not even bother to try. What matters is that these aliens are fanatical enough to persist in the face of overwhelming opposition. High Captain Gilbert de Ranvancas tried to figure out how to stop all of those flanking warships from getting through and pummeling his ship from several different directions. There are too many enemy warships. At this rate, our infect mechs will not be able to eliminate most of the hijacked vessels. Diverting other mechs to our defense will help, but that will free up much of their surviving phase fighters, which are still numerous enough to inflict serious damage to our forces. Despite wiping out thousands of phase fighters, the defenders still had thousands more. What was worse was that the Larkinson mechs and other friendly units mostly managed to eliminate the weaker alien strike craft. Few. The more threatening ones that refused to execute the directives of its own maker still remained intact for the most part. These elite phase fighters managed to avoid too much attention and set themselves in a position to save the day at an opportune time. The aliens must die, the Saint Commander succinctly stated. The current Viscounts are unable to disable much of their warships in time. Part of it is due to the absence of space suppressors in the vicinity of our targets. Another part of it is due to orientation. As long as the enemy vessels keep their bow pointed in our flagship's direction, they can prevent the bunker mechs from targeting their propulsion systems. This was one of the downsides of relying on ranged weapon systems, especially energy weapons that lacked a strong enough visual impact. Even without their phase lord leaders, the remaining alien officers had scrambled to form effective countermeasures. From using the hulls of smaller and less important ships as literal cannon fodder to redlining their propulsion systems, the native aliens were willing to ruin their own vessels just to be able to destroy the tortuous Scream. Our flagship needs to back off and delay the moment of interception as much as possible. On it, sir, but do not expect to be able to outrun the enemy warships. Their subcapital ships are significantly lighter and possess higher acceleration rates than our battleship. The warp factors of their drives should also be superior. There was no outrunning the pursuing alien vessels. The Blue Jay fleet attempted to provide cover. They were able to stall one of the pincers, but lacked the numbers and firepower to do the same to the other pincer. The Saint Commander finally made an important decision. I am demoting the current batch of Viscounts back into knights. The modified Omega Threshers have exceeded my expectations in this battle, but their limited angles of fire have become too much of a constraint. As much as the mech pilots of the Infeft first-class multipurpose mechs wanted to retain the power of a mid-tier expert mech, all good things came to an end. So long as this power did not belong to the mech pilots, it could be given and taken away at any time. The Saint Commander only provided minor consolation to the 57 lucky mech pilots before seeking to empower an entirely different group of first-class multipurpose mechs. She decided that this was a good time to test out a second major feature of the Minerva Mark II. A certain metallic owl-shaped Fey soared across space and approached a troop of prepared Larkinson mechs. Unlike the Omega Threshers, the Dracoloids fared much better when fighting up close than from afar. This was exactly what the Saint Commander needed at this time. At this time, the Dracoloids had not left the radius of the Minerva Mark II's command field. The Ace Command mech was able to amplify the range of Casella's command field to a ridiculous extent, so it was not easy to escape her diluted domain field. Even so, when the Victrix arrived in front of the Dracoloids, every Larkinson mech pilot felt as if they were standing right in front of the Minerva Mark II. The Owl Fae began to transmit an uplifting message to the Dracoloid pilots. Arise, my new Viscounts, and carry my power into battle. Breath fire into the hulls of the alien warships and rend their propulsion systems asunder. Every Dracoloid gained a vague corona and glowed brighter. Power exuded from all 57 machines as they each carried a significant measure of Casella's true resonance. After the Dracoloids irrationally reared up their draconic heads and released a spray of searing flames, they flew straight towards the pincer of enemy warships that were attempting to attack the tortuous Scream directly. The dragon mechs flew much faster than before. Combined with Casella's excellent skill and intuition, the Dracoloids skillfully evaded most of the intercepting fire that was being channeled in their direction. It did not matter too much if they got struck by an attack. The Dracoloids were designed to take a few beatings. The imitation resonance shield proved to be fairly effective at blocking attacks as well, and even if some still went through for one reason or another, their empowered armor systems easily repelled any lingering attacks. Once they got close enough, the Dracoloids finally got to work. They circled two of the larger enemy warships at a time. They were playing a dangerous game. As long as the secondary and tertiary gun batteries still remained operational, The new Viscounts could potentially become beset by so many attacks that they would wear out their defensive measures in record time. However, the Dracoloids did not have any intention of maintaining this distance. They utilized their entire arsenal of weapon systems in order to breach the energy defenses at the rear. This took a bit of time, but not that much. When a whopping 57 mid-tier expert mechs utilized their claws, integrated Gauss cannons, integrated plasma cannons at the same time, the energy barriers simply couldn't take it anymore. Their generators suffered a major fault that needed to be addressed in record time. The Dracoloids all managed to get inside the defensive envelopes of the two warships. They wanted no time and quickly began to savage the metal parts that were closer to the rear of the enemy vessels. Once they managed to breach the engineering bays of the enemy warships, the Dragon mechs released a short spurt of resonance-empowered flames that completely wiped out anything important and recognizable. However, the Dracoloids did not stick around long enough after they initially crippled the enemy warships within reach. The Dracoloids hopped away from their defeated enemies and began to repeat the same moves again, down to the second. It became clear that this had become a new pattern. The Dracoloids did not waste any time on chatter or explanations. Their main objective was to neutralize the offensive launched by the warships that comprised this pincer. After multiple rounds of hopping, over half of the ships comprising the pincer fell out of formation and tumbled in multiple different directions. The crew grew horrified when the damage inflicted by the Viscounts had left them almost completely adrift. The Dracoloids were unstoppable. Their pilots became so infected by the rush of power that they constantly egged each other on. They truly enjoyed the moment of invincibility. While the Dracoloids possessed lackluster ranged solutions, that was okay. Their offensive capabilities as well as the honest exposure to their main weaknesses were enough to put them on the shortlist. The repeated words of encouragement and the presence exuded by the Victrix made the Larkin sons aware that they were fighting in the presence of their ace commander. This was enough to make them docile and obedient. Chapter 7007 Crumbling Alien Morale. The Battle of Screed Tanner 6F unfolded in a completely unexpected manner. The human attackers may be relatively small in number, but their quality was so high that they were able to put up a good fight and minimize their losses despite being heavily outnumbered. Just the fact that Saint Commander Casella Ingvar was able to commandeer over 1,400 first-class multipurpose mechs was already impressive enough. Although the mass empowerment did not entirely make up for the huge disparity in numbers and absolute firepower, it at least ensured that the mechs became strong and tenacious enough to hold back the enemy forces for a lengthy period. To be more precise, the Knights could not only defeat several phase fighters with their resonance-empowered weapons, but the strength of their Azure energy shields also became much stronger. If a warship happened to strike one of the Knights with one of their powerful secondary gun batteries and managed to collapse the Azure energy shield quickly enough to prevent the shield links from reinforcing it, the mech in question still had a good chance of making it away alive. Although mechs that had lost their energy shields were not as fragile as alien phase fighters, their armor systems could only resist so many attacks. The native aliens always tried to concentrate their firepower on the human mechs that had lost their energy defenses. This was an old habit of theirs, and it happened to remain useful when fighting against the humans. Everyone knew that once an enemy unit lost energy shield coverage, the exposed enemy needed to be taken down with haste before it could retreat to the rear or buy enough time to restore its energy defenses. This made it very dangerous for the small number of mechs that attracted too much enemy firepower. Their shield link transceivers worked as hard as possible to siphon shield energy from other friendly assets, but they were not omnipotent. There were enough native aliens that had fought against the forces of the Red 2 in the past to learn how to counter this powerful life-saving tech. The easiest solution was to knock the energy shield out with a single overwhelming blow, as mentioned before. The hardest solution was to attack the shielded enemies as often as possible. By putting a higher priority on inflicting damage than securing kills, the shield-linked units would exhaust their collective reserve of shield energy sooner or later. This was clearly the most wasteful and time-consuming solution, but there were many times when there was no better solution at hand. A more clever solution was to block the shield links. Much like tight beam laser communications, the shield links could be blocked so long as an obstacle got in the way. The elite and veteran alien phase fighter pilots understood how shield link tech worked and developed special tactics to limit the effectiveness of this measure. The best way to deal with a mech protected by shield link technology was to surround it with several phase fighters and make sure to circle around and interrupt the shield links as often as possible. Even if it was not possible to maintain a 100% block rate, interrupting the connections on a repeated basis was already enough to severely degrade its performance. The alien phase fighters had already relied on these tactics to eliminate dozens of powerful mechs. However, even if they managed to erase the energy shield advantage of a mech, it was still difficult to secure the kills. The subtle willpower reinforcement enhanced the defensive performance of the already decently well-armored mechs. So long as other machines had enough time to reinforce the unshielded mechs, the latter usually managed to get away, if a bit battered and bruised. The differences in performance between knights and unempowered mechs were therefore too comprehensive. Every Dracoloid and Omega Thresher mech effectively fought like mechs that were several times more expensive to build and difficult to obtain. The mechs fielded by the Blue Jay fleet also derived many advantages from Casella's command field. Therefore, a magical and completely lopsided result unfolded on the battlefield. The human attackers had gone into this fight while being heavily outnumbered in terms of strike craft, warships, and champions. Yet due to the excellent advantages of just two of the premier fleet's ace pilots, the native aliens stationed in the Screed Tanner system suffered so many setbacks that their surviving soldiers practically became traumatized. After all, they not only lost over 4,000 phase fighters, but also lost 47 warships. The Viscounts empowered by the Minerva Mark II possessed ample enough power and numbers to cripple a warship's most essential functions. It was a bit difficult for the mechs to quickly destroy or damage the warships beyond recovery. Viscounts or not, their weapon systems were too small and lacked the scale to inflict widespread destruction. However, that was not a big problem. The primary gun batteries of the Tortuous Scream and the somewhat smaller but still potent primary armaments of the Babylon Excavator and the Tarask easily finished off the crippled and practically defenseless hulls. Alien warships that had lost both their Azure energy shields and propulsion may as well be asteroids given how easy it was to calculate a firing solution and pummel the target with slow but devastating shots. Plasma bolts, laser beams, positron beams and kinetic rounds easily penetrated through the hull and disintegrated large parts of the citadel of a crippled vessel. If the design and interior of the alien warship in question happened to be known, then it became even easier to destroy the vessel. The human warships just had to aim their weapons at the main power generators, the munition storage compartments or other unstable elements and fire away. Even if the human warships had to divert their firepower away from more functional enemy warships, they still prioritized the destruction of the crippled hulls because the enemy still had a chance to recover them during the engagement or after the fighting had ended. While these attacks merely served to finish off the disabled warships for good, the sight of their collapse actually disheartened the alien soldiers even further. The spectacle of witnessing ships explode or break apart carried much more visual weight than seeing a mostly intact vessel drift out of formation. The aliens felt a greater sense of loss and tragedy as they witnessed so many impressive homeships succumb to violence. Many of the hulls had only been constructed in the past few years. They had been designed and built to fight the top powers of the human race, and therefore incorporated plenty of excellent human technological solutions. Yet when the two sides entered into battle, the humans thoroughly managed to destroy almost 50 alien warships at this point. In contrast, not a single human carrier or warship suffered the same fate. The superior tech, maneuverability and defense offered by shield link technology kept them all safe. What was more ridiculous was that the effective firepower of just one captured and partially converted alien warship easily exceeded that of a dozen warships, if not more. Even if the Tortuous Scream relied on an ace command mech and her bunker mechs as opposed to normal gun batteries, the fact of the matter was that this combination alone was directly responsible for much of the losses suffered by the native aliens. Their attempt to pincer the flagship of the premier fleet failed. One of them had become completely savaged by the Dracoloids turned Viscounts. It was as if the dragon mechs had turned from technological limitations of dragons into the real deal. Each Viscount moved faster, struck harder and resisted far more damage than their tech ought to be able to resist. Even without relying on shield link technology, the Dracoloids were already agile and resistant enough to survive long enough to shred the Azure energy shields of an alien warship before crippling the vessel. The aliens are breaking. Although the native aliens still outnumbered the humans, the continuous setbacks completely snuffed out their fighting spirit. It had been dim for a while. If not for their pride, training and instructions from above, they would have preferred to cut their losses and retreat. They had banked all of their hopes on the last gambit. Yet the enfeefment of 57 Dracoloids completely crushed their last viable attempt to destroy the Tortuous Scream. The alien soldiers saw no hope of achieving their win conditions anymore. Sure, many of the human mechs and warships had suffered so much attrition that their Azure shield generators were on the verge of failing. Every few seconds, a mech had to withdraw from the battle line and return to its mothership in order to replenish its reserves and give its Azure shield generator time to recover. The shield link transceiver also incurred a certain degree of stress due to bearing a heavy burden. The mech technicians needed to perform a quick inspection and make sure to replace worn components before they had a chance to fail at the worst possible moment. Fortunately, not many mechs needed to rotate at the same time. The Larkin Sons actually began to rotate their mechs many minutes earlier. This set up a healthy pattern where recently topped-off mechs were able to return and fight with much greater gusto than before. There should never be a situation where an entire mech company was at risk of collapsing in a single instant because all of the machines had simultaneously reached their limits. Through this clever and prudent management, the human mech units kept fighting without deteriorating in any significant fashion. The Knights demonstrated a level of persistence and resilience that far exceeded that of other first-class multipurpose mechs. As long as they remained within the impressive range of the Minerva Mark II's command field, fighting against them was like fighting against lesser versions of the human false gods. This had been an unfair confrontation from the beginning. It slowly dawned upon the alien soldiers and particularly the phase fighter pilots that they had not been fighting against their mortal equals all this time. Instead, they had been fighting against humans that harnessed the power of gods. The distinction between false gods and real gods did not matter to them at the moment. After all, at their level, anything related to divinity was unreachable by their standards. The only way to cope with such power was to seek salvation from their own native gods. Yet what were the alien phase lords doing? They had fled from the battlefield. After the first Sword Mark III demonstrated her capacity to butcher a greater phase lord like a pig, she had turned into an absolute terror to the lesser phase lords. Perhaps the Protector of Karnak and the Endless Stomach possessed the means to cope against the superdimensional mechs. But the rest would only lose their heads if they attempted to intervene. Now that the first Sword Mark III had temporarily given up on killing the two troublesome greater phase lords, she had been circling around the battlefield. Not all of the lesser phase lords had abandoned all of their responsibilities and fled from the Screed Tanner system without remorse. There were still plenty of them that still wanted to wait until the first Sword Mark III ceased her pursuit of the lesser prey and became preoccupied with the two greater phase lords again. Unfortunately, the first Sword Mark III did not give up. Anytime a lesser phase lord turned back and tried to get close to their fleets, the ace swordsman mech ruthlessly homed in on the alien champion and charged forward with her decapitator poised to butcher another giant alien pig. How could a lesser phase lord possibly think about rescuing his fleet and subordinates under those circumstances? It was not worth it to risk their lives to save a bunch of mortals and mundane possessions. The Red Ocean was big enough for a lesser phase lord to be able to replenish those losses easily as long as he returned to his home territory. This was also a good excuse to stay away from the battlefield and avoid scary opponents like this superdimensional ace mech. If one such machine had appeared, others would soon emerge as well. Lesser phase lords may be at the bottom of the alien god totem pole, but few of them were truly stupid. They could easily deduce that the human-alien battlefield was about to become a lot deadlier for their kind. These thoughts and more caused the lesser phase lords to grow even more timid. So long as the first Sword Mark III remained active on the battlefield, the native gods had no intentions of reinforcing their mortal alien forces. Chapter 7008-7008. Withdrawal to Screed Tanner 6F. Fixed. The continued inaction from the lesser phase lords eventually broke the back of alien opposition. Despite transmitting repeated requests for relief, their gods had turned their gazes away from their faltering phase fighters and warships. To many alien soldiers, the complete lack of empathy and courage shown by the lesser phase lords practically caused their faith to collapse. Without faith, how could they possibly muster enough motivation to persist in this battle? The aliens began to withdraw. As soldiers, they attempted to organize their retreat as orderly as possible, but that did not last very long. Many aliens just wanted to put as much distance between them and the deadly human mechs and warships. It did not help that their human counterparts immediately smelled weakness. The aliens have lost their will to fight. Press harder. Do not give them a chance to catch a breath. The stronger our attacks, the faster their remaining cohesion will crumble. There was a big difference between an orderly retreat and a complete rout. The goal of the human forces was to trigger the latter. Not only would the total breakdown in order make it a lot more difficult for the native aliens to reorganize and reform their ranks, but it also made every enemy asset a lot more difficult to defeat. The alien phase fighters and warships were several times more difficult to defeat when they covered each other's backs and employed sophisticated tactics. Once they became so panicked and desperate to flee the battlefield, they could no longer pay attention to such operations. This was exactly what was happening. The native aliens attempted to withdraw by assigning a rear guard to buy time for others to make an escape, but they had made a critical error. The forces under the command of the Protector of Karnak lorded over the other forces. While there was a lot of logic in sacrificing the more disposable assets to preserve the more valuable ones, the aliens were not pawns that could be discarded at will. If their native god personally ordered their raiding fleets to form such a rear guard, then they may obey this order without question just because they had been conditioned to absolutely obey their deity. However, the order came from the commanding officers of the forces that defended the Screed Tanner system. They weren't even gods. They were merely mortal juregs that had reached a high rank by earning the trust of the Protector of Karnak. There was still an enormous gap in status between the two. Even if the former spoke with the backing of a god, that was still not as good as the real deal. Besides, it was very doubtful that the native aliens were willing to obey the orders of a Jureg Greater Phase Lord. The Juregs were fanatically loyal to the Phase Whales and had always been associated with the Red Cabal. The Phase Whales recognized the usefulness of having these stupidly loyal aliens by their side. Due to these dynamics, the Juregs therefore cultivated a reputation for being the bullies and enforcers of the Red Cabal, especially in the last decade when the organization was forced to become a lot more prominent. Therefore, other major races generally disliked the pompous Juregs who constantly tried to persuade alien populations to worship the Phase Whales before their local gods. Suffice to say, The Juregs did not endear themselves to the Orvans, Nunzers, Zamiels, and etc. due to causing so many religious disputes. The trusted Jureg commanders therefore generated so much hatred and animosity that the remnants of the alien raiding fleets did the complete opposite. They not only refused to form a rear guard in order to hamper the human pursuit forces, but they split up and fled in different directions. What a clever decision. This naturally made it a lot harder for the human forces to catch them all. The Premier Fleet and the Blue Jay Fleet did not field a lot of mechs and warships, so splitting them up would cause them to lack the strength to complete their missions. There was even a risk that the native aliens would suddenly turn around and launch a counterattack against their pursuers. Therefore, the best decision that the pursuing human mech forces could make was to follow the largest group, which happened to consist of combat assets that still answered to the Protector of Karnak. The Greater Phase Lord may have become too distracted to pay much attention to the state of his fleet, but he was still able to recognize how it got pulled into a disaster. Now, the greater priority of this faltering collection of phase fighters and warships was to retreat to Screed Tanner 6F. There, the alien soldiers could rely on the fortified space station and other fixed defenses to stall any attack attempts. Depending on how quickly the humans were able to dismantle the defenses, the subordinates of the Protector of Karnak may judge that it would be better for them to cut their losses and run. Come on, fellows! These Jureg-led aliens have little to no faith left. It will not take too much of a brow to make them lose resistance. A squad of Dracoloid mechs flew towards an alien frigate that was already showing signs of stress. They were immediately met with intercepting fire from the alien ship's point defense guns. Many of them had been installed relatively recently. It became clear that the native aliens placed more emphasis on smaller and compact weapons that could effectively intercept both ordnance and incoming strike craft. The Dracoloid mechs therefore endured a high frequency of attacks. Their Azure energy shields immediately took a toll, yet they put their trust in shield link technology as well as Casella's command field. Since the Dracoloid enjoyed both advantages, this mech model was able to show off such amazing combat power. Yet it was undeniable that it was not the most valuable reward. The Omega Threshers maintained their distance from other forces and got credited for blowing up a lot of stuff. This is so easy. The Omega laser cannons are so powerful, and the phase disintegrator guns always succeed in stripping the vessel of their energy defenses. There was little chance the native aliens will slow down and fight us to death, so the combatants quickly grew hyper-aggressive. More and more aliens had been pushed to the brink of exhaustion. Their reaction speed slowed and their ability to respond to danger had atrophied. More alien assets began to show flaws. Numerous phase fighters accidentally crashed into each other and forcibly connected them to the chamber. This was a catastrophe that should have never taken place. Several alien frigates had decided to band together in order to reduce the pressure, but only ended up stabbing each other in the back. Crazy incidents like this unfolded across the battlefield. Sir, many of the alien forces have moved beyond the range of the Minerva Mark II's command field. Continuing to chase after them will make our fleets much more vulnerable. What is your decision, sir? Do not pursue. High Captain Gilbert instructed. If you do, you risk coming into contact with the lesser phase lords that are lingering in the periphery. Wiping out all of the lesser phase lords and alien remnants is too difficult and unrealistic for us. We must focus on completing our primary objectives. The Saint Commander chimed in as well. Do not feel tempted to pursue. No matter how weak a collection of alien warships may be, they can still outnumber and outgun any pursuit force. We need to focus on more urgent priorities. Many mech pilots groaned, but they knew better than to disobey. Instead of setting off to pursue the miscellaneous routing enemies, the mechs restrained themselves and remained on guard. Any surprises could put their imminent victory in jeopardy. They needed to be ready to respond to any counterattacks. Now that the main opposition had melted in front of them, the two victorious fleets advanced towards Screed Tanner 6F at a steady pace. The Saint Commander did not relax even though her forces had managed to break the back of alien resistance in this star system. Scaring away the enemy phase fighters and warships was different from eliminating them permanently. She still held a bit of vigilance towards the native aliens. No matter whether they were Juregs or Nunzers, so long as they were numerous enough, they may still have ideas about turning around in order to fight. In order to reduce this possibility as much as possible, the human forces took preventative measures. The Premier Fleet and the Blue Jay Fleet lost many potential opportunities to capture and convert the notorious alien vessels. Many of the crippled hulls had been destroyed as a precaution. The humans weren't stupid enough to give the alien crew a chance to restore the ships and launch a surprise attack while the humans were caught off guard. Once enough hulls got destroyed, the Larkin Sons finally gained enough reassurance. The Saint Commander no longer ordered her troops to blast apart the next alien hulls. The human warships instead had to send in their marines and hopefully capture enough valuable goods by leaving the hulls intact. It was also possible to capture the warships and convert them to their own use. However, this was a risky proposition that would likely cause the Larkin Sons to suffer losses and delay their departure from the Screed Tanner system. This was why the boarding parties ruthlessly killed every alien crew member in the way and prioritized the theft of phase water and other high-quality resources. The humans did not take the bait. They did not attempt to capture the alien warships. The Larkin sons lacked experience in this aspect. They much preferred to let their mechs do all of the work. But their machines were too big and clumsy for this sort of work. It feels so frustrating to let so many cowardly alien phase fighters and warships leave. A Dracoloid mech pilot complained. I could have destroyed at least 2 more alien frigates or destroyers if we could move further than the prescribed limit. The Saint Commander is holding us back for our own good. Rick, have you forgotten that these alien raiding fleets originally traveled to the Screed Tanner system in order to offload their plunder? The real valuables should still be left in the large amount of stockpiles on the surface of Screed Tanner 6F. The strategy chosen by Casella Ingvar made a lot more sense in that context. The moon base was the real prize. In order to enrich the Larkinson clan, the Saint Commander grew eager to secure the enemy base and prevent the enemy from transferring all of those goodies. We need to send a powerful enough advance force to intercept inbound alien starships and lock down those treasures if possible. I shall send ahead my Viscounts. The Saint Commander informed everyone. The current Viscounts had already completed their tasks. No intact warship was left within the range of the Minerva Mark II's command field. This was a ridiculous amount of space. Yet despite being able to extend the range of her domain field to over 145 kilometers, Screed Tanner 6F was located much further away at the moment. Most commandeered mechs would lose their empowerment after they moved too far away from the source. This should have happened to the Viscounts as well, but in reality they retained the same level of strength as before. 200 kilometers, 500 kilometers, 1,000 kilometers. The infeft Dracoloids merrily flew away from the flagship that hosted the Minerva Mark II and did not doubt their power in case they were met by enemies. Instead, they remained strong, and it was all because of the metal owl that shadowed their movements. It hadn't been too obvious before, but now everyone could see and figure out that the Victrix extended the Minerva Mark II's command field. Casella's appreciation for the Victrix rose. She could hardly imagine life without this handy owl fae by her side. VS had done an excellent job at bringing it to life and filling it with a sense of purpose. She was also incredibly impressed by her Viscounts. They had already been instrumental in defeating the enemy warships and causing the native aliens to lose their confidence in the battle. Now, the Saint Commander intended to find out if they could perform well when operating by themselves.